When you consider that you can come out with sentiments like that in the middle of a war. So we wandered off into other deserted... wandered off into other deserted streets. Everyone I'd met that night had bared his soul to me. To me. Just my luck, said Robinson as we were pushing off. If only...
If only you'd been a German, you're an obliging sword, you'd have...
I can't get this thing.
Sword, you'd have taken me prisoner and we'd be all set. It's hard for a man to get rid of himself in a war. What about you? Said why wouldn't you have taken me prisoner if you had been a German? Maybe they'd have given you the Medaille Militaire. Some funny word the Germans must have for their Medaille Militaire. Seeing there was absolutely no demand for us as prisoners, we finally sat down on a bench in a little park and opened up the can of tuna fish Robinson had been warming in his pocket since morning. Now we could hear gunfire far in the distance, very far. If only boats...
Only both sides could have stayed in the distance where they were and left us alone. Then we walked by the river, and alongside of some half-unloaded barges we urinated long streams into 22. The water. We were still leading the horse by the bridle. He tagged behind us like a great big dog. Near the bridge, in the ferryman's one-room house, there was a dead man stretched out on a mattress all alone, a Frenchman, a major of light cavalry. Actually he looked something like Robinson. Ugly son of a bitch. Says Robinson. I don't know about you, but I don't like dead people. The funny part of it, I said, is that he looks something like you. The same long nose, and you're not much older. Well, you see, it's being so tired that makes us all look alike, but oh if you'd seen me before. In the days when I went bicycle riding every Sunday. I was really handsome. You should have seen the calves on me. You can't beat bicycling. It develops the thighs too. We left the house, the match we lit to look at the stiff had gone out. You see? It's too late. You see? Already, in the darkness at the end of the town, a long gray and green line marked the crest of the hill. Day. One more. One less. We'd have to try and get through this one the same as the rest. The days had got to be like hoops, tighter and tighter to get through, and filled with bursts of shrapnel. Coming back this way tomorrow night? He asked before we separated. Tomorrow night? There's no such thing. What do you think you are, a general? I don't think about anything, he says. No thoughts at all. I think about not getting killed. That keeps me busy. One more day is one more day, that's what I think. You're right. So long, pal, and good luck. Good luck to you too. Maybe we'll meet again. We each went back to his own war. And then things happened, and a lot more things that it's not easy to tell about now, because people nowadays wouldn't understand them anymore. If you wanted to be respected and looked up to, you had to hurry up quick and pal up with TV civilians, because they were becoming more and more vicious as the war went on. I saw that as soon as I got back to Paris. It also became clear to me that the women had ants in their pants and that the old men were talking big, and their fingers were out all over the place, in assholes, in pockets. The civilians back home were infected with the idea of glory. They picked it up from the soldier boys and soon learned how to bear up under it, bravely and painlessly. Nurses and martyrs by turns, mothers were never without their long dark veils and those little diplomas the ministry never failed to send by special messenger. In short, the home front was getting organized. At a well-conducted funeral, you're sad too, but you think of other things. The will, your next vacation, the widow, who's a good looker and said to be passionate, and your plans for continuing to live a great deal longer by contrast, and maybe never dying. You never can tell. And as you follow the hearse, everybody lifts his hat to you. It's heartwarming. Then's the time to behave properly, to look dignified, not to laugh out loud, to gloat only internally. That's permissible. Everything's permissible internally. During the war, instead of dancing on the mezzanine, you danced in the cellar. The boys had no objection, in fact they were all for it. They demanded it as soon as they got to town, and nobody thought it indecent. The one thing that's really indecent is bravery. You expect physical bravery? Then ask the worm to be brave. 23. He's pink and pale and soft, just like us. For my part, I had nothing to complain of. Actually, thanks to the Midale military one and my wound and all, I was about to lose my innocence. They brought me the medal while I was in the hospital convalescing. And that same night I went to the theater, to let the civilians see it during intermissions. A triumph. Those were the first medals seen in Paris. It floored them. That was when I met little Lola from America in the lobby of the Opera Comique, and it was thanks to her that I really found out what was what. There are certain dates that stand out after months and months when you might just as well have been dead. That evening at the Opera Comique with my medal was a turning point in my life. Lola made me curious about the United States, because of the questions I started asking right away that she hardly answered at all. When you start traveling that way, you never know when or how you'll get back. At the time I'm speaking of, everybody in Paris wanted a uniform. Practically nobody was without one, except neutrals and spies, which to all intents and purposes were identical. Lola had a genuine official uniform, and it was really natty, decorated with little crosses all over, on the sleeves and on the tiny cap that she perched at a rakish angle on her wavy hair. She'd come to help us save France, as she told the hotel manager, to the best of her humble ability but with all her heart. We understood each other right away, but not completely, because the transports of the heart were beginning to give me a pain. I was more interested in the transports of the body. You can trust the heart, not at all. I learned that in the war, and I wasn't going to forget it in a hurry. Lola's heart was tender, weak, and enthusiastic. Her body was sweet, it was adorable, so what could I do but take her all together as she was? Lola was a good kid all right, but between us stood the war, the monstrous frenzy that was driving half of humanity, lovers or not, to send the other half to the slaughterhouse. Naturally this interfered with our relationship. For me, who was dragging out my convalescence as long as possible and wasn't the least bit eager to go back on duty in the flaming graveyards of no man's land, the absurdity of our massacre was glaringly obvious at every step I took in town. Whichever way I looked, I saw cynical grasping cunning. Still, I hadn't much chance of keeping out of it. I lacked the indispensable connections. The people I knew were all poor, people whose death is of no interest to anybody. And I could hardly count on Lola to keep me safe at home. Even if she was a nurse, I couldn't have conceived of anyone more bellicose than that sweet young thing XCEPT Mabie Orlin. If I hadn't been through the muddy fricassee of heroism myself, her little gem of heart number might have stirred and converted me, but since my innocent on a place twitchy I had grown totally allergic to heroism, verbal or real. I was cured. Radically cured. For the convenience of the ladies of the American Expeditionary Force, the group of nurses Lola belonged to were quartered in the HL Paris 15, and, to make things even more delightful for her personally, she had been put in charge. She had connections of a special service, whose mission it was to supply the Paris hospitals with apple fritters. Every morning dozens of them were handed out. Lola performed this benign duty with a touching zeal, which, as it turned out, was later to have disastrous consequences. Lola, it has to be admitted, had never made a fritter in all her life. She therefore hired a number of mercenary cooks, and after a few trials the fritters were ready for delivery, as juicy and sweet and golden as anyone could wish for. All Lola actually had to do was taste them before they were delivered to the various hospital wards. Every morning Lola got up at the stroke of 10, took her bath, and went down to the kitchens, which were situated deep in the basement. This, I repeat, she did every morning, clad only in a black and yellow Japanese kimono that a boyfriend in San Francisco had given her the day before she left. 24. In short, everything was running smoothly, and we were happily winning the war, when one fine day at lunch I found her shattered, refusing to touch so much as a single dish. I was seized with foreboding, what misfortune or sudden illness had befallen her. I begged her to entrust herself to my watchful affection. After conscientiously tasting fritters every day for a month, Lola had put on 2 Kun DS. Her little belt bore witness to the disaster. She found herself obliged to move on to the next notch. She burst into tears. I did my best to comfort her. In a turmoil of emotion we repaired by taxi to several pharmacies, situated at a considerable distance from one another. The scales proved implacable. As ill luck would have it, they all confirmed that 2 pounds had indeed and undeniably been gained. I suggested that she turn her job over to a friend who, on the contrary, was eager to enlarge her allurements. Lola wouldn't hear of such a compromise, but she regarded it as shameful, as a kind of desertion. That, I recall, is when she told me that her great-great-uncle had been a member of the crew of the eternally glorious Mayflower which landed in Boston in 1677-16, and that in view of such a past she couldn't dream of shirking her fritter duty, which may have been humble but was nevertheless a sacred trust. The fact remains that from that day on she barely touched her teeth, which, incidentally, were evenly set and very enticing. Oh, the fritters. Her dread of putting on weight completely destroyed her enjoyment of life. She began to waste away. Soon she was as afraid of fritters as I was of bullets. Because of the fritters we spent most of our time taking long healthful walks on the riverbanks and boulevards, and we stopped going to the Neapolitan, because ice cream is another thing that makes ladies put on weight. I had never dreamed of a place so comfortable to live in as her room, all pale blue with the bathroom adjoining. Photographs of her friends were all over, with dedications. Not many women, lots of men. Handsome, dark with curly hair. That was her type. She talked to me about the color of their eyes and read me the dedications, which were tender, solemn, and every last one of them absolutely irrevocable. At first those effigies embarrassed me. I felt I was being rude, but then I got used to it. The moment I stopped kissing her, I was in for it. She'd start on the war and her fritters. France figured prominently in our conversation. To Lola's way of thinking, France was some sort of shower being, not very clearly defined in space or time, but at the moment dangerously wounded and for that very reason too exciting. When anybody mentioned France to me, I instantly thought of my guts, so I wasn't nearly so open to patriotic ardor. Each man to his fingers. Nevertheless, since she was sexually accommodating, I listened and never contradicted her. But when it came to my soul, she wasn't at all satisfied with me. She'd have liked to see me bubbling and bursting with enthusiasm, whereas I couldn't see a single reason for adopting that sublime state of mind. In fact, I could see 1,000, all equally irrefutable, or persevering in the exact opposite disposition. Obviously Lola was nuts with happiness and optimism, like all people on the good side of life, the ones with privilege, health, security, who still have a long time to live. She kept bothering me with the soul. She was always going on about it. The soul is the body's vanity and pleasure as long as the body's in good health, but it's also the urge to escape from the body as soon as the body is sick or things are going badly. Of the two poses, you take the one that suits you best at the moment, and that's all there is to it. As long as you can choose between the two, you're all right. But I couldn't choose anymore. My die was cast. I was up to my neck in the truth. Death dogged my every step, so to speak. It was very hard for me to think of anything but my suspended sentence to be murdered, a fate which everyone else regarded as just the right thing for me. In this kind of deferred death agony that hits you when you're lucid and in good health, the mind is open to nothing but absolute truths. Once you've been through it, you'll know what you're talking about till the end of your days. My conclusion was that if the Germans were to come and pillage, massacre, and burn everything in sight, 25. The hotel, the fritters, Lola, the Tuileries, the cabinet ministers, their little boyfriends, the Coupole, the Louvre, the department stores, if they were to swoop down on the city and unleash the wrath of God and the fires of hell on this putrid carnival, to which nothing in the way of sordidness could possibly be added, I would have nothing to lose and everything to gain. You don't lose much when the landlord's house burns down. Another landlord will always turn up, unless it's the same one, German or French, English or Chinese, to collect the rent. In marks or francs? What difference does it make, seeing you've got to pay? In short, my morale was low. If I told Lola what I thought of the war, she'd have taken me for a monster and banished me from the ultimate joys of her boudoir. So I was careful to keep my sentiments to myself. Besides, I had outside difficulties and rivalries to worry about. Quite a few officers were trying to filch her away from me. Their competition was redoubtable, armed as they were with the seduction of their legions of honor. And just then the American papers were beginning to be full of this damned legion of honor. She cuckolded me 2 or 3 times, and I'd go so far to say that our relationship would have been in serious danger on those occasions, if it hadn't dawned on her that I could be put to a higher use, namely, made to taste the fritters every morning in her stead. This last-minute specialization saved me. She could accept me as a substitute, for I was a valiant comrade in arms, hence worthy of so sacred a mission. From that moment on we were more than lovers, we were partners as well. The modern age had dawned. To me her body was a joy without end. I never worried of exploring that American body. I have to admit that I was a terrible lecher. I still am. And I formed the pleasant and fortifying conviction that a country capable of producing bodies so daringly graceful, so tempting in their spiritual flights, must have countless other vital revelations to offer, of a biological nature, it goes without saying. I made up my mind, while feeling and fondling Lola, that sooner or later I'd take a trip, or call it a pilgrimage, to the United States, the sooner the better. And the fact is that I knew neither peace nor rest in an implacably adverse and harassed life until I managed to go through with that profound and mystically anatomical adventure. So it was in the immediate vicinity of Lola's rear end that I received the message of a new world. Of course Lola wasn't all body. She also had a wee little face that was adorable and just a bit cruel because of her gray blue eyes that slanted slightly upward at the corners like a wildcat's. Just looking at her made my mouth water, like a sip of dry wine, that flinty taste. There was a hardness in her eyes, unrelieved by the amiably commercial or intello fragrant vivacity you find in nearly all the eyes in these parts. We usually met in a cafe nearby. There were more and more wounded men hobbling through the streets, many of them very bedraggled. Collections were taken for their benefit, days for this group and days for that group, especially for the organizers of the days. Lying, fucking, dying. A law had just been passed prohibiting all other activity. The lies that were being told to task the imagination far exceeded the limits of the absurd and preposterous in the newspapers, on posters, on foot, on horseback, on pleasure boats. Everybody was doing it. In competition, to see who could lie the most outrageously. Soon there wasn't a bit of truth in the city. The little that had been left in 1914, people were ashamed of now. Everything you touched was phony, the sugar, the airplanes, the shoes, the jam, the photographs. Everything you read, swallowed, sucked, admired, proclaimed, refuted, defended was made up of hate-ridden myths and grinning masquerades, phony to the hilt. The mania for telling lies and believing them is as contagious as the itch. Little O was 26. French consisted of only a few phrases, but they were all patriotic, en la soirée. Madelon, Venus. 17. It was enough to make you cry. Stubbornly, shamelessly she harped on the deaths of those doomed to die. Actually all the women did, as soon as it became fashionable to be brave for other people. Just as I was looking within and discovering such an extraordinary taste for everything that took me away from the war. I often asked Lola questions about America, but her answers were vague, pretentious, and manifestly unreliable, calculated to make a brilliant impression on me. But by that time I distrusted impressions. I'd been taken in once by an impression, and nobody was going to hoodwink me again. Nobody. I believed in her body. I didn't believe in her soul. I thought of Lola as a charming goldbrick, miles away from the war, miles away from life. She flitted across my nightmare with the mentality of the patriotic press, the Paulies in the trenches, our own Lorraine, the cadets in their white gloves. In the meantime, I made love to her more and more. I convinced her it was a good way to lose weight. But she said more store by our long walks. I hated long walks. But she insisted. So we spent several hours every afternoon being athletic in the Bois de Boulogne, walking around the lakes and back. Nature is a frightening thing. Even when it's solidly domesticated as in the Bois, it gives real city dwellers an eerie, anxious feeling. And that puts them in a confiding mood. The Bois de Boulogne may be damp, fenced in, greasy, and trampled, but there's nothing like it for sending memories rushing irresistibly to the minds of city dwellers strolling under the trees. Lola was not immune to that melancholy, confidential anxiety. As we walked along, she told me, more or less truthfully, 1,000 things about her life in New York and her little girlfriends over there. I couldn't quite make out how much of the potpourri of dollars, engagements, divorces, dresses, and jewelry that seemed to have made up her existence was worth trying to believe. That day we headed for the racetrack. In those days in that neck of the W's you still saw lots of horse-drawn carriages, children on donkeys, other children kicking up dust, and cars full of soldiers on furlough, always in desperate haste, between two trains, to track down the women strolling on the side paths, raising more dust in their hurry to go to dinner and make love, jumpy, oily, peering this way and that, tormented by the implacable clock and the lust for life. They sweated with passion, but also with the heat. The Bois wasn't as well cared for as usual. It was neglected, in a state of administrative suspense. It must have been pretty here before the war, Lola observed. So she... Oh, tell me about it, Ferdinand. Your races here. Were they like ours in New York? To tell the truth, I'd never been to the races before the war, but to amuse her I instantly made up dozens of colorful details, drawing on stories various people had told me. The toilettes. The ladies of fashion. The gleaming carriages. The start. The joyous, imperious horns. The water jump. The President of the Republic. The undulant wedding fever, etc. My idealized account was so much to her liking that it brought us together. At that moment Lola seemed to discover that we had at least one taste in common, well concealed in my case, namely, a taste for social functions. She went so far as to kiss me in a burst of spontaneous emotion, something, I have to admit, that she seldom did. And then she was touched by the sadness of bygone fashions. Everyone has his own way of mourning the passage of time. It was through dead fashions that Lola perceived the flight of the years. 27. Ferdinand, she asked, do you think there will be races here again? When the war is over, Lola, I should think. We can't be sure, can we? No, we can't be sure. The possibility that there would never again be races at Longchamp overwhelmed her. The sadness of the world has different ways of getting to people, but it seems to succeed almost every time. Suppose, Ferdinand, suppose the war goes on a long time, maybe for years. Then it will be too late for me to come back here. Do you understand, Ferdinand? You know how I love beautiful places like this. So grand, so chic. It'll be too late. Forever too late. Maybe I'll be old, Ferdinand. When the races start up again. I'll be old. You'll see, Ferdinand, it will be too late. I can feel it will be too late. She was as desolate as if she'd put on 2 more pounds. I said everything I could think of to comfort her and give her hope. She was only 23 after all. The war would be over soon, oh very soon. Good times would come again. As good as before, even better. For her at least. Being so adorable. The lost years. She'd catch up with no harm done. She wouldn't run short of admirers. So soon. To please me she pretended she wasn't sad anymore. Do we have to keep walking? She asked. Your weight. Oh, that's right, I'd forgotten. We left Longchamp, the children had gone. Nothing left but dust. The furlough boys were still chasing happiness, but no longer in the copses. The pursuit of happiness had moved to the cafe terraces around the Port Malet. We headed for St. Cloud along the riverbank, shrouded in a dancing halo of autumn mists. As we approached the bridge, some barges loaded to the gunwales with coal and lying low in the water were thrusting their noses under the arches. Above the fences the park deployed a great fan of greenery. Those trees are as vast and gentle and strong as dreams. But trees were something else I distrusted, ever since I'd been ambushed. Behind every tree a dead man. Between 2 lines of roses the avenue, rising gently, led to the fountains. Outside the kiosk the soda water lady seemed to be slowly gathering the evening shadows around her skirt. Further on, along the side paths, great cubes and rectangles of dark-colored canvas were flapping, carnival booths, which the war had taken by surprise and suddenly filled with silence. It's been a whole year since they went away. The soda water lady told us. You won't see 2 people here in a whole day now. I come out of habit. There used to be so many people. That was all the old lady knew. The rest of what had happened was a blank to her. Lola wanted to go and look at the empty tents, one of those funny sad impulses. We counted about 20 of them, a long one full of mirrors and a lot of small ones, candy stands, lotteries, even a small theater traversed with drafts. There was a tent in every space between the trees. One of them, near the Grand Avenue, had lost its glass. It was as well ventilated as a punctured mystery. These tents were leaning close to the mud and falling leaves. We stopped near the last, the one that was bent lowest. It was pitching on its poles like a ship in the wind, with wildly flapping sails ready to snap the last of its cables. It swayed in the rising wind. A sheet of canvas flew up above the roof and flapped at 28. Flapped. The old name of the stand was written on the front in green and red letters. It had been a shooting gallery, the Gallery of the Nations. There was no one to take care of it now. Maybe the owner had gone shooting with the rest of them, with his customers. What a lot of bullets the little targets in the stand had taken. All of them riddled with little white dots. A wedding, that always got a laugh out of them. 10 figures in the first row, the bride with her flowers, the cousin, the soldier, the groom with a big red face, and in the second row the guests, who must have been killed a good many times when the carnival was still operating. I bet you're a good shot, aren't you, Ferdinand? If the carnival were still running, I'd challenge you. You are a good shot, aren't you, Ferdinand? No, I'm not a very good shot. In the last row behind the wedding, another row was daubed in, the town hall with its flag. People must have shot at the town hall, too, when the gallery was working. At the windows, they'd open and a bell would clang, and they even shot at the little tin flag. And they'd shot at the regiment marching on an incline nearby, like mine on the place Klitschy. This one was between the pipes and the little balloons. People had shot at those things for all they were worth, and now they were shooting at me, yesterday and tomorrow. They're shooting at me, too, Lola. I cried. It slipped out of me. Let's be going, she said. You're talking nonsense, Ferdinand, and we'll catch cold. We descended the main avenue, the Avenue Royale, toward St. Cloud, avoiding the mud. She held me by the hand. Hers was tiny, but I couldn't think of anything but the tin wedding at the shooting gallery up there, which we had left behind us in the shadow of the trees. I even forgot to kiss Lola. Something had come over me. I felt very funny. I think it was then that my head became so agitated, with all the ideas going around in it. It was dark when we got to the Pont de St. Cloud. Ferdinand, would you like to have dinner at Duval's? You like Duval's, don't you? It would cheer you up. There's always such a big crowd. Unless you'd rather eat in my room, she was being very considerate that evening. We finally decided on Duval's. But we'd hardly sat down when the place struck me as monstrous. I got the idea that these people sitting in rows around us were waiting for bullets to be fired at them from all sides while they were eating. Get out. I warned them. Beat it. They're going to shoot. They're going to kill you. The whole lot of you. I was hurried back to Lola's hotel. Everywhere I saw the same thing. The people in the hallways of the Parrots all seemed to be on their way to be shot, and so did the clerks behind the big desk, all of them just right for it, and a character down at the door with his uniform as blue as the sky and as golden as the sun, the doorman, and the officers and generals walking this way and that, not nearly so gorgeous of course, but in uniform all the same, all right to be shot. There'd be shooting from every side. No one would escape. Not this one, not that. Or the other. The time for joking was past. They're going to shoot. I yelled at the top of my lungs in the middle of the lobby. They're going to shoot. Beat it, all of you. I went to the window and shouted some more. What a disturbance. Poor soldier boy. The people said. The concierge led me gently to the bar, by suasion. He gave me something to drink and I drank quite a lot, and then the MPS came and took me away, not so gently. There'd been MPS at the Gallery of the Nations, too. I'd seen them. Lola kissed me and helped them to take me away with their handcuffs. 29. Then I fell sick. I was delirious, driven mad by fear, they said at the hospital. Maybe so. The best thing to do when you're in this world, don't you agree, is to get out of it. Crazy or not, scared or not. There was quite a commotion. Some people said, that young fellow's an anarchist, they'll shoot him, the sooner the better. Can let the grass grow under our feet with the war on. But there were others, more patient, who thought I was just syphilitic and sincerely insane. They consequently wanted me to be locked up until the war was over, or at least for several months, because they, who claimed to be sane and in their right minds, wanted to take care of me while they carried on the war all by themselves. Which proves that if you want people to think you're normal, there's nothing like having an all-fired nerve. If you've got plenty of nerve, you're all set, because then you're entitled to do practically anything at all. You've got the majority on your side, and it's the majority who decide what's crazy and what isn't. Even so, my diagnosis was very doubtful. So the authorities decided to put me under observation for a while. My little friend Lola had permission to visit me now and then, and so did my mother. That was all. We, the BFOG wounded, were lodged in a secondary school at Issy-les-Moulineaux, especially rigged to take in soldiers like me, whose patriotism was either impaired or dangerously sick, and get us by casualty or forced to confess. The treatment wasn't really bad, but we felt we were being watched every minute of the day by the staff of silent male nurses endowed with enormous ears. After a varying period of observation, we'd be quietly sent away and assigned to an insane asylum, the front, or, not infrequently, the firing squad. Among the comrades assembled in that suspect institution, I always wondered while listening to them talking in whispers in the mess hall, which ones might be on the point of becoming ghosts. In her little cottage near the gate dwelt the concierge, who sold us barley, sugar, and oranges, as well as the wherewithal for sewing on buttons. She also sold us pleasure. For non-coms, the price of pleasure was 10 francs. Everybody could have it. But watch your step, because men tend to get too confiding on such occasions. An expansive moment could cost you dearly. Whatever was confided to her she repeated in detail to the chief medical officer, and it went into your court-martial record. It seemed reliably established that she had a corporal of Spahis, a youngster still in his teens, shot for his confidences, as well as a reservist in the Corps of Engineers, who had swallowed nails to put his stomach out of commission, and a hysteric, who had described his method of staging a paralytic seizure at the front. One evening, to sound me out, she offered me the identification papers of a father of 6, who was dead, so she told me, saying they might help me to a rear echelon assignment. In short, she was a snake. In bed, though, she was superb. We came back again and again, and the pleasure she purveyed was real. She may have been a slut, but at least she was a real one. To give royal pleasure, they've got to be. In the kitchens of love, after all, vice is like the pepper in a good sauce. It brings out the flavor, it's indispensable. The school buildings opened out on a big terrace, golden in summer, surrounded by trees, with a magnificent panoramic view of Paris. It was there that our visitors waited for us on Thursdays, including Lola, as regular as clockwork, bringing cakes, advice, and cigarettes. We saw our doctors every morning. They questioned us amiably enough, but we never knew exactly what they were thinking. Under their affable smiles as they walked among us, they carried our death sentences. The mealy mouthed atmosphere reduced some of the patients under observation, more emotional than the rest, to such a state of exasperation that at night, instead of sleeping, they paced the ward from end to end, loudly protesting against their own anguish, convulsed between hope and despair, as on a dangerous mountain spurs for days and days they suffered, and then suddenly one night they'd go to pieces, run to the chief medical officer, and confess everything. They'd never be seen again. I wasn't easy in my mind myself. 30. But when you're weak, the best way to fortify yourself is to strip the people you fear of the last bit of prestige you're still inclined to give them. Learn to consider them as they are, worse than they are in fact and from every point of view. That will release you, set you free, protect you more than you can possibly imagine. It will give you another self. There will be two of you. That will strip their words and deeds of the obscene mystical fascination that weakens you and makes you waste your time. From then on you'll find their act no more amusing, no more relevant to your inner progress than that of the lowliest pig. Beside me, in the next bed, there was a corporal, a volunteer like me. Up until August he had been a teacher at a secondary school in Touraine, teaching history and geography, so he told me. After a few months in the front lines this teacher had turned out to be a champion thief. Nothing could stop him from stealing canned goods from the regimental supply train, the quartermaster trucks, the company stores, and anywhere else he could find them. So he landed there with the rest of us, while presumably awaiting court-martial. But since his family persisted in trying to prove that he had been stupefied and demoralized by shell shock, the prosecution deferred his trial from month to month. He didn't talk to me very much. He spent hours combing his beard, but when he spoke to me it was almost always about the same thing, about the method he had discovered for not getting his wife with any more children. Was he really insane? At a time when the world is upside down and it's thought insane to ask why you're being murdered, it obviously requires no great effort to pass for a lunatic. Of course your act has got to be convincing, but when it comes to keeping out of the big slaughterhouse, some people's imaginations become magnificently fertile. Everything that's important goes on in the darkness, no doubt about it. We never know anyone's real inside story. This teacher's name was Pritchard. What can the man have dreamed up to save his carotids, lungs, and optic nerves? That was the crucial question, the question we men should have asked one another if we'd wanted to be strictly human and rational. Far from it, we staggered along in a world of idealistic absurdities, hemmed in by insane, bellicose platitudes. Like smoke-maddened rats we tried to escape from the burning ship, but we had no general plan, no faith in one another. Dazed by the war, we had developed a different kind of madness, fear. The heads and tails of the war. In the midst of the general delirium, this Pritchard took a certain liking to me, though he distrusted me of course. In the place and situation we were in, friendship and trust were out of the question. No one revealed any more than he thought useful for his survival, since everything or practically everything was sure to be repeated by some attentive stool pigeon. From time to time one of us disappeared. That meant the case against him was ready and the court-martial would sentence him to a disciplinary battalion, to the front, or, if he was very lucky, to the insane asylum in Clamart. More dubious warriors kept arriving, from every branch of service, some very young, some almost old, some terrified, some ranting and swaggering. Their wives and parents came to see them, and their children too, staring wide-eyed, on Thursdays. They all wept buckets in the visiting room, especially in the evening. All the helplessness of the world at war wept when the visits were over and the women and children left, dragging their feet into the bleak gas-lit corridor. I heard of sniveling riffraff, that's what they were. Disgusting. To Lola it was still an adventure, coming to see me in that prison, as you might have called it. We too didn't 31. Cry. Where would we have got our tears from? Is it true that you've gone mad, Ferdinand? She asked me one Thursday. It's true, I admitted. But they'll treat you here? There's no treatment for fear, Lola. Is it as bad as all that? It's worse, Lola. My fear is so bad that if I die a natural death later on, I especially don't want to be cremated. I want them to leave me in the ground, quietly rotting in the graveyard, ready to come back to life. Maybe. How do we know? But if they burn me to ashes, Lola, don't you see, it would be over, really over. A skeleton, after all, is still something like a man. It's more likely to come back to life than ashes. Reduced to ashes, you're finished. What do you think? Naturally the war. Oh, Ferdinand. Then you're an absolute coward. You're as loathsome as a rat. Yes, an absolute coward, Lola. I reject the war and everything in it. I don't deplore it. I don't resign myself to it. I don't weep about it. I just plain reject it and all its fighting men. I don't want anything to do with them or it. Even if there were 995 million of them and I were all alone, they'd still be wrong and I'd be right. Because I'm the one who knows what I want, I don't want to die. But it's not possible to reject the war, Ferdinand. Only crazy people and cowards reject the war when their country is in danger. If that's the case, hurrah for the crazy people. Look, Lola, do you remember a single name, for instance, of any of the soldiers killed in the 100 Years' War? Did you ever try to find out who any of them were? No. You see? You never tried. As far as you're concerned, they're as anonymous, as indifferent, as the last atom of that paperweight, as your morning bowel movement. Get it into your head, Lola, that they died for nothing. For absolutely nothing, the idiots. I say it and I'll say it again. I proved it. The one thing that counts is life. In 10,000 years, I'll bet you, this war, remarkable as it may seem to us at present, will be utterly forgotten. Maybe here and there in the world a handful of scholars will argue about its causes or the dates of the principal hecatombs that made it famous. Up until now, those are the only things about men that other men have thought worth remembering after a few centuries, a few years, or even a few hours. I don't believe in the future, Noah. When she heard me flaunting my shameful state like that, she lost all sympathy for me. Once and for all, she put me down as contemptible, and decided to leave me without further ado. It was too much. When I left her that evening at the hospital gate, she didn't kiss me. Evidently the thought that a condemned man might have no vocation for death was too much for her. When one asked her how her pancakes were doing, she did not reply. On my return to the dormitory, I found Pritchard at the window with a crowd of soldiers around him. He was trying out a pair of dark glasses on the gaslight. The idea, he explained, had come to him last summer at the seashore, and since it was summer now, he was planning to wear them next day in the park. That park was enormous and exceedingly well policed by squads of vigilant orderlies. The next day Pritchard insisted on my going for a walk on the terrace with him to try out his beautiful glasses. A blazing afternoon beat down on him, defended by his opaque lenses. I noticed that his nose was almost transparent at the nostrils and that he was breathing hard. My friend, he confided, time is passing and it's not on my side. My conscience is immune to remorse. I have been relieved, thank God, of those years. It's not crimes that count in this world, people stopped 32. Counting them long ago. What counts is blunders. And I believe I've made one. That's absolutely irremediable. Stealing canned goods? Yes, just imagine. I thought I was being so clever. My idea was to abstract myself from the battle and return, disgraced but still alive, to peace, as one returns, exhausted, to the surface of the sea after a long dive. I almost succeeded, but this war, undoubtedly, has been going on too long. So long that cannon fodder disgusting enough to discuss the pattery is no longer conceivable. She has begun to accept every offering, regardless of where it comes from, every variety of meat. Today there's no such thing as a soldier unworthy to bear arms and, above all, to die under arms and by arms. They're going, latest news, to make a hero out of me. How imperious the homicidal madness must have become if they're willing to pardon, no, to forget. He theft of a can of meat. True, we have got into the habit of admiring colossal bandits, whose opulence is revered by the entire world, yet whose existence, once we stop to examine it, proves to be one long crime repeated ad infinitum. But those same bandits are heaped with glory, honors, and power. Their crimes are hallowed by the law of the land, whereas, as far back in history as the eye can see and history, as you know, is my business, everything conspires to show that a venial theft, especially of inglorious foodstuffs, such as bread crusts, ham, or cheese, unfailingly subjects its perpetrator to irreparable opprobrium, the categoric condemnation of the community, major punishment, automatic dishonor, and inexpiable shame, and this for two reasons. First, because the perpetrator of such an offense is usually poor, which in itself connotes basic unworthiness, and secondly because his act implies, as it were, a tacit reproach to the community. A poor man's theft is seen as a malicious attempt at individual redress. Where would we be? Note accordingly that in all countries the penalties for petty theft are extremely severe, not only as a means of defending society, but also as a stern admonition to the unfortunate to know their place, stick to their caste, and behave themselves, joyfully resigned to go on dying of hunger and misery down through the centuries forever and ever. Until today, however, petty thieves enjoyed one advantage in the Republic: they were denied the honor of bearing patriotic arms. But that's all over now. Tomorrow I, a thief, will resume my place in the army. Such are the orders. It has been decided in high places to forgive and forget what they call my momentary madness, and this, listen carefully, in consideration of what they call the honor of my family. What solicitude? I ask you, comrade, is it my family that's going to serve as a strainer and sorting house for next French and German bullets? It'll just be me, won't it? And when I'm dead, is the honor of my family going to bring me back to life? I can see how it will be with my family when these warlike scenes have passed, as everything passes. I can see my family on fine Sundays, joyfully gambling on the lawns of a new summer, while 3 feet under Papa, that's me, dripping with worms and infinitely more disgusting than 10 pounds of turds on the 14th of July, will be rotting stupendously with all my diluted flesh. Fertilize the fields of the anonymous plowman. That is the true future of the true soldier. Ah, comrade. This world, I assure you, is only a vast device for kidding the world. You are young. Let these minutes of wisdom be as years to you. Listen well, comrade, and don't fail to recognize and understand the telltale sign, which glares from all the murderous hypocrisies of our society: compassion with the fate, the condition of the poor. I tell you, little man, life's fall guys, beaten, fleeced to the bone, sweated from time immemorial. I warn you, that when the princes of this world start loving you, it means they're going to grind you up into battle sausage. That's the sign. It's infallible. It starts with affection. Louis XIV, at least, and don't forget it, didn't give a hoot in hell about his beloved people. Louis XV ditto. He smeared his asshole with them. True, we didn't live well in those days, the poor have never lived well, but the kings didn't flay them with the obstinacy, the persistence you meet with in today's tyrants. There's no rest, I tell you, for the little man, except in the contempt of the great, whose only motive for thinking of the common people is self-interest, when it isn't sadism. It's the philosophers. Another point to look out for while we're at it. Who first started giving the people ideas? When all they'd known up until then was the catechism. They began, so they 33. Proclaimed, to educate the people. Ah, what truths they had to reveal. Beautiful. Brilliant. Unprecedented truths. And the people were dazzled. That's it. They said. That's the stuff. Let's go and die for it. The people are always dying to die. That's the way they are. Long live Diderot. They yell. And long live Voltaire. They, at least, were first-class philosophers. And long live Carnot, 18, too, who was so good at organizing victories. And long live everybody. Those guys at least don't let the beloved people motor in ignorance and fetishism. They show the people the roads of freedom. Emancipation. Things went fast after that. First teach everybody to read the papers. That's the way to salvation. Hurry, hurry. No more literates. We don't need them anymore. Nothing but citizen soldiers. Who vote. Who read. And who fight. And who march. And send kisses from the front. In no time the people were good and ripe. The enthusiasm of the liberated has to be good for something, doesn't it? Danton wasn't eloquent for the hell of it. With a few phrases, so rousing that we can still hear them today, he had the people mobilized before you could say fiddlesticks. That was when the first battalions of emancipated maniacs marched off. The first voting, phlegmatic suckers that Dumouriez 19 led the way to get themselves drilled full of holes in Flanders. As for Dumouriez himself, who had come too late to these newfangled idealistic pastimes, he discovered that he was more interested in money and deserted. He was our last mercenary. The free gratis soldier was something really new. So new that when Governor 20 arrived in Valmy, Veta or not, he was flabbergasted. At the sight of those ragged, impassioned cohorts, who had come of their own free will to get themselves disemboweled by the King of Prussia in defense of a patriotic fiction no one had ever heard of, Veta realized that he still had much to learn. This day, he declaimed grandiloquently as defeated the habits of his genius, marks the beginning of a new era. He could say that again. The system proved successful. Pretty soon they were mass-producing heroes, and in the end, the system was so well perfected that they cost practically nothing. Everyone was delighted. Bismarck, the two Napoleons, Bar, 21, Elsa the horsewoman. 22, the religion of the flag promptly replaced the cult of heaven, an old cloud which had already been deflated by the Reformation and reduced to a network of episcopal money boxes. In olden times the fanatical fashion was, long live Jesus. Burn the heretics. But heretics, after all, were few and voluntary. Whereas today vast hordes of men are fired with aim and purpose by cries of, hang the limp turnips. The juiceless lemons. The innocent readers. By the millions, eyes right. If anybody doesn't want to fight or murder, grab them, tear them to pieces. Kill them in 13 juicy ways. For a starter, to teach them how to live, rip their guts out of their bodies, their eyes out of their sockets, and the ears out of their filthy slobbering lives. Let whole legions of them perish, turn into smidgens, bleed, smolder in acid and eat all that to make the patrie more beloved, more fair, and more joyful. And if in their midst there are any foul creatures who refuse to understand these sublime truths, they can just go and bury themselves right with the others. No, not quite. Their place will be at the far end of the cemetery, under the shameful epitaphs of cowards without an ideal, for those contemptible slugs will have forfeited the glorious right to a small patch of the shadow of a municipal monument erected by the lowest bidder in the Central Avenue to commemorate the reputable dead, and also the right to hear so much as a distant echo of the minister's speech next Sunday, when he comes around to urinate at the prefecture and sound off over the graves after lunch. But from the end of the garden someone was calling Pritchard. The head physician had sent his orderly to get him on the double. Coming, Pritchard cried. He had barely time enough to hand me the draft of the speech he had been trying out on me. A ham if there ever was one. I never saw Pritchard again. He had the same trouble as all intellectuals. He was ineffectual. He knew too many things, and they confused him. He needed all sorts of gimmicks to steam him up, help him make up his mind. It's been a long time since that night when he went away. But I remember it well. Suddenly the houses 34 at the end of our park stood out sharply, as things do before the night takes hold of them. The trees grew larger in the twilight and shot up to the sky to meet the night. I never made any attempt to get in touch with Pritchard, to find out if he had really disappeared, as they kept saying. But it's best if he disappeared. While the war was still on, the seeds of our hateful peace were being sown. A hysterical bitch, you could see what she'd be like just by watching her cavorting in the dingy hall of the Olympia. In that long cellar room, you could see her squinting out of 100 mirrors, stamping her feet in the dust and despair to the music of a Negro Judeo-Saxon band. Britishers and blacks, Levantines and Russians were everywhere, smoking and bellowing, military melancholies lined up on the red plush sofas. Those uniforms that people are beginning to find it hard to remember were the seeds of the present day, of something that is still growing and that won't become total shit for a while yet, but will in the long run. Every week, after spending a few hours at the Olympia, warming up our desires, a few of us would go calling on our friend Madame Carot, 23, who kept a lingerie, glove, and bookshop in the impasse des seen as 24 behind the Foliesberg, a covered passage that isn't there anymore, where little girls brought little dogs on leashes to do their business. We went there to grow for our happiness, which all the world was threatening with the utmost ferocity. We were ashamed of wanting what we wanted, but something had to be done about it all the same. Love is hard to give up in life. In this world we spend our time killing or adoring, or both together. I hate you. I adore you. We keep going, we fuel and refuel, we pass on our life to a biped of the next century, with frenzy, at any cost, as if it were the greatest of pleasures to perpetuate ourselves, as if, when all said and done, it would make us immortal. One way or another, kissing is as indispensable as scratching. My mental state had improved, but my military situation was still uncertain. I had leave to go out now and then. Anyway, the name of our lingerie lady was Madame Carot. Her forehead was low and so narrow that at first you felt uneasy in her presence, but her lips were so smiling and voluptuous that after a while you didn't see how you could get away from her. Under a surface of staggering volubility and unforgettable ardor, she concealed a set of simple, rapacious, and piously mercantile aims. In a few months she piled up a fortune, thanks to the Allies and thanks above all to her uterus. Her ovaries had been removed. To put it plainly, she had been operated for salpingitis the year before. That liberating castration had made her fortune. Gonorrhea in a woman can be providential. A woman who spends her time worrying about pregnancy is a virtual cripple. She'll never go very far. Old men and young men thought, and so did I, that love was easily and cheaply available in the backrooms of certain lingerie bookshops. That was still true some 20 years ago, but today a lot of things aren't done anymore, especially some of the most agreeable. Every month Anglo-Saxon Puritanism is drawing us up a little more. It has already reduced those impromptu backroom carousals to practically nothing. Now marriage and respectability are the thing. In those days, for the last time, there was still freedom to fuck standing up and cheat, and Madame Perrault put it to good use. One Sunday an auction room appraiser with time on his hands sighted her shop and went in. He's still there. He was slightly gaga, and gaga he remained, but nothing more. Their happiness aroused no interest in the neighborhood. In the shadow of the newspapers with their delirious appeals for ultimate patriotic sacrifices, life went on, strictly rationed, larded with precautions, and more trickily resourceful than ever before. Those are the heads and tails, the light and shade, of the same coin. Madame Perrault's appraiser invested money in Holland for his better-informed friends, and for Madame Perrault as well once they became intimate. Her stock of neckties and brasiers and almost chemises is 35. Attracted customers of both sexes and brought them back time and time again. Any number of national and international encounters took place in the pink shadow of those curtains, amid the incessant loquacity of Madame Perrault, whose substantial, talkative, and overwhelmingly perfumed person would have put the most furious of males in a lecherous mood. Far from losing her head in these miscellaneous gatherings, Madame Perrault turned them to her advantage, first in terms of money, since she levied a tithe on all sentimental transactions, but also through her enjoyment of all the lovemaking that went on around her. She took pleasure in bringing couples together and as much or more in breaking them up by means of tale-telling, insinuations, and out-and-out treachery. She never wearied of fomenting happiness and tragedy. She stoked the life of the passions, and her business prospered. Proust, who was half ghost, immersed himself with extraordinary tenacity in the infinitely watery futility of the rites and procedures that entwine the members of high society, those denizens of the void, those phantoms of desire, those irresolute daisy-chainers still waiting for their Watteau, those listless seekers after implausible Cythereas. Whereas Madame Perrault, with her sturdy cock of origins, was firmly fastened to the earth by her crude, stupid, and very specific appetites. Maybe, if people are so wicked, it's only because they suffer, but years can elapse between the time when they stop suffering and the time when their characters take a turn for the better. Madame Perrault's impressive material and amatory success hadn't had time yet to soften her rapacious instincts. She was no more hateful than most of the shopkeeping ladies about, but she took so much trouble convincing people of the contrary that one doesn't tend to forget her. Her shop was more than a meeting place, it was a kind of secret gateway to a world of wealth and luxury, in which, much as I had wanted to, I had never set foot until then, and from which I was promptly and embarrassingly ejected after one furtive incursion, my first and last. In Paris the rich live together. Their neighborhoods adjoin and coalesce, so as to form a wedge of urban cape, the tip of which touches the Louvre and the rounded outer edge is bounded by the trees between the Pont d'Artois 25 and the Porte des Ternes. That's the good part of the city. All the rest is shit and misery. At first glance the rich neighborhoods don't look so very different from the rest of the city, except that the streets are a little cleaner. But if you want to go deeper in your excursion, to get inside the people who live there, you'll have to rely on chance or on intimate connections. Madame Perrault's shop could give you some little access to this preserve, through the Argentines who came in from the privileged neighborhoods to buy shirts and underwear and flirt with the unusual selection of ambitious, theatrical, musical, and well-built young friends whom Madame Perrault deliberately gathered around her. I, who, as they say, had nothing to offer but my youth, became too much interested in one of them. Little Mousine they called her and her crowd. In the passage des Biorcinas, the shopkeepers all knew one another. It was like a provincial village wedged for years between two Paris streets. In other words, everybody slandered and spied on everybody else as much as was humanly and deliriously possible. What the shopkeepers mostly talked and complained about before the war was the petty, desperately thrifty life they all led. Among other sordid hardships, the chronic complaint of those shopkeepers was being obliged by the prevailing gloom to light their gas at 4 in the afternoon because of their showcases. But inside the shops, the self-same twilight made for an atmosphere conducive to off-color suggestions. Nevertheless, a good many of the shops were being ruined by the war, while Madame Perrault's, thanks to 36. The young Argentines, to officers with per diem allowances, and to the advice of her friendly appraiser, enjoyed a prosperity on which, as you can easily imagine, the whole neighborhood commented in the most vitriolic terms. It was just about then, for instance, that the famous pastry shop at 112 lost its best customers. The latest mobilization was to blame. So many horses had been requisitioned that the ladies with the long gloves, who had dropped in regularly at tea time, would have been obliged to walk. They stopped coming, and they never came back. Sam Bannett, the music finder, was suddenly unable to resist the urge, which had long tormented him, to sodomize a soldier. A bungled attempt one night did him irreparable harm with certain patriotic gentlemen, who accused him forthwith of being a spy. He was obliged to close up shop. Then Mademoiselle Hermans, at number 26, who had hitherto specialized in the sale of a certain mentionable or unmentionable item made of rubber, would have been doing all right under the prevailing circumstances, if she hadn't found it so unconscionably difficult to procure her merry widows, which were made in Germany. In short, it was only Madame Perrault who, on the threshold of a new era of lighter than air democratic lingerie, found an easy way to prosperity. Plenty of anonymous letters were written from shop to shop, and they didn't mince words. Madame Perrault preferred for her entertainment to write to highly placed persons, so demonstrating that a virulent ambition was the cornerstone of her character. She wrote several to the Premier, for instance, just to convince him that he was a cuckold, and some to Marshal Pytane 26 in English, with the help of a dictionary, to drive him crazy. But what's an anonymous letter? Water off a duck's back. Every day Madame Perrault received a whole packet of these unsigned letters, which didn't smell good, I assure you. She'd be pensive, upset, for about 10 minutes, but then she'd recover her composure. She didn't care how or by what means, but she got it back good and solid, for there was no place for doubt in her inner life, and still less for truth. Among her customers and proteges, there were several young ladies from the entertainment world, actresses and musicians who came with more debts than clothes. Madame Kuro gave them advice, and it helped them no end. One of them was Musain, the most attractive of the lot for my money. Musain was a musician. She played the violin, a very shrewd little angel, as I was soon to learn. Implacable in her determination to succeed here on earth and not in heaven, she was doing all right at the time of our first meeting in an adorable, exceedingly Parisian, and now completely forgotten little laugh at the Variettes. 27 she'd appear with her violin in a kind of impromptu prologue in melody and verse. A charming, complicated genre. Smitten as I was, my days became a frenzy, dashing from the hospital to the back door of her theater. I was seldom alone in waiting for her. The ground forces would snatch her away in a twinkling. The Flyers had an even easier time of it, but undoubtedly the seduction prize went to the Argentines. As more and more soldiers swarmed to the colors, their cold storage meat business assumed the proportions of a tidal wave. Little Musain made a good thing of those profiteering days. She knew what she was doing. Since then the Argentines had gone out of existence. I didn't understand. I was being hornswoggled by everything and everybody, women, money, and ideas. I was a sucker, and I didn't like it. I still run into Musain now and then. Every 2 years or so she crosses my path, as people one has known well tend to. 2 years is the time it takes to perceive at one glance, a glance as sure as instinct, the ugliness that can come over a face, even one that was delicious in its day. For a moment you hesitate, then you accept the face as it has become, with its repugnant cumulative disharmony. What can you do but acquiesce in this slow, painstaking caricature which 2 years have 37? Etched, but accept the passage of time, that portrait of ourselves. Then we can say that we've really recognized each other like some foreign banknote that one hesitates to accept at first sight, that we hadn't taken a wrong turn, that each on his own we traveled the right road, the inevitable road to decay, for another 2 years. That's all there is to it. When she ran into me like that, I frightened her so with my big head it looked as if she wanted to run away, to avoid me, to turn aside, anything. Obviously, as far as she was concerned, I stank of a whole past. But I've known her age for too long, and try as she will, she absolutely can't escape me. She stands there, evidently put off by my existence, as if I were a monster. She, so sensitive, feels obliged to ask me crude, stupid questions, the kind that a housemaid caught stealing sugar might ask. All women are domestics at heart. But possibly she imagines this revulsion more than she feels it. That's the only consolation I can find. Maybe I'm not really repulsive, but only give her the illusion that I am. Maybe I'm an artist in that line. After all, why wouldn't there be an art of ugliness as well as beauty? Maybe it's a gift that needs to be cultivated. For a long time I thought little Musain was stupid, but that was only because I was vain and she had run out on me. Before the war, you know, we were all a lot more ignorant and conceited than today. A little nobody like me was much more likely to take rubbish for rainbows than he would be today. I thought being in love with somebody as adorable as Musain would give me every kind of strength and virtue, especially the courage I lacked, just because she was so pretty and such a gifted musician. Love is like liquor. The drunker and more impotent you are, the stronger and smarter you think yourself and the surer you are of your rights. Dozens of Madame Carot's cousins had made the supreme sacrifice, so she never left her passage except in deep mourning. To tell the truth, she seldom went out, because the appraiser was pretty jealous. We gathered in the dining room behind the shop, which with the coming of prosperity had taken on the appearance of a little salon. There we would chit and pass the time in a pleasant, well-behaved kind of way under the gas jet. Little Musain at the piano would charm us with classical pieces. Only classical music was thought fitting in those sorrowful times. We'd sit there for whole afternoons, side by side, the appraiser in the middle, musing over our secrets, our fears and hopes. Madame Carot's maid, whom she had hired only a short time before, was always bursting with impatience to find out when this one would finally make up his mind to marry that one. In her billetry love was unheard of. All those Argentines and officers and slippery-fingered customers filled her with an almost animal terror. More and more often Musain was monopolized by the South American customers. What with waiting for my angel, I soon got to know the caballeros' kitchens and servants very well. Naturally the valets took me for a pimp. In the end everybody took me for a pimp, including Musain and, I'm pretty sure, the regulars at Madame Carot's shop. There was nothing I could do about it. Sooner or later people are bound to classify you as something. I wrangled another 2 months convalescent leave, and there was even some talk of a medical discharge. Musain and I decided to go and live together in Billancourt. This was actually a subterfuge to ditch me, because she took advantage of its being so far away to come home less and less frequently. She was always finding some pretext for spending the night in Paris. The nights in Billancourt were soft and sweet, enlivened now and then by those childish airplane or Zeppelin alarms which provided the civilian population with thrills and self-justification. While waiting for Musain, I'd walk as far as the Pont de Grenelle, 28, where the darkness rises from the river to the overhead metro tracks, with their strings of lights traversing the darkness and their enormous metallic hulks, hurling themselves like thunder at the flanks of the big buildings on the Quai de Passy. 38. There are neighborhoods like that in big cities, so stupidly ugly that you're almost always alone there. In the end Musain was showing up at our so-called home only once a week. More and more often she'd spend the evening accompanying some lady singer at the house of some Argentine. She could have made a living playing at the movies, and it would have been a lot easier for me to call for her, but the Argentines were lively and paid well, while the movie houses were dismal and the pay was wretched. Life is made up of those little preferences. To complete my misery, the theater of the armies came along. In no time Musain got to know dozens of people at the ministry. More and more often she went off to entertain our soldier boys at the front and stayed away for weeks on end, serving up sonatas and adagios to the troops. The front seats in the orchestra would be occupied by top brass, well placed to admire her legs, while the soldiers, seated on wooden stands behind their commanders, had to make do with melodious echoes. After the performance, of course, she would spend exceedingly complicated nights in the hotels of the army area. One day, she came home as happy as a lark, brandishing a certificate of heroism, signed if you please by one of our glorious generals. With that diploma, she became a real success. It made her ever so popular with the Argentine colony. They hated her. They were mad about my Musain. Oh, what an adorable little frontline violinist. So rosy-cheeked and curly-headed, and a heroine to boot. Those Argentines knew which side their bread was buttered on. Their admiration for our glorious generals knew no bounds, and when my Musain came back to them with her authentic document, her pretty fist, and her nimble, heroic little fingers, each tried to love her more than the next. They tried to outbid each other, so to speak. The poetry of heroism holds an irresistible appeal for people who aren't involved in a war, especially when they're making piles of money out of one. It's only natural. Johnny heroism. Strong men have swooned away. The shipbuilders of Rio offered their names and their shares to the adorable young thing who feminized the warlike valor of the French so charmingly for their benefit. Musain, I have to admit, had managed to outfit herself with a delightful little repertory of war adventures. They were wonderfully becoming, like a Johnny little cat. Sometimes she amazed me with her skillful touch, and listening to her I had to own that when it came to tall stories I was a clumsy faker compared to her. She had a gift for locating her fantasies in a dramatic faraway setting that gave everything a lasting glow. It often struck me that when we combatants spun yarns they tended to be crudely chronometric and precise. Her medium was eternity. Claude Lorraine 29 was right in saying that the foreground of the picture is always repugnant and that the interest of an artwork must be seen in the distance, in that unfathomable realm which is the refuge of lies, of those dreams caught in the act, which are the only thing men love. The woman who can turn our despicable nature to account has no difficulty in becoming our darling, our indispensable and supreme hope. We expect her to preserve our illusory raison d'être, but on the other hand she can make a very good living while performing this magic function. Instinctively, Musain did just that. The Argentines lived in the Turns area and on the fringes of the Blois, in small private houses, resplendent and well fenced in, which were kept so delightfully warm in that wintry weather that when you came in from the street your thoughts suddenly took an optimistic turn. You couldn't help it. In my jittery despair, I had taken to waiting for Musain in the butler's pantry as often as possible, a stupid thing to do. Sometimes I waited until morning. I was sleepy, but jealousy kept me awake, and so did the quantities of white wine the servants poured out for me. I seldom saw the Argentine masters of the house. I heard their songs and their blustering Spanish in the piano which never stopped but was usually being played by other hands than those of my Musain. What, meanwhile, was she doing with her hands, the slut? When she saw me at the door in the morning, she made a face. I was still as natural as an animal in those days. I was like a dog with a bone. I wouldn't let go. 39. People waste a large part of their youth in stupid mistakes. It was obvious that my darling was going to leave me, flat and soon. I hadn't found out yet that mankind consists of two very different races, the rich and the poor. It took me and plenty of other people 20 years and a war to learn to stick to my class and ask the price of things before touching them, let alone setting my heart on them. So as I warmed myself in the pantry with the servants, I was unaware that the people dancing over my head were Argentine gods. They could have been German, French, or Chinese. That didn't mean a thing. The point was that they were gods, rich people. That's what I should have realized. Them upstairs with Musain, me downstairs with nothing. Musain was thinking seriously of her future, and naturally she preferred to do that kind of thinking with a god. I, too, was thinking of my future, but in a kind of delirium, because my constant companion was a muted fear of being killed in war or of starving when peace came. I had a death sentence hanging over me, and I was in love. A nightmare, to put it mildly. Not far away, less than 70 miles, millions of brave, well-armed, well-trained men were waiting to settle my hash, and plenty of Frenchmen were waiting, too, to pump me full of lead if I declined to be cut into bleeding ribbons by the opposite side. A poor man in this world can be done to death in two main ways, by the absolute indifference of his fellows in peacetime or by their homicidal mania when there's a war. When other people start thinking about you, it's to figure out how to torture you, that and nothing else. The bastards want to see you bleeding, otherwise they're not interested. Pritchard was dead right. In the shadow of the slaughterhouse, you don't speculate very much about your future, you think about loving in the days you have left, because there's no other way of forgetting your body that's about to be skinned alive. Since Musain was slipping away from me, I took myself for an idealist, which is the name we give to our little instincts clothed in high-sounding words. My leave was drawing to an end. The newspapers were summoning every conceivable combatant to the colors. First of all, it goes without saying, the ones without connections. An official order had gone out that no one should think of anything but winning the war. Musain, like Lola, was extremely eager to have me get back to the front on the double and stay there, and since I seemed to be dragging my feet, she decided to expedite matters, which was unusual for her. One night when for a change we went home to Billancourt together, the fire brigade came by blowing bugles, and everybody in our house went scrambling down to the cellar in honor of some Zeppelin. Those petty panics, when a whole neighborhood in pajamas would pick up candles and vanish, cackling and clucking, into the bowels of the earth to escape a peril that was almost entirely imaginary, showed out the terrifying futility of those people, who behaved by turns like frightened hens and sheepish sheep. These preposterous inconsistencies ought to disgust the most patient, the most tenacious of sociophiles for good and all. At the first blast of the bugle, Musain forgot every bit of the heroism for which she had been cited at the theater of the armies. She insisted on rushing into some hole and dragging me with her, into the metro, the sewers, anywhere, as long as it was sheltered and deep enough underground. After a while the sight of all those people, our fellow tenants, fat and thin, jovial and majestic, descending 4 by 4, into the salutary pit, armed even me with indifference. Brave or cowardly, there's not much difference. A poltroon in one situation, a hero in another tease the same man, and he doesn't think any more in one aspect than in the other. Everything unrelated to making money is infinitely beyond him. The question of life and death escapes him completely. Even on the subject of his own death his cogitations are feeble and ass backward. He understands money and theatricals, nothing else. Musain whined when I resisted. Other tenants urged us to come along, and in the end I gave in. There were several cellar compartments to choose from, and various suggestions were made. The majority, finally 40, favored the butcher's storage cellar. It was deeper down, so they said, than any of the others. On the stairs I caught a whiff of an acrid odor that I knew only too well and which I absolutely couldn't bear. "Miss," I said, "are you really going down there? With all that meat hanging on hooks?" The question surprised her. "Why not?" "Well," I said, "I have certain memories. I'd rather go back upstairs." "You mean you're leaving me?" "You'll join me as soon as it's over. But it may go on a long time." "I'd rather wait for you upstairs," I said. "I don't like meat, and it'll be over soon." During the alert, sheltered in their dens, the tenants exchanged sprightly comments. Some ladies in kimonos, the last to arrive, swept with elegance and grace into the odoriferous chasm, where the butcher and his wife bade them welcome, at the same time apologizing for the artificial cold, indispensable for the conservation of their merchandise. Miss Sine vanished with the rest. I waited in our apartment, a night, a whole day, a year. She never came back to me. From that time on I became harder and harder to please. I had only two thoughts in my head, to save my skin and go to America. But getting away from the war was a first step which kept me busy and breathless for months and months. The patriots kept clamoring, guns, men, ammunition. They never seemed to get tired. It looked as if they wouldn't be able to sleep until poor Belgium and innocent little Alsace were wrested from the German yoke. It was an obsession which, so we were told, prevented the best of our fellow citizens from breeding, eating, or copulating. But it didn't seem to prevent the survivors from swinging business deals. Morale was doing all right on the home front. There was every reason to ship us back to our regiments in a hurry. But when the medics looked me over, they still found me subnormal, barely good enough to be sent to another hospital, this one for the bones and nervous system. One morning 6 of us, 3 artillerymen and 3 dragoons, all of us sick and wounded, left the depot in quest of this institution where shattered courage, demolished reflexes, and broken arms were repaired. First, like all wounded soldiers at the time, we stopped for checkup at the Val de Gre, 30, that noble pot-bellied citadel, with its beard of trees. The quarters smelled like a third-class railway carriage smell that's gone today, forever no doubt, compounded of feet, straw, and oil lamps. We didn't hang fire at the Val. They barely caught sight of us when 2 administrative, bed and drought, and overworked officers chewed us out good and proper, threatened us with a court-martial, and projected us via other administrators into the street. They had no room for us, so they said, and directed us, very vaguely, to a bastion situated somewhere in the outskirts. From Bistrict to bastion, from Absinthe to Cathai-CRE, the 6 of us wandered about, at the mercy of every misdirector, in search of this new refuge which seemed to specialize in the treatment of incompetent heroes like us. Only one of us had even the most rudimentary personal property, and that faded nicely into a little tin box marked Turnip Biscuit, a well-known brand at the time, though I never hear it mentioned anymore. In that box our comrade kept a few cigarettes and a toothbrush. Come to think of it, we used to kid him about the care he took of his teeth, which was most unusual at the time. Homosexual we used to call him. Finally, in the middle of the night, we approached the outworks, swollen with darkness of the Vickery 41. Bastion. Number 43 it was called. That was the place. It had just been renovated to serve as a home for elderly cripples. They hadn't even finished laying out the garden. When we got there wasn't a living soul in the military section, only the concierge. The rain was coming down in buckets. The concierge was terrified when she heard us, but we made her laugh by touching her in the right place. "I thought it was the Germans," she said. "They're miles away," we told her. "Where are you wounded?" she asked with concern. "All over, but not in the cock," said one of the artillerymen. That, I don't mind telling you, was real wit, just the kind the concierge liked. Later on some old men on welfare were lodged in that bastion with us. New buildings with miles and miles of window glass had been thrown up for them in a hurry, and there they were kept like insects until the end of the war. On the surrounding hills a rash of skimpy housing lots vied for possession of the seas of mud inadequately contained by rows of precarious shacks, in the shadow of which one would occasionally see a head of lettuce and 3 radishes, of which, it is hard to say why, the nauseating slugs were making the housey owner a present. Our hospital was clean. You have to hurry to see that kind of thing, move in at the beginning, the first few weeks, because maintenance isn't a French virtue. We have no taste for it, in fact, we're downright disgusting in that respect. We flopped on 6 metal beds, at random and by moonlight. The building was so new the electricity hadn't been put in yet. Early next morning the doctor came and introduced himself. He seemed delighted to see us and exuded cordiality. He had reasons for being pleased. He'd just been promoted to major, and in addition he had the most beautiful eyes you ever saw, supernatural velvet. He made use of them to flutter the hearts of several volunteer nurses, who surrounded him with attentions and sympathetic mimicry and feasted on every word and move of their dear doctor. At the very first meeting he took our morale in hand and told us as much. Taking one of us by the shoulders and shaking him with paternal familiarity, he explained the regulations in a comforting tone and indicated the quickest and surest way of getting ourselves sent back to the front to be lambasted some more. Wherever they came from, no 2 ways about it, that was their only thought. It seemed to give them a kick. It was the new vice. France, my friends, he proclaimed, has put her trust in you. France is a woman. She is counting on your heroism. She has been a victim of the most cowardly, the most abominable aggression. She has a right to expect her sons to avenge her to the hilt. To a sword, even at the cost of the extreme sacrifice, every square inch of her territory. All of us here in the hospital, my friends, will do our duty, and we expect you to do yours. Our science is at your disposal. It is yours. All its resources will be devoted to curing you. Help us with your goodwill. I know we can count on your goodwill. We hope, we trust, that each one of you will soon resume his place side by side with his dear comrades in the trenches. Your sacred place. Defending your beloved soil. Vive la France. Forward to battle. He knew how to talk to soldiers. We were all standing at attention at the foot of our beds. Behind him, a brunette, one of his group of pretty nurses, was having a hard time controlling her feelings, which were made visible by 3 or 4 tears. The other nurses, her friends, tried to comfort her. Don't worry, sweetie, he'll be back. I'm sure he will. Her cousin, a plumpish blonde, was consoling her the most. As she passed us, holding her up with both arms, the plump one told me this weakness had overcome her pretty cousin because her fiancé had just gone off to the Navy. Our impassioned medical authority tried to soothe the tragic and beautiful emotion aroused by his short, vibrant speech. He was embarrassed and grieved. The apprehension he had awakened in this profound and noble heart, all sensibility and tenderness, was too painful. If we had only known, doctor, the blonde cousin whispered, we'd have warned you. They love each other so dearly, you can't 42. Imagine. The group of nurses and the master went their way. Chattering and swishing, they were seated down the corridor. They had finished with us. I tried to recollect, and to fathom the meaning of the speech the man with the beautiful eyes had just made, but far from depressing me, when I thought it over, his words struck me as just what was needed to disgust me with the whole idea of dying. My comrades were of the same opinion, but they did not, like me, see a kind of challenge or insult in them. They made no attempt to understand what was going on around us. All they saw, and that unclearly, was that the usual delirium of the world had so increased in the last few months that there was nothing stable left for a man to build his existence on. Here in the hospital, just as in the Flanders night, death sought us. Here, to be sure, it threatened from a distance, but just as implacably, once the administration set it in pursuit of your trembling carcass. Here, it was true, they didn't ball us out, in fact they spoke gently, and they never talked about death, but our death sentence showed up distinctly in the corner of every paper they asked us to sign and in all the precautions they surrounded us with. Those tags around our necks and wrists. Whenever they let us out for a few hours. And all the advice they gave us. We felt counted, watched, serial numbered, enrolled in the vast multitude that would soon be leaving for the front. So naturally all the civilian and medical personnel around us seemed more cheerful than we were. The nurses, the bitches, weren't in the same boat. Their only thought was to go on living, to live longer and longer, to live and love, to stroll in the park and to copulate thousands and thousands of times. Every one of those angelic creatures had a plan all worked out in her perineum, like a convict, a little plan for love later on, when all of us soldier boys should have perished in God knows what mud and God knows how. Then they would sigh with a very special commemorative tenderness that would make them more attractive than ever. Interspersed with heartbreaking silences, they would evoke the tragic days of the war, the ghosts. Do you remember little Bardamu? They would say in the gathering dust, thinking of me, the lad who had coughed so much and given them such a time to make him stop. Poor boy, his morale was way down. I wonder what became of him? A few poetic regrets, if adroitly placed, are as becoming to a woman as gossamer hair in the moonlight. What I couldn't help hearing under their spoken words and expressions of sympathy was this, nice little soldier boy, you're going to die. You're going to die. This is war. Everyone has his own life. His role. His death. We seem to share your distress. But no one can share anyone else's death. A person's sound in body and soul should take everything that happens as entertainment, neither more nor less, and we are wholesome young women, beautiful, respected, healthy, and well-bred. For us the automatism of biology transforms the whole world into a joyous spectacle, into pure joy. Our health demands it. We can't afford the ugly dissipations of sorrow. We need stimulants and more stimulants. You'll soon be forgotten, dear little soldier boys. Be nice, die quickly, and let's hope the war will be over soon, so we can marry one of your charming officers. Preferably one with dark hair. And long live the powder that Pop is always talking about. How wonderful love must be when Johnny comes marching home. Our little husband will be decorated. Cited for bravery. You can shine his lovely boots on our happy wedding day if you like. If you're still in existence, soldier boy. Won't you be happy about our happiness, soldier boy? Every morning we saw our doctor, time and again we saw him surrounded by his nurses. He was a scientific light, we were told. The old men from the charity hospital next door would come jerking past our rooms, making useless, disjointed leaps. They'd go from room to room, spitting out gossip between their decayed teeth, purveying scraps of malignant, worn-out slander. Cloistered in their official misery as in an oozing dungeon, those aged workers ruminated the layer of shit that long years of servitude deposit on men's souls. Impotent hatreds grown rancid in the pissy idleness of dormitories. They employed their last 43 wavering energies in hurting each other a little more, in destroying what little pleasure and life they had left. Their last remaining pleasure. Their shriveled carcasses contained not one solitary item that was not absolutely vicious. As soon as it was settled that we soldiers were going to share the relative comfort of the bastion with those old men, they began to detest us in unison, but that didn't stop them from begging for the crumbs of tobacco on our windowsills and the bits of stale bread that had fallen under our benches. At mealtimes they pressed their parchment-skinned faces against the windows of our mess hall. Over their crinkled roomy noses, they peered in at us like covetous rats. One of those invalids seemed smarter and wickeder than the rest. He'd come and entertain us with the songs of his day. Herbiro at 31, he was called. He'd do anything we asked provided we gave him tobacco, anything except walk past the hospital morgue, which incidentally was never idle. One of our jokes was to make him go that way, while supposedly taking him for a little stroll. Won't you come in? We'd say when we got to the door. He'd run away, griping for all he was worth, so fast and so far we wouldn't see him again for at least 2 days. Herbiro had caught a glimpse of death. Professor Bestons, our medical major with the beautiful eyes, had installed a complicated assortment of gleaming electrical contraptions which periodically pumped us full of shocks. He claimed they had a tonic effect, and we had to put up with them on pain of banishment. It seems that Bestons was very rich. He must have been to be able to buy all those expensive electrocution machines. He could afford to throw money around because his father-in-law, a political bigwig, had done some heavy finagling while purchasing land for the government. Naturally, the doctor exploited his advantages. Crime and punishment, it all adds up. We took him as he was, and we didn't hate him. He examined our nervous systems with meticulous care and questioned us in a tone of polite familiarity. This sedulously cultivated good nature enchanted the nurses in his section, who all came of excellent families. Every morning these cutties looked forward to his displays of affability, which were just so yummy. In short, we were all actors in a play. Bestums had chosen the role of a benevolent, profoundly human and humane scientist. We pulled together, that was the essential. In this new hospital I shared a room with Sergeant Branlador, 32, a re-enlisted man. He was an old hospital hand. He'd been dragging his perforated intestines around for months and had been in 4 different hospitals. He had learned in the process how to attract and to hold the active sympathy of the nurses. He vomited, pissed, and shed blood with astonishing frequency. He also had a lot of trouble breathing, but none of that would have sufficed to win him the special good graces of the nurses, who had seen worse. So between 2 choking fits, if a doctor or nurse was passing, Branlador would sing out, "Victory. Victory. Victory will be ours." Or he'd murmur those same words with one corner or the whole of his lungs, as the circumstances required. Thus attuned to the ardently aggressive literature of the day by a well-calculated bit of histrionics, he enjoyed the highest moral standing. That man knew his stuff. Since all the world was a stage, acting was the thing. Branlador knew what he was doing. And indeed nothing looks more idiotic, nothing is more irritating than a sluggish spectator who turns up on stage by mistake. When you're up there, you've got to join in, come to life, act a part, take the plunge or clear out. Especially the women demanded a show, the bitches had no use at all for clumsy amateurs. Unquestionably war went straight to their ovaries, they demanded heroes, and if you weren't a hero you had to pretend to be one or be prepared for the most ignominious fate. After a week in this new hospital we realized that we would absolutely have to change our image, and 44. Thanks to Branlador, lace salesmen in civilian life, the self-same men, who on our arrival had been terror-stricken, shunning the light, haunted by disgraceful memories of slaughterhouses, metamorphosed ourselves into an incredible gang of swashbucklers, determined to conquer or die, and, take my word for it, armed with daring do and the most outrageous language. Our speech had indeed become vigorous and so obscene that the ladies sometimes blushed, but they never complained because it is generally agreed that a soldier is as brave as he is wild and cruder than there is any need to be, so much so that his bravery can be measured by the crudeness of his language. At first, though we copied Branlador to the best of our ability, our patriotic act wasn't quite right, it wasn't really convincing. It took a good week, 2 in fact, of intensive rehearsing before we had fully caught on. As soon as that scientific luminary, our professor Major Dr. Bestums, noticed the striking improvement in our moral attitudes, he decided to encourage us by admitting a few visitors, our parents to begin with. To judge by stories I had heard, certain soldiers, really gifted types, experienced a kind of intoxication, you might even speak of an exotic thrill, in combat. Whenever I tried to imagine this particular brand of pleasure, just trying laid me low for at least a week, I felt so incapable of killing anyone that I thought I might just as well give it up right away and abandon the whole idea. Not that I lacked experience, they'd done everything possible to inculcate a taste for killing, but I simply had no talent in that direction. Maybe my initiation should have been more gradual. One day I decided to tell Professor Bestums how hard I was finding it, body and soul, to become as brave as I should have liked to be and as the undoubtedly sublime circumstances required. I was uneasy, afraid he would think I was being insolent and talking out of turn. Not at all. The great man said he was delighted that I'd come to him and bared my troubled soul so fully and frankly. "You're better, friend Bardamu," he concluded. "You're better, that's all there is to it. Yes, Bardamu, I regard your coming to me like this, absolutely of your own free will, as a most encouraging sign of a marked improvement in your mental state." Vance Quinn, 33, that modest but infinitely wise observer of moral breakdown in the soldiers of the Empire, summed up his findings, back in 1802, in a memoir that is quite unjustly neglected by students of the present day, but must nevertheless be regarded as a classic. In it he describes, with remarkable insight and precision, the so-called confessional crises met with in moral convalescence, and terms them the most encouraging of all symptoms. Almost a century later our great upright 34 established his now celebrated nomenclature of the same symptom and characterized the identical crisis as a recollection of memories. According to the same author, this crisis, if the cure is properly administered, should soon be followed by a massive breakup of anxiety process and the definitive liberation of the area of consciousness, this being the second stage in the process of psychic recovery. Elsewhere, employing the bold terminology that was his special gift, Duckeye devises the formula disencumbering cogitative diarrhea for this crisis, which is accompanied by intense euphoria, a marked resumption of relational activity, a sudden and striking restoration, among other things, of sleep, which in some cases has been known to go on for days at a time, and lastly, at a more advanced stage, by conspicuous hyperactivity of the genital functions, amounting, sometimes in patients who were previously frigid, to a positive sexual frenzy. The patient recovers not by easy stages, but at a gallop. Such was the magnificently descriptive metaphor by which another of our great French psychiatrists of the last century, Philibert Martin, 35, characterized this recuperative triumph, this sudden resurgence of normal functions in the patient recovering from the fear syndrome. As for you, Bardamu, I already, at the present moment, regard you as a true convalescent. Would it interest you, Bardamu, since we have arrived at this gratifying conclusion, to know that I shall be reading a paper on the fundamental characteristics of the human mind at the Society for Military Psychology tomorrow? It is not without its merits, I venture to believe. Oh yes, Professor, I take a passionate interest in these questions. 45. Well then, Bardamu, to make a long story short, the thesis I put forward is that before the war man was an unknown quantity for the psychiatrist and the resources of his psyche an enigma. That is also my humble opinion, Professor. You see, Bardamu, the war, by providing us with such unprecedented means of trying men's nervous systems, has been a miraculous revealer of the human mind. Recent pathological disclosures have given us matter for centuries of meditation and study. Let's face it. Up until now, we hardly suspected the richness of man's emotional and spiritual resources. Today, thanks to the war, all that has changed. By a process of breaking and entering, painful to be sure, but decisive, nay providential for science, we have penetrated his innermost depths. Ever since the first revelations came to my attention, the duty of the modern psychologist and moralist has been clear to me, Bestons, beyond any possible doubt. Our psychological conceptions are in need of total revision. I, Bardamu, was of exactly the same opinion. Yes, indeed, Professor, I am convinced that. Ah, you think so too, Bardamu. You say so yourself. In man, you see, there is a balance between good and evil, between egoism on the one hand and altruism on the other. In elite subjects, more altruism than egoism. Am I right? Don't you agree? Exactly, Professor, you've hit the nail on the head. And what, Bardamu, I ask you, what is the highest known concept, the concept best suited to arousing the altruism of the elite subject and compelling it to manifest itself unequivocally? Patriotism, Professor. Ah, you see? The word is yours, not mine. You understand, Bardamu. Patriotism and glory, which is its corollary and proof. How true. Ah. Our soldier boys. At their first baptism of fire, they spontaneously cast off all sophisms and subsidiary concepts, in particular the sophism of self-preservation. Instinctively and immediately they merge with our true raison d'etre, the patrie. For the attainment of truth, Bardamu, intelligence is not only superfluous, it is in the way. Like all essential truths, the patrie is a truth of the heart. The common people understand that. And that is where the inept scientist goes wrong. It's beautiful, Professor. Too beautiful. I am reminded of the ancients. Bestons pressed both my hands almost affectionately, and in a fatherly tone he added, for my special benefit, that, Bardamu, is how I mean to treat my patients, electricity for the body, and for the mind massive doses of patriotic ethics, injections as it were of invigorating morality. I understand, Professor. I was indeed beginning to understand more and more. On leaving him I joined my invigorated companions at Mass in the brand new chapel. I caught sight of Grandladar in the corner, demonstrating his moral vigor by giving the concierge's little girl lessons in enthusiasm. He beckoned me to join him, and I did. That afternoon some of our parents came from Paris for the first time since we'd been there, and from then on they came every week. I had finally written to my mother. She was glad to see me again and whimpered like a bitch whose puppy has been given back to her. She thought she was doing me a lot of good by kissing me, but she was miles behind the bitch, because she believed what they said when they took me away from her. A dog only believes what it can smell. One afternoon my mother and I took a long walk through the streets around the 46 hospital, dawdling down half-finished byways, with lampposts that hadn't been painted yet, between long, oozing house fronts with their windows full of gaudy dangling rags, the shirts of the poor. We listened to the crackling song of the frying pans, a tempest's rancid hat. In the great shapeless desert surrounding the city, the rut in which its false luxury ends, the city shows everyone who wants to look the garbage piles of its enormous posterior. There are factories one avoids when out for a stroll, which emit smells of all sorts, some of them hardly believable. The air roundabout couldn't possibly stink any worse. Nearby a little street carnival molders between two chimneys of unequal height. The wooden horses cost too much for the rickety dribbling children with nosefuls of fingers, who long for them and stand spellbound, sometimes for weeks on end, attracted and repelled by their forlorn rundown look and the music. What efforts are made to keep the truth away from these places, but it comes back again and again, to grief for everybody. Drinking is no help, red wine as thick as ink, nothing helps, the sky in those places never changes, it's a vast lake of suburban smoke, shutting them in. Underfoot the mud drags you down with fatigue, and the sides of existence are also closed, shut off by hotels and more factories. Even the walls in that section are coffins. With Lola gone for good and Hussein too, I had nobody left. That's why I finally wrote to my mother, just to see somebody. I was only 20, and all I had was a past. The two of us together, my mother and I, walked through dozens of Sunday streets. She told me little things about her business, what the people around her were saying about the war, that it was sad, horrible in fact, but that with plenty of courage we'd all come through in the end. The ones that got killed were an accident, like in the races. If you kept your seat properly you wouldn't fall. To her the war was just one more affliction. She tried not to think about it too much, because it frightened her in a way. It was full of terrifying things she didn't understand. She had no doubt that poor people like her were born to suffer in every way, that was their role on earth, and that if things had been going so badly of late, the cumulative faults of the poor must have a good deal to do with it. They must have been very naughty, of course they hadn't meant to be, but they were guilty all the same, and giving them a chance to expiate their transgressions by suffering was a great kindness. My mother was an untouchable. That resigned, tragic optimism was her only faith and the foundation of her character. The two of us, in the rain, went down streets of vacant lots. The sidewalks in that part of the world sink and invade your step. In winter the branches of the little ash trees at the edge hold the raindrops a long time, a tenuous fairyland trembling in the breeze. Our way back to the hospital led past a number of newly built hotels. Some had names, others hadn't even gone to that much trouble. Rooms by the week was all they had to say for themselves. The war had suddenly emptied them of all the workers and wage slaves who had lived there. They wouldn't even come back to die. Dying is work, too, but they do it somewhere else. My mother was tearful as she took me back to the hospital. She accepted the accident of my death, and not content to acquiesce, she wondered if I was as resigned to it as she was. She believed in fate as implicitly as she did in the beautiful standard meter of the Conservatoire des Arts Signataires, but she had always spoken of with respect, because she had learned in her youth that the one she used in her notions shop was a scrupulous copy of that superb official original. Between the housing lots and the degraded countryside there were still a few fields and gardens here and there and, attached to those scraps of land, a few aged peasants wedged in between the new buildings. When there was time left before I had to be back, my mother and I went to watch them, those comical peasants obstinately poking iron into the earth, that soft grainy substance, where the dead are laid to rot but which gives us our bread all the same. The ground must be terribly hard, my mother said every time she saw them. She was puzzled. You see, she only understood miseries that resembled her own, city miseries, and she tried to figure out what the country kind could be like. That was the only curiosity I ever saw in my mother. It was all the diversion she needed for a Sunday, and she took it back to the city with 47. Her. I never heard from Lola, or from Lucine either. Those sluts were on the good side of the situation, from which we, the flesh earmarked for sacrifice, were barred by smiling but implacable orders. Twice I'd been sent back to the places where the hostages were corralled. My future was all settled. As I've told you, Ranlador, my neighbor at the hospital, enjoyed permanent popularity with the nurses. He was swathed in bandages and dripping with optimism. All the other patients envied him and copied his manner. Once we become presentable and ceased to be moral levers, we all began to get visits from socialites and political bigwigs. People started telling each other in the drawing rooms that Professor Beston's Neuromedical Center had become a temple and home, as it were, of the most intense patriotic fervor. Our visiting days came to be patronized not only by bishops, but also by an Italian duchess, a big munitions magnate, and before long by the personnel of the opera and comedy franchise. A beautiful young actress from the comedy, who recited poetry like nobody's business, came to my personal bedside and declaimed some superlatively heroic lines for my special benefit. As she spoke, her perverse red hair, she had the complexion that went with it, was tossed by extraordinary waves that sent vibrations straight to my perineum. When this divine creature questioned me about my feats of arms, I gave her so many poignant details that she began to devour me with her eyes. Deeply moved, she asked leave to have the most intense passages in my narrative framed in verse by a poet who happened to be one of her admirers. I consented without hesitation. Informed of this project, Professor Bestons expressed his special approval. He even granted an interview on this subject to an illustrated National Weekly, whose photographer took our picture all together on the hospital steps with the beautiful actress beside us. In these tragic days, cried Professor Bestons, who never missed a trick, it is the poet's highest duty to revive our taste for the epic. This is no time for trivial artifice. Down with emasculated literature. A new soul has been born to us in the great and noble tumult of battle. The great patriotic renewal. The lofty summits to which our glory is destined. We demand the sustaining grandeur of the epic. For my part, I find it admirable that this sublime, creative, and never to be forgotten collaboration between a poet and one of our heroes should have taken place under our very eyes in this hospital which I direct. Ranlador, my roommate, whose imagination had been rather outdistanced by mine and who didn't figure in the photograph, was seized with a keen, tenacious jealousy. He became my embittered rival for the palms of heroism. He made up new stories, he surpassed himself, no one could stop him, his exploits verged on delirium. It was difficult for me to get the jump on him, to improve on his extravagances, yet none of us at the hospital resigned himself to defeat. In a fever of emulation we all vied with one another in composing brilliant pages of military history in which to figure sublimely. In those heroic romances we wore the skins of phantasmagoric characters, but deep within them our ludicrous selves trembled body and soul. I'd like to have seen people's faces if they had found out what we were really like. The war has been going on too long. Our great friend Bestons received the visits of innumerable foreign celebrities, neutrals, skeptics, and scientists of all persuasions. Spruce, the sabered inspectors from the War Ministry passed through awards. Their military careers had been extended, they had been rejuvenated and revitalized with pay increases. So naturally they were generous with praise and citations. Everything was perfect. Bestons and his wounded heroes were the pride of the medical profession. My fair admirer from the Condi came back and paid me a private visit, while her pet poet was completing the rhyme narrative of my exploits. One day I finally ran into this pale, anxious young man in one of the corridors. The doctors, he told me, had assured him that the fragility of his heartstrings was 48. Well, nigh miraculous. Consequently, these same doctors, always concerned with the protection of the frail, had kept him out of the army. To make up for which our young bard had undertaken, at the risk of his health and last spiritual energies, to forge the moral cannon of our victory. A magnificent and it goes without saying forgettable weapon. Practically everything was unforgettable in those days. I wasn't going to complain, since he had picked me from among so many undeniably brave men as his hero. And, I have to admit, they honored me royally. It was magnificent. The recitation was given at the Comte Franchise itself, as part of a so-called poetic afternoon. The whole hospital was invited. When my vibrant redhead appeared on the stage, striding grandly, her figure draped in the for once voluptuous folds of the tricolor, the whole audience, flushed with desire, rose to its feet and gave her one of those ovations that never seemed to end. Naturally I had known what to expect, but my amazement was real all the same. I could not conceal my stupefaction from my neighbors at hearing her, my magnificent friend, thrill and throb and sigh in such a way as to make the dramatic effect of the episode I had dreamed up for her more vivid and more moving. Her poet was miles beyond me for fantasy. He had monstrously magnified mine, enhanced it with flamboyant rhymes and high-sounding adjectives, which fell with a solemn reverberation on the breathless, admiring silence. Coming to the climax of a period, the most impassioned of the lot, the actress turned toward the box where Ranlador and I and a few other wounded men were sitting, and held out her two magnificent arms as though offering herself to the most heroic among us. At that particular moment the poet was faithfully rendering a deed of awe-inspiring bravery that I had attributed to myself. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I'm sure it was something pretty good. Luckily, when it comes to heroism, people are willing to believe anything. The audience caught the meaning of her symbolic offering, turned in our direction, ecstatic, stamping, bellowing with joy, and clamored for the hero. Ranlador took up the whole front row of the box and blotted out the rest of us. He hid us almost completely with his bandages. He did it on purpose, the bastard. But two of our comrades climbed up on chairs behind him so the crowd could admire them over his head and shoulders. They brought the house down. I came close to crying out, but it's all about me. Me and nobody else. I knew my Gramador. We'd have exchanged insults in front of all those people. We might even have used our fists. So in the end he was the winner. He triumphed. Just as he planned, he had the whole storm of applause to himself. Defeated, we took refuge backstage, where fortunately we were faded again. T had was some comfort. But our actress and inspiration wasn't alone in her dressing room. The poet, her poet, our poet was with her. He had the same weakness for young soldier boys as she did. They made it clear to me very artistically. A handsome offer. They repeated it, but I ignored their kind suggestions. I was the loser, because they had influence and things might have worked out very well. I left them abruptly. I was nettled. Silly of me, I was young. To recapitulate, the aviators had snatched Lola away from me, the Argentines had taken Hussein, and now this harmonious invert had filched my magnificent actress. Sadly I left the comedy as the last torches were being extinguished in the quarters and returned alone, without recourse to the streetcar, to our hospital, that man-trap locked down in the tenacious mud of the rebellious suburbs. The plain truth, I may as well admit it, is that I've never been really right in the head. But just then such fits of dizziness would come over me for no reason at all that I could easily have been run over. The war had given me the staggers. When it came to pocket money, all I could count on during my stay at the hospital was the few francs my mother managed to scrape up for me each week. So as soon as I could I went looking for little extras here and there, wherever I could find them. One of my old bosses looked like a likely prospect, and I went right over to see him. I remembered opportunely that in a certain obscure period of my life shortly before the war I had worked 49. As a helper for this Roger Puta 36 who owned a jewelry shop near the Madeleine. My work for that loathsome jeweler consisted of menial jobs, such as polishing the silverware in the shop. There was lots of it, every shape and size, and it was hard to take care of in the gift-giving holiday season because it was always being handled. As soon as my classes were out at medical school where I was engaged in exacting and because I kept flunking the exams interminable studies, I hightailed it to the back room of Monsieur Puta's shop, where I labored for 2 or 3 hours, until dinner time, applying Whitington's chocolate. In return for my work, I was fed, copiously I have to admit, in the kitchen. Then in the morning before school, I had to take the watchdogs out for a piss. All that for 40 francs a month. Puta's jewelry shop on the corner of the Rue Vignon sparkled with thousands of diamonds, each one of which cost say el decades of my salary. They're still sparkling in the exact same place, by the way. When everybody was mobilized, this Puta got himself assigned to the auxiliaries and put under the special orders of a certain cabinet minister, whose car he drove from time to time. But he also made himself useful, unofficially of course, by supplying the ministry with jewels. The higher officials speculated, with gratifying results, on present and future transactions, and the longer the war went on, the more jewels were needed. Monsieur Puta got so many orders that he sometimes had trouble filling them. When he was overworked, Monsieur Puta managed to look slightly intelligent because of the fatigue that tormented him, but only then. When rested, his face, in spite of his undeniably fine features, became so harmonious in its idiotic felicity that it would be hard not to carry a despairing memory of it with one to the grave. His wife, Madame Puta, seldom left the cashier's desk. In a manner of speaking, she and the desk were one. She had been brought up to be a jeweler's wife. That had been her parents' ambition. She knew her duty inside and out. The prosperity of the cash drawer brought happiness to husband and wife. Not that Madame Puta was bad looking, not at all. She could even, like so many others, have been rather pretty, but she was so careful, so distrustful that she stopped short of beauty just as she stopped short of life. Her hair was a little too well dressed, her smile a little too facile and sudden, and her gestures a bit too abrupt or too furtive. You racked your brains trying to figure out what was too calculated about her and why. You always felt uneasy when she came near you. This instinctive revulsion that shopkeepers inspire in anyone who goes near them and who knows what's what is one of the few consolations for being as down at heel as people who don't sell anything to anybody tend to be. The petty cares of business were everything to Madame Puta. In this she resembled Madame Herote, but with a difference. In her case, they possessed her body and soul, just as God possesses his nuns. And yet from time to time, she would give a thought to the world around her. For instance, she might indulge in some little expression of sympathy for parents with sons at the front. How dreadful this war must be for people with grown-up children. Think before you shoot your mouth off. Her husband responded without delay. Such mawkishness found him ready and resolute. I suppose there's no need of defending France? Good as gold, but first and foremost good patriots, stoics in short. They went to sleep every night of the war directly above their shop with its millions, a French fortune. In the brothels that he visited now and then, Monsieur Puta, though demanding, refused to be taken for a spendthrift. He'd set them straight at the outset. I'm no Englishman, dearie, and I know the score. I'm just a little French soldier, and I'm not in a hurry. That was his opening statement. The girls respected him for his well-regulated way of taking his pleasure. He liked to enjoy himself, but couldn't be taken in, a real man. He knew human nature and took advantage of his knowledge to sell a few jewels to the assistant Madame, 50, who had no faith in stocks and bonds. As for his military career, Monsieur Puta was making impressive progress, from temporary discharges to permanent deferments. After God knows how many providential medical examinations, he was finally exempted for good. One of the highest joys of his existence was to contemplate and if possible to handle a shapely thigh. In this one pleasure at least he got the better of his wife, who took no interest in anything but business. Take a man and woman with otherwise equal qualities, you always seem to find a little more uneasiness in a man, however stagnant and narrow-minded. This Puta had just a dash of the artist in him. Lots of men are like that, their artistic leanings never go beyond a weakness for shapely thighs. Madame Puta was glad she had no children. She voiced her pleasure in being sterile so often that one day Monsieur Puta spoke of their satisfaction to the assistant Madame. Yes, said the assistant Madame. But after all somebody's children have to go, it's a duty. That was true, the war involved duties. The cabinet minister whose car Puta drove had no children either. Cabinet ministers never have children. Around 1913, at the same time as me, there was another helper doing menial jobs in the shop. His name was Jean Boyroos. 37. At night he was some kind of super in the little theaters, and in the afternoon he delivered parcels for Puda. The pay was small, but he didn't mind. He managed to make ends meet thanks to the metro. He delivered his parcels on foot almost as quickly as if he'd taken the metro, and kept the price of the ticket. All velvet. True, his feet smelled a little, quite a lot in fact, but he knew it and asked me to let him know when there were no customers in the shop so he could safely go in and settle his accounts with Madame Puda. As soon as she had the money, she'd send him out to the back room with me. During the war again his feet stood him in good stead. He was reputed to be the fastest courier in his regiment. While on convalescent leave, he came to see me at the Bickery Fort. In fact it was then we decided to get in touch with our old boss. We didn't let the grass grow under our feet. When we got to the Boulevard de la Madeleine they had just finished dressing the shop window. Well, who'd have expected? Monsieur Puda was rather surprised to see us. But I'm glad to see you all the same. Come right in. You're looking well, Boyroos. Fine and dandy. But you, Arnamu, you look sick, my boy. Oh well, you're young. You'll recover. You youngsters are in luck when all's said and done. Great days, great experience for you. Up there. And out in the open too. This is history, my boys. Make no mistake. And what history? We didn't answer, we thought we'd let Monsieur Puda go on a while before touching him. And on he went. It's rough in the trenches, I won't deny that. But it's no bed of roses here either, you know. You boys have been wounded? Alright, but I'm absolutely bushed. For 2 years now I've been on night duty. Do you know what that means? Exhausted. Worn to a frazzle. Oh my god. The streets of Paris at night. No lights. Driving a car, as often as not with a minister in it. In a hurry. You simply can't imagine. I could get killed a dozen times every night. Oh yes, Madame Puda put in, and sometimes he drives the minister's wife too. Oh yes, and it's not over yet. Dreadful. We said in unison. What about the dogs? Voyeurs asked to be polite. What's become of them? Does somebody still take them out in the Tuileries? I've had them put away. They were bad for business. German shepherds. The customers, you see. A pity. Said his wife. But the new dogs we have now are very nice, they're Scotch. They smell a little. 51. Not like our German shepherds, do you remember, Voyeurs? They hardly smelled at all. We could shut them up in the shop even after the rain. That's right. Said Monsieur Puda. Not like old Voyeurs here with his feet. Do your feet still smell, Jean? You young scamp. They still smell a little, I think, said Voyeurs. At that moment some customers came in. I won't keep you any longer, my boys, said Monsieur Puda, intent on getting Jean out of the shop as quickly as possible. Keep well, that's the main thing. I won't ask you where you come from. Certainly not. Security first is my motto. At the word security Puda made a very serious face, like when giving back change. So that was the end of our visit. As we were leaving, Madame Puda gave us each 20 francs. The shop was polished as spick and span as a yacht. We were afraid to walk through because of our boots, which looked monstrous on the fine carpet. Oh, Roger. Look at them. Madame Puda cried out. Aren't they comical? They're not in the habit anymore. They walk as if they'd stepped in something. The habit will come back. Said Monsieur Puda amiably, glad to be rid of us so quickly and cheaply. Out in the street we realized we wouldn't go far with our 20 francs each, but Voyeurs had another idea. Come on, he says, we'll go and see a lady I know, her son was a buddy of mine, killed on the Marne. I go and see his parents every week and tell them how their son was killed. They're rich. The mother gives me 100 francs or so every time. They say it makes them happy. So, but what'll I do? What'll I say to this lady? Well, you'll tell her that you were there too. She'll give you another 100 francs. They're the right kind of rich. Take it from me. Not like that stinking Puda. They don't count their pennies. All right, I said. But are you sure she won't ask me for details? Because I didn't know her son, see? I'll be flummoxed if she asks for. No. Don't worry. Say the same as me. Just nod your head and say yes. Nothing to worry about. The woman is broken-hearted, so if someone comes and talks about her son it makes her happy. That's all she wants. Anything at all. It's easy. I wasn't very enthusiastic, but I badly wanted the 100 francs, which struck me as providential and unusually easy to come by. All right, I said finally. But don't expect me to make anything up, I'm warning you. Promise? I'll say the same as you, not a word more. How did he get killed anyway? A shell hit him smack in the face, a pretty big one. At Garnes the place was called, on the Meuse front, on the bank of some river. Boy, they didn't find this much of him. Absolutely nothing left. A memory. And you know, he was a big man, strong and husky and athletic, but what would you expect? Nobody can stand up against a shell. That's a fact. Wiped off the face of the earth. His mother still finds it hard to believe. I've told her over and over again. She insists that he's just missing. Crazy idea. Missing. It's not her fault, she never saw a 52. Shell, she doesn't see how a man can vanish into thin air like a fart, and that it's all over, especially when the man is her son. It's only natural. By the way, I haven't been to see her for 2 weeks. But you'll see how it is when I go in. The mother receives me right away in the drawing room. It's a beautiful house. You'll see. So many curtains and carpets and mirrors you'd think you were in a theater. 100 francs is nothing to them, they'll hardly miss it. About like 5 francs to me. Today she'll be good for 200 because she hasn't seen me for 2 weeks. You'll see, the servants with gilded buttons. At the Avenue Henry Martin we turned left and went on a little way, then we came to a gate surrounded by trees and a little private road. See? Said Boyrus, when we were standing in front of it, it's practically a chateau. What did I tell you? The father's supposed to be high up in the railroads. A big shot. You sure he's not a station master? I said, making a joke. Don't be stupid. There he is now. He's coming to meet us. But the old man didn't come out right away. He was walking around the lawn, stooped over, talking to a soldier. We went nearer. I recognized the soldier. It was the reservist I had met that night at Noirts-sur-Loise, when I was on reconnaissance. I even remembered the name he'd given me, Robinson. Do you know that Foots Lager? Boyrus asked me. Yes, I know him. Maybe he's a friend of theirs. They must be talking about the mother. I hope they don't prevent us from going to see her. Because she's the one mostly that forks over the money. The old gentleman came over to us. My dear friend, he said to Boyrus in a quavering voice. It grieves me to tell you that since your last visit my poor wife has succumbed to our great sorrow. Last Thursday we left her alone for a moment, she had asked us to. She was in tears. He couldn't finish his sentence. Suddenly he turned away and left us. I know you, I said to Robinson, as soon as the old gentleman was far enough away. And I know you. What happened to the old lady? I asked him. Well, he informed us, she hanged herself the day before yesterday, that's all. He added, of all the lousy luck. She was my army godmother. Such things only happen to me. A calamity. My first leave. For 6 months I'd been looking forward to this day. Boyrus and I couldn't help laughing at Robinson's discomfiture. A nasty surprise if there ever was one, but her being dead didn't give us our 200 smackers, and we'd made up a new story special for the occasion. So none of us was very happy. You and your big mealy mouth. We were ragging Robinson, trying to get a rise out of him. You thought you had a good thing, didn't you? A sweet little feed with the old folks? Or maybe you thought you'd screw your fairy godmother? Serves you goddamn right. We couldn't stay there all day looking at the grass and laughing, so we all three together started off in the direction of Grinnell. We all counted our money, it didn't come to much. Seeing we had to get back to our 53 respective hospitals and barracks that same evening, there was just enough for dinner at a bistro, and maybe there'd be a little something left over, but not enough to go upstairs at the cat house. We went in anyway, but we only had a drink at the bar. Say, said Robinson, it's good to see you again. But what do you think of that kid's mother? The bitch, hanging herself just when I'm due to arrive. I won't forget her in a hurry. Do you see me hanging myself? Unhappy, you say? I hang myself every day. What about you? Rich people are more sensitive, said Boyrus. Boyrus had a good heart. If I had 6 francs, he went on, I'd go upstairs with the brunette over there by the slot machine. Go ahead, we told him, you'll tell us if she knows how to suck. We rummaged in our pockets, but counting the tip there wasn't enough to give him his piece. Just enough for another coffee each and a cassis. When we'd finished, we went out and roamed around some more. We broke up on the Place d'Entrée and went our separate ways. Saying goodbye, we couldn't see one another, and we spoke softly because of the echoes. No light, it wasn't allowed. I never saw Boyrus again. I've often run into Robinson. As for Jean Boyrus, it was the gas that got him on the Somme. He died 2 years later by the sea, in Brittany, in a Navy sanatorium. He wrote to me twice when he first got there, but no more after that. He'd never seen the ocean. You can't imagine how beautiful it is, he wrote me. I bathe a little, it's good for my feet, but I think my voice is gone for good. That made him unhappy, because his big ambition was to get into a theater course someday. The course is better paid and more artistic than being an ordinary super. The army finally dropped me, I'd saved my guts, but my brains were scrambled for good. Undeniably. Beat it. They said. You're no good for anything anymore. To Africa. I said to myself. The further the better. The ship that took me on board was a ship like any other, Consolidated Corsairs. That was the line. It was bound for the tropics with a cargo of cotton goods, officers, and civil servants. That boat was so old that the copper plate with its birth date had been removed from the upper deck. The date was such ancient history it had inspired the passengers with fear and witticisms. So they shoved me on board in the hope that I'd recuperate in the colonies. My well-wishers were dead set on my making my fortune. Personally, I just wanted to get away, but a man should always try to look useful if he's not rich. It didn't look as if my studies would ever end, and I couldn't go on forever. I didn't have enough money to go to America. So Africa it is, I said, and let myself be steered to the tropics where, I was told, you were sure to get ahead fast, provided you behaved and were reasonably temperate. Those prognostics gave me food for thought. There wasn't much to be said for me, but my manners were all right, and I was self-effacing. Deference came easy to me, I lived in constant fear of not being on time, but took good care never to get ahead of anybody. In short, I had delicacy. After all, if you manage to escape alive from an international slaughterhouse run rampant, it's a sign of tact and discretion. But let's get back to our trip. It looked fairly promising as long as we were in European waters. In small, adenoidal, mutually suspicious groups, the passengers lolled and lounged in the shade between decks, in the toilets and in the smoking room. From morning to night they steeped themselves in picket and gossip. They belched, they dozed, they shouted, and never expressed the least regret for anything they had left behind in Europe. 54. Our ship's name was the Admiral Brampton. 38. If it kept afloat on those tepid seas, it was only thanks to its paint. Any number of coats laid on, layer after layer, had given the Admiral Brampton a kind of second hull, something like an onion. We were heading for Africa, the real, grandiose Africa of impenetrable forests, fetid swamps, inviolate wildernesses, where black iron swallowed and slowed and cruelly on the banks of never-ending rivers. I would barter a pack of billet 39, razor blades for big long elephants' tusks, gaudy-colored birds, and juvenile slaves. Guaranteed. That would be life. Nothing in common with the emasculated Africa of travel agencies and monuments, of railways and candy bars. Certainly not. We'd be seeing Africa in the raw, the real Africa. We the boozing passengers of the Admiral Brampton. But as soon as we passed the coast of Portugal, things started going bad. One morning we woke up in the midst of a steam bath, pervasive and alarming. The water in our glasses, the sea, the air, our sheets, our sweat, everything was hot, sultry. From then on, by night and day, it was impossible to have anything cool in your hands, under your ass, or in your throat, except the ice from the bar and your whiskey. A dull despair descended on the passengers of the Admiral Brampton, condemned to sitting permanently in the bar, held fast by little pieces of ice, exchanging threats and incoherent apologies after their card games. It didn't take long. In that despondent changeless heat the entire human content of the ship congealed into massive drunkenness. People moved flabbily about like squid in a tank of tepid smelly water. From that moment on we saw, rising to the surface, the terrifying nature of white men, exasperated, freed from constraint, absolutely unbuttoned, their true nature, same as in the war. That tropical steam bath called forth instincts as August breeds toads and snakes on the fissured walls of prisons. In the European cold, under grey, puritanical northern skies, we seldom get to see our brothers festering cruelty except in times of carnage, but when roused by the foul fevers of the tropics, their ruddenness rises to the surface. That's when the frantic unbuttoning sets in, when filth triumphs and covers us entirely. It's a biological confession. Once work and cold weather cease to constrain us, once they relax their grip, the white man shows you the same spectacle as a beautiful beach when the tide goes out, the truth, dead pools, crabs, carrion, and turds. Once we had passed Portugal, everybody on board started unleashing his instincts, ferociously. Alcohol helped and so did the blissful feeling conferred, especially on soldiers and civil servants, by the knowledge that the trip was absolutely free of charge. The knowledge that for 4 consecutive weeks their bed, board, and liquor won't cost a thing is in itself enough to make most people delirious with thrift. Consequently, when it became known that, alone of all the ship's passengers, I had paid my own fare, I was looked upon as a shameless and intolerable swine. If on leaving Marseille I had had some experience of colonial society, I would have gone down on my knees and begged the pardon and indulgence of the colonial infantry officer I kept running INTO, the highest in rank of those on board, for my unworthiness, and perhaps, for safety's sake, I'd also have humbled myself before the senior civil servant. Then those phantasmagorical passengers might have tolerated my presence in their midst and nothing would have happened. But I was ignorant, and my foolhardiness in supposing that I was entitled to breathe the same air as they almost cost me my life. One can never be too anxious. Thanks to a certain ingenuity, I lost nothing but what self-respect I had left. This is what happened. Sometime after the Canary Islands, I learned from one of the stewards that my fellow passengers, by common accord, thought me affected, not to say insolent. That they suspected me of being a pimp and a pederast, something of a cocaine addict on the side but only on the side. Then the suspicion made its way around that I must have left France to escape the consequences of certain heinous crimes. But I was only at the beginning of my troubles. At that point I learned that on this line it was customary to view paying passengers with extreme caution, accompanied by persecution. I'm speaking of those who were not traveling free, either on military transportation orders or on the basis of some bureaucratic arrangement, for as everyone knows, the colonies belong to the upper reaches of the administration. 55. After all, there are few plausible reasons for an unknown civilian to venture into those parts. A spy, a suspicious character. They found 1,000 reasons for giving me sinister looks, the officers straight in the eye, the ladies with a knowing smile. After a while, even the deckhands and stewards, encouraged by the passengers, took to exchanging heavily caustic remarks behind my back. In the end no one doubted that I was the biggest and most intolerable, in fact the only out-and-out blackguard on board. A promising outlook. My neighbors at table were 4 toothless and bilious postal officials from Gabon. They had been friendly to me, chummy in fact at the start of the voyage. Now they never said a word to me. They had tacitly agreed that I was a man to be watched. I seldom left my cabin, and then only with infinite precautions. The air was so hot it weighed on our skins like a solid. Behind my bolted door I lay naked, trying to imagine what plan those diabolical passengers had cooked up to destroy me. I didn't know anyone on board, yet they all seemed to know me. An exact description of me must have taken instant form in their minds, like that of a famous criminal published in the newspapers. Through no fault of mine, I had been cast in the indispensable role of the foul and loathsome villain, shame of the human race, whose presence has been recorded down through the centuries, who is as well known to everyone as God and the devil, but who during his passage on this earth is so polymorphous and evasive as to elude everyone's grasp. For this villain to be at last isolated, identified, and cornered, exceptional circumstances had been needed, such as were to be met with only in the narrow confines of the ship. A great moral carnival was in the offing aboard the Admiral Brampton. The unclean beast would not escape his fate. That was me. This in itself made the trip worthwhile. Isolated among these spontaneous enemies, I labored to identify them without their noticing. Especially in the morning, I was able to watch them with impunity through the porthole of my cabin. Before breakfast, covered with hair from pubis to eyebrows and from their rectums to the soles of their feet, they would emerge to take the air in pajamas that were transparent in the sunlight. or glass in hand, stalled against the rail, they would belch and retch, especially the captain with the bulging bloodshot eyes, whose liver started plaguing him at daybreak. Regularly at dawn he would ask his cronies about me, curious to know if I hadn't been tossed overboard yet, like a gob of spit. And he'd illustrate his remark by projecting a turgid oyster into the frothing sea. Boy oh boy. The Admiral wasn't getting ahead very fast, just groaning along from roll to roll. It was more like a sickness than a voyage. As I examined the members of the morning council from my portal, they all seemed rather seriously ill, malarial, alcoholic, syphilitic in all likelihood. At a distance of 30 feet, their visible decay was some consolation for my own troubles. These big mouths, after all, were just as defeated as I was. Still bragging, nothing more. That was the only difference. The mosquitoes had worked them over, sucking their blood and pumping their veins full of poisons that would never go away. Treponemas were filing away their arteries. Alcohol was corroding their livers. The sun was cracking their kidneys. Brad lice were clinging to their pubic hair and eczema to the skin of their bellies. The searing light would scorch their retinas. In not so long a time what would be left of them? A bit of brain. To do what with, I asked you. Where they were going. To commit suicide? Where they were going a brain wouldn't do them a bit of good. No two ways. It's no joke growing old in a place where there's nothing to do but look at yourself in a mirror with verdigris for silvering, and see yourself getting seedier and seedier, more and more decrepit. What sets in quickly in the green mansions, especially when it's atrociously hot. The north at least preserves your flesh. Northerners are pale once and for all. Between a dead Swede and a young man who has had a bad night there's not much to choose. But the day after a colonial lands, he's already full of maggots. Those infinitely laborious little worms have been waiting for him personally, and 56. They'll stay with him a lot longer than life will. He's a bag of worms, that's all. We had another week at sea before putting into Pragamans, the first of the promised lands. I felt as if I were living in a case of dynamite. I had just about given up eating for fear of sitting down at their table or crossing the deck in the daytime. I'd stopped talking altogether. I was never seen taking the air. It would have been hard to be as little in evidence on that ship as I was and yet stay on board. My cabin steward, a family man, was kind enough to inform me that those dashing colonial officers had lifted their glasses and sworn a solemn oath to slap my face at the first opportunity and then chuck me overboard. When I asked him why, he didn't know and asked me in turn what I had done to warrant so much hard feeling. We were left with our perplexity. It was unlikely to be cleared up. They didn't like my face, that's all. You won't catch me taking another trip with people so hard to please. In addition, they had so much time on their hands, sequestered with themselves for 30 whole days, that it didn't take much to stir them up. And besides, when you stop to think about it, at least 100 people must want you dead in the course of an average day. The ones in line behind you at the ticket window in the metro, the ones who look up at your apartment when they haven't got one themselves, the ones who wish you'd finish pissing and give them a chance, your children and a lot more. It happens all the time, and you get used to it. On a boat the same impatience is more noticeable, which makes it more upsetting. In that bubbling cauldron, the suint of those scalded beings is concentrated, the presentiment of the vast colonial solitude that will soon bury them in their destinies and make them groan like the dying. They cling, they bite, they rend, they froth at the mouth. My importance on the ship increased prodigiously from day to day. My rare appearances at table, silent and stealthy as I tried to make them, took on the magnitude of significant events. The moment I entered the dining room, the 120 passengers gave a start and began to whisper. Advancing from malignant suppositions to slanderous conclusions, the colonial officers at the captain's table, fortified with operative after operative, the tax collectors, and especially the lady school teachers on their way back to the Congo. Of these there was quite an assortment on board the Admiral Branton puffed me up to infernal proportions. On boarding the ship in Marseille, I had been nothing, just a dreamy sort of nobody, but now, thanks to the concentrated attention of all those alcoholics and frustrated vaginas, I found myself changed beyond recognition, endowed with alarming prestige. The captain of the ship, a shady, breezy, racketeering type, had gone out of his way to shake hands with me at the start. When he crossed my path now, he didn't even seem to know me. It was as if I'd been wanted for some sordid crime, guilty from the start. Guilty of what? When men can hate without risk, their stupidity is easily convinced, the motives supply themselves. From what I seemed to discern of the compact malevolence that held me in its vice, the female section of the conspiracy was masterminded by one of the school teachers. She was going back to the Congo to DE, or so at least I hoped, a bitch. Almost always she was trailing around after the officers, so handsome in their resplendent tight-fitting tunics and further embellished by the oath they had sworn to crush me like a noisome slug well before the next port of call. They wondered out loud whether I would be as repulsive flattened out as I was erect. In short, they were having a fine time. The school teacher wetted their fury, called down thunders on the deck of the Admiral Branton, resolved to know no rest until I had been picked up gasping, punished forever for my imaginary impertinence, chastised for daring to exist, brutally beaten, bruised and bleeding, imploring pity under the boot and fist of one of those heroes, whose muscular prowess and spectacular rage she was burning to admire. A scene of high carnage, from which her 57 weary ovaries promised themselves an awakening. As good as being raped by a gorilla. Time was passing, and it's dangerous to keep the aficionados waiting too long. I was the goal. The whole ship was clamoring, quivering from port to starboard. The sea enclosed us in that boiler-plated circus. Even the engine room crew knew what was going on. And since we only had 3 days ahead of us before putting into port, 3 decisive days, several matadors volunteered. The more I avoided the showdown, the more aggressive, the more impending they became. The executioners began to rehearse. They cornered me between 2 cabins, at a bend in the corridor. I escaped by the skin of my teeth, but going to the toilet was getting downright dangerous. With only 3 days to go, I decided to forgo the needs of nature. The portholes were all I needed. Crushing hatred and boredom were all around me. It can't be denied, the boredom on ships is something unbelievable. To tell the truth, it's cosmic. It fills the sea, the ship, the heavens. It's enough to unhinge the soundest of minds, so what would you expect of those chimerical deadheads? A sacrifice. And I was the victim. Things came to a head one evening after dinner, at which, ravaged by hunger, I had put in an appearance. I bent over my plate and didn't budge. I didn't even dare to take out my handkerchief to wipe the sweat off my brow. Nobody had ever eaten his dinner more discreetly. From the engines a faint, continuous vibration rose up under my behind. My table companions must have known what sentence had been passed on me, for to my surprise they started talking to me freely and amiably about duels and stabbings, and asking me questions. Just then the schoolteacher from the Congo, the one whose breath was so strong, appeared in the lounge. I had barely time to notice that she was wearing a sumptuous lace evening dress. With nervous haste she sat down at the piano and played, if you can call it playing, a number of pieces, always skipping the finale. The atmosphere became intensely furtive and strained. I jumped up and ran, hoping to take refuge in my cabin. I had almost reached it when one of the colonial officers, the chessiest and most muscular of the lot, barred my way, without violence but family. Suppose we go up on deck. He enjoined me. We had only a few steps to go. For the occasion he was wearing his gold Bradius cap, and he had buttoned his buttons from collar to fly, something he hadn't done since our departure. So this was to be a full-dress dramatic ceremony. A tight spot for me, my heart was pounding on a level with my belly button. This preamble, this abnormal full dress made me foresee a slow and painful execution. That officer looked to me like a chunk of the war, obstinate, inexorable, murderous, which someone had suddenly plunked down in front of me. Behind him, blocking the doorway, appeared 4 junior officers, vigilant in the extreme, the escort of doom. Flight was impossible. The speech that followed must have been carefully rehearsed. Sir, you have before you Captain Freemas 140, of the Colonial Army. In the name of my comrades in arms and of the passengers on this ship, who are justly indignant at your unspeakable behavior, I have the honor to demand an explanation. Certain remarks you have made about us since we left Marseille are intolerable. If you have any grievances, sir, the time has come to state them out loud. To proclaim audibly what you have been saying in a shameful undertone for the last 21 days. To tell us at last what you think. On hearing these words I was very much relieved. I had feared some sudden death though impossible to parry, but in talking, the major was offering me a way out. Any possibility of cowardice becomes a glowing hope if you're not a fool. That's my opinion. Never be picky and choosy about means of escaping disembowelment, or waste your time trying to find reasons for the persecution you're a victim of. Escape is good enough for the wise. Captain. I replied, putting into my voice all the conviction of which I was capable under the circumstances. What an extraordinary mistake you are in danger of making. You. Me. How can you think 58? Me capable of such ignominious sentiments? How monstrously unjust. Indeed it is more than I can bear. When only yesterday I was fighting for our beloved country. When over the years my blood has mingled with yours in innumerable battles. Oh, Captain, sir, how could you think of crushing me beneath such an injustice? Then, addressing the whole group, what abominable slander has abused you, gentlemen? Leading you to imagine that I, to all intents and purposes your brother, would dream of spreading foul calumnies about heroic officers. This is too much. Really too much. And I went on, oh, for such a thing to happen at the very moment when these heroes, these incomparable heroes, are preparing to resume, with what courage I need not say, their sacred duty of safeguarding our immortal colonial empire. Where the most glorious soldiers of our race have covered themselves with eternal glory. The Mangans. 41, the Fey Derbs. 42, the Gallinas. 43. Oh, Captain. To suspect me. Of this. At that point I pulled up short. I hoped my silence would impress them. Luckily it did for a moment. Thereupon, without delay, taking advantage of the oratorical armistice, I went straight up to the captain and, in an access of emotion, gripped both his hands. With his hands enclosed in mine I felt fairly safe. Still clasping them, I continued, as volubly as ever, and while assuring him that he was right, 1,000 times right, suggested that we make a fresh start, but get our signal straight this time. This unbelievable misunderstanding, I assured him, had been brought about by my stupid though natural timidity. I admitted that my behavior could reasonably have been interpreted as unconscionable disdain by the ladies and gentlemen present, these heroes and charmers. This providential conclave of astounding characters and talents. Not forgetting the incomparably musical ladies, the ornaments of our good ship. After making this profuse and elaborate apology, I implored them to admit me without delay or restriction to their joyous patriotic brotherhood. In which I hoped, now and forever, to cut an admirable figure. And of course without releasing the major's hands, I redoubled my eloquence. As long as a soldier isn't killing, he's a child and easily amused. Since he is not in the habit of tea-drinking, it costs him a crushing effort to understand when spoken to. Captain Freemas wasn't killing me, he wasn't drinking, and he wasn't doing anything with his hands or feet. He was only trying to think. For him that was much too much. In short, I'd caught him by the head. Gradually, during this ordeal by humiliation, I felt my self-respect weakening a little more, seeping away, and finally abandoning me completely, officially as it were. Say what you please, that's a beautiful moment. After that incident I became infinitely light and free, morally speaking of course. Fear is probably, more often than not, the best means of getting you out of a tight spot. Since that day I've never felt the need of any other weapons, or virtues for that matter. The captain couldn't make up his mind, and his friends, who had come there expressly to wipe off my blood and play knuckle bones with my dispersed teeth, had to content themselves with catching words in midair. The civilians who had come rushing, tingling with eagerness at the news of an impending corrida were looking very dangerous. Since I didn't know exactly what I was talking about, but only that I'd better keep it lyrical at all costs, I held onto the captain's hands and stared at an imaginary point in the cottony fog through which the Admiral Brandon was making its way, puffing and spitting from one turn of the propeller to the next. Finally, to wind up my harangue, I ventured to raise one arm above my head, releasing one of the captain's hands, but only one, and flung myself into my peroration. Gentlemen, aren't we all agreed that brave men will always come to an understanding in the end? So damn it all, vive la France. Vive la France. That was Sergeant Granador's gimmick. And once again it worked. That was the only time France ever saved my life, otherwise the opposite has been closer to the truth. I observed a 59 moments hesitation in my audience after all. It's hard for an officer, however ill-disposed, to strike a civilian who has just shouted Vive la France as loud as I had. That hesitation saved me. I reached into the group of officers, grabbed two arms at random, and invited everybody to come to the bar and drink to my health and our reconciliation. The heroes resisted for barely a minute, and then we drank for 2 hours. But the females, silent and increasingly disappointed, kept their eyes on us. Through the portholes of the bar I saw the obstinate schoolteacher pianist prowling like a hyena, surrounded by other females. The bitches had a strong suspicion that I had conned myself out of the trap, and were determined to nab me at the next turn. Meanwhile, men among men, we went on drinking under the useless but stupefying electric fan, which since the Canaries had been wearing itself out churning the tepid, cottony atmosphere. Still, I had to keep up my verve and spout the kind of talk, nothing too difficult, that would appeal to my new friends. For fear of putting my foot in it, I overflowed with patriotic admiration, and kept asking those heroes, one after another, for stories and more stories of colonial feats of arms. War stories, like dirty stories, appeal to the military of all countries. The best way to make a sort of peace, a fragile armistice to be sure, but precious all the same, with men, officers or not, is to let them bask and wallow in childish self-glorification. There's no such thing as intelligent vanity. It's an instinct. And you'll never find a man who is not first and foremost vain. The role of admiring doormat is about the only one that one man is glad to tolerate in another. With these soldiers I had no need to tax my imagination. It was enough to appear impressed. It's easy to ask for more and more war stories. Those boys were crammed full of them. It was like the good old hospital days. After each story I made sure to express my approbation, as Granador had taught me, with the glowing phrase, "Splendid." Why, that deserves to go down in history. There's a formula that can't be beat. Little by little, the group I had wormed my way into decided that I was all right. They started telling the same kind of cock and bull war stories as I had heard in the old days and later dished out myself in imagination contests with my pals in the hospital. Except their setting was different. Their fairy tales happened in the jungles of the Congo instead of the Vosges or Flanders. Once Captain Fremazon, the one who a moment before had volunteered to purge the ship of my putrid presence, perceived that I listened more attentively than anyone else, he began to give me credit for no end of delightful qualities. His arterial flux seemed attenuated by the effect of my original praises, his vision cleared, his bloodshot, alcoholic eyes even began to sparkle despite his besotted state, and the sprinkling of doubts about his own worth, which he had somehow conceived deep within him and which assailed him in times of extreme depression, were for a time adorably dissipated by the miraculous effect of my intelligent and pertinent comments. No doubt about it, I was a creator of euphoria. I had them slapping their thighs for all they were worth. I alone knew how to make life worth living in spite of the agonizing humidity. Wasn't I the most inspired of the listeners? As we were thus shooting the shit, the Admiral Brandon began to slow down. She seemed to be making hardly any headway. Not an atom of breeze around us. We must have been skirting the coast, moving as sluggishly as if the sea had been molasses. The sky above us was molasses too, a black, viscous mass that eyed hungrily. I'd have liked best to get back into the night, even sweating and groaning, no matter how. Fremazon went on and on with his stories. I had the impression that land was near, but my plan for escape filled me with alarm. Gradually our conversation ceased to be military and became first ribald, then frankly filthy, and in the end so incoherent that it was hard to keep it going. One after another of the company gave up and fell asleep, crushed under the weight of their snores, a nasty kind of sleep that scraped the caverns of their noses. That was the time to get away. One must never miss up on those remissions of cruelty that nature manages to impose on the most vicious and aggressive of this world's organisms. 60. By then we were anchored a short distance from the coast. All we could see of the shore was some lanterns moving back and forth. Very quickly 100 bobbing canoes full of screeching black men came crowding around the ship. There were black men all over the decks, offering their services. In a few seconds I carried the few bundles I had done up in secret to the gangway and slipped down it behind one of the boatmen, whose features and movements were almost entirely hidden from me by the darkness. At the bottom of the steps, on a level with the flashing water, I wondered anxiously where we were going. "Where are we?" I asked. "At Bengola Fort Gono, 44, the shadow answered. We pushed off and paddled hard. To make us go faster I helped him. I had time to get one last look at my menacing fellow passengers. In the light of the cabin lamps, laid low by apathy and gastritis, they grunted and fermented in their sleep. Bloated and sprawling, they all looked alike now, officers, civil servants, engineers, and traders, pimply, pot-bellied and swarthy, intermingled and more or less identical. Dogs look like wolves when they're asleep. A few moments later I was back on land. Under the trees the night was thicker than ever, and behind the night lay all the complicities of silence. In this colony of Bambola Bragamans the governor reigned triumphant over everybody. His soldiers and civil servants hardly dared breathe when he deigned to let his eyes fall on them. Far below these notables, the resident traders seemed to thieve and thrive more easily than in Europe. Not one coconut, not one peanut in the entire colony evaded their brigandage. As fatigue and ill health overcame the civil servants, it began to dawn on them that they'd been had, that all they had gained by being sent out here was bread and forms to fill out and very little pay. So naturally they looked at the traders with a bilious eye. The military faction, even more dull-witted than the other two, subsisted on the diet of colonial glory, washed down by quantities of quinine and miles of red tape. Understandably, a life spent waiting for the thermometer to go down made everybody more and more cantankerous. The consequence was private and collective quarrels, preposterous and interminable, between the military and the administration, between the administration and the traders, between these two in temporary alliance and the military, between the whole lot of them and the black population, and finally between blacks and blacks. The little energy that hadn't been sapped by malaria, thirst, and the heat was consumed by hatred so fierce and deep-seated that it wasn't uncommon for these colonials to drop dead on the spot, poisoned by themselves like scorpions. Nevertheless, this virulent anarchy was held in check, like crabs in a basket, by a hermetic police structure. The civil servants griped in vain, for the governor, to keep his colony in subjection, was able to recruit all the moth-eaten mercenaries he needed, impoverished blacks driven to the coast by debts, defeated by the law of supply and demand, and needful of something to eat. These recruits were taught the law and how to admire the governor. The governor seemed to wear all the gold in his treasury on his uniform in the blazing sunshine, it surpassed belief, even without the plumes. He went to Vichy for the cure every year, and he never read anything but the official gazette. A number of the civil servants cherished the hope that he'd sleep with their wives someday, but the governor didn't care for women. He didn't care for anything. He survived each new epidemic of yellow fever like a charm, while so many of the men who had liked to bury him died like flies at the first whiff of fever. There was a story that one 14th of July, as he was reviewing the troops of the residency, caracoling 61. Up ahead of his Spahi guards who were carrying a flag as big as a house, some sergeant, delirious with fever no doubt, rushed out in front of him, shouting, "Get back, you jerk." It seems the governor was very much upset by this outrage which, as it happened, was never satisfactorily explained. It is hard to get a faithful look at people and things in the tropics because of the colors that emanate from them. In the tropics, colors and things are in a turmoil. To the eye, a small sardine can lying upon the road at midday can take on the dimensions of an accident. You've got to watch out. It's not just the people who are hysterical down there, objects are the same way. Life only becomes tolerable at nightfall, but then almost immediately the darkness is taken over by swarms of mosquitoes. Not 1 or 2 or 100, but billions of them. Survival under those conditions is quite an achievement. A carnival by day, a colander by night, a quiet war. When the hut you sleep in has filled at last with silence and the air is almost fit to breathe, the termites, those loathsome beasts eternally engaged in eating away the uprights of your cabin, get to work. The day a tornado hits this treacherous filigree, whole streets will go up in dust. The town of Fort Gono where I'd landed, the capital of Bragamance, was perched precariously between sea and jungle, but supplied, adorned, so to speak, with enough banks, brothels, café terraces, and even a recruiting office, to make it a small metropolis. There was even a place Bay Durban and Boulevard Bugeaud, 45, in case you wanted to take a walk. The whole was a clump of gleaming edifices surrounded by jagged rocks, riddled with larvae, trampled by generations of soldiers and officials. At about 5 o'clock the military element would grouse and gripe over their apparatus, the price of which, as it happened, had just gone up when I arrived. A delegation of consumers was about to petition the governor to issue a decree enjoining the cafe owners from playing fast and loose with the prices of absinthe and cassis. If some of the regulars were to be believed, the very foundations of colonization were threatened by ice. Indeed, it cannot be denied that the introduction of ice into the colonies has sparked off a process of devirilization. Riveted by force of habit to his iced operative, the colonial could no longer hope to dominate the climate by stoicism alone. The Fay Derbs, the Stanleys, the Marcans, 46, be it noted in passing, had nothing but good to say of the tepid, muddy beer, wine, and water they drank for years without complaining. There you have it. That's how colonies are lost. I learned plenty more in the shade of the palm trees which, all along those avenues of precarious dwellings, throve in provocative contrast. It was only the garish raw greenery which prevented the place from looking exactly like Lager and Bezins. At nightfall the native hookers came out in strength, wending their way between clouds of hungry mosquitoes armed with yellow fever. There were Sudanese girls as well, offering the passerby the treasures under their loincloths. For extremely moderate prices you could treat yourself to a whole family for an hour or 2. I'd have liked to flit from twat to vagina, but necessity obliged me to look for work. The director of the company Perdue E47, Duke Hetty Congo, so I heard, was looking for an inexperienced man to take charge of one of the trading posts in the bush. I went without delay to offer my incompetent but enthusiastic services. The director's reception of me was not exactly friendly. That lunatic may as well call a spade. I'm not far from the government house in a spacious straw bungalow built on piles. Before even looking at me, he fired several questions about my past. Then, somewhat appeased by my naive answers, his contempt took a more indulgent turn. Still, he did not yet see fit to offer me a seat. To judge by your papers, you know something about medicine? He observed. I replied that I had indeed studied for a time in that field. It'll come in handy, he said. How about some whiskey? 62. I told him I didn't drink. Smoke? Again I declined. Such abstinence surprised him. In fact, he scowled. I'm suspicious of employees who don't smoke and drink. Are you a pederast by any chance? No? Too bad. They don't steal as much. That's been my experience. They get attached. Well, he was kind enough to hedge. By and large I seem to have noticed that quality, that advantage, in pederasts. Maybe you'll prove me wrong. And changing the subject, you're hot, aren't you? You'll get used to it. You'll have to. How was your trip? Uncomfortable, I said. Well, my friend, you haven't seen a thing. Come and tell me what you think of this country when you've spent a year in Bicomimbo, the place where I'm sending you to replace the Joker. His negress, squatting beside the table, was fiddling with her feet and scraping them with a little piece of wood. Beat it, you slut. Her master flung at her. Go and call the houseboy. And get me some ice while you're at it. The boy took his time coming. Infuriated, the director sprang to his feet and received him with 2 brutal slaps in the face and the same number of resounding kicks in the gut. These people will be the death of me, the director predicted with a sigh and slumped back into his armchair that was covered with dirty, rumpled, yellow canvas. Look, old man, he said, suddenly grown friendly, as though liberated for a while by his access of brutality. Would you mind handing me my whip and my quinine? They're on the table. I oughtn't to get so excited. It's stupid to fly off the handle like that. From his house we overlooked the river port, which shimmered through dusk so dense, so compact, that we heard the clanking and thumping more clearly than we could see what was going on. On the shore files of black men were busy, encouraged by whips and curses, unloading hold after hold of ships that were never empty, climbing up flimsy, teetering gangplanks with big baskets balanced on their heads like vertical ants. Through a scarlet haze I saw them coming and going in jerky lines. Some of these working shapes carried an extra black spot on their backs, those were mothers toting their babies along with their sacks of palm cabbage. I wonder if ants can do that. Doesn't it always seem like Sunday here? The director joked. So jolly. So colorful. And the females always naked. You've noticed? Good lookers too, don't you agree? Of course it seems strange when you've just arrived from Paris, I won't deny it. And look at us. Always in white ducks. Like at the seashore. Aren't we a sight for sore eyes? All dressed up for First Communion. It's always a holiday here, take it from me. Day in and day out, just one glorious 14th of July. And it's like this all the way to the Sahara. Think of it. He stopped talking, sighed, grunted, said shit. 2 or 3 times, mopped his forehead, and started in again. Out where the company's sending you, it's deep in the bush. Very damp. 10 days trip from here. First by sea. Then up the river. The river's all red, you'll see. And on the other side it's the Spaniards. The man you're replacing at the post up there is a rotter. Just between you and me. He simply won't send us his accounts. Nothing we can do. We've sent him letter after letter. A man doesn't stay honest long when he's alone. You'll see. He's written, says he's sick. Big deal. Sick. I'm sick too. What does he mean sick? We're all sick. You'll be sick yourself before you know it. That's no excuse. What do we care if he's sick? The company comes first. When you get there, take inventory, that's the 63. Essential. There's food enough for 3 months and merchandise for at least a year. You won't run short. Don't start at night, whatever you do. Be on your guard. He's got his own niggers, he'll send them down the river to pick you up, maybe they'll chuck you overboard. I bet he's trained them. They're as rascally as he is. Fact. He's probably dropped a hint to those niggers about you. That's the kind of thing they do around here. And be sure to take your quinine with you, your own, get it before you leave. He might doctor his, I wouldn't put it past him. The director thought he'd given me enough advice and stood up to say goodbye. The tin roof over our heads seemed to weigh at least 2,000 tons, it absorbed all the heat of the day and sent it down on us. We were both making faces with the heat. We could just as well have dropped dead. Perhaps, he said, there's no point in our meeting again before you leave, Bardamu. Everything wears one out so down here. Well, no, maybe I'll run down to the warehouses before you go and see how you're making out. You'll hear from us when you get there. There's a mail every month. The mail goes out from here. Well, good luck. And he vanished into the shadow between his tropical helmet and his jacket. I could clearly see the tendons in the back of his neck, curved like 2 fingers pressing against his head. He turned around again. Don't forget to tell that loafer to come back here in a hurry. I've got a few things to say to him. And not to waste time on the way. Oh, the rat. I only hope he doesn't croak before he gets here. That would be a shame. A bleeding shame. Oh, the blackguard. One of his blacks went ahead of me with a big lantern and took me to the place where I was to live before leaving for the Bicomimbo of my dreams. We passed through avenues full of people who seemed to have come out for a stroll after dark. The night, hammered by gongs, was all around us, interspersed by brief snatches of song as incoherent as sobs, the big black night of the hot countries, with its brutal tom-tom heart that always beats too fast. My young guide glided along easily on bare feet. There must have been Europeans in the bushes, you could hear them wandering about, their easily recognizable white men's voices, aggressive and hypocritical. The bats came whirling and weaving through the swarms of insects attracted by our light. Under every leaf of the trees there must have been at least one cricket, to judge by the deafening din. Halfway up a hill we were stopped at a crossroads by a group of native riflemen arguing around a coffin draped in a big French flag. It was somebody who had died in the hospital, and they didn't know exactly where to bury him. Their orders were vague. Some wanted to put him in one of the fields down below, some insisted on a garden at the top of the hill. The question had to be decided one way or the other, so the boy at NTI joined in the discussion. In the end the pallbearers decided for the lower rather than the upper burial ground, because it was easier to walk downhill. Then we met 3 young white boys, the kind that in Europe go to rugby matches on Sunday, enthusiastic, noisy, pale-faced spectators. Like myself they were employed by the Society Perduree and were kind enough to show me the way to the unfinished shanty where my portable folding bed was temporarily situated. The edifice when we got there was absolutely empty except for a few utensils and my so-called bed. As soon as I lay down on that wobbly filiform object, 2 dozen bats emerged from the corners and took to wishing back and forth like a volley of fans over my apprehensive repose. The young black, my guide, came back to offer me his intimate services. Then, disappointed when I told him I wasn't in the mood that evening, he offered to introduce me to his sister. I have been curious to know 64. How he expected to find his sister in such darkness. Not far away the village tom-tom chopped my patience into little bits. Thousands of hard-working mosquitoes took possession of my legs, but I didn't dare set foot on the ground because of the scorpions and snakes which, I assumed, had started on their abominable hunting expeditions. The snakes had plenty of rats to choose from. Rats were gnawing away at everything that can be gnawed. I heard them on the wall, on the floor, and quivering, ready to drop, on the ceiling. Finally the moon rose, and things were a little quieter in the shanty. All things considered, life in the colonies was no great shakes. Nevertheless, the next day came, a steaming cauldron. An enormous desire to go back to Europe took hold of me body and soul. Only one thing prevented me from clearing out Active money. That was enough. Anyway, I only had another week to spend in Fort Gono before going to my job in Bicomimbo, which I'd heard described so delightfully. The biggest building in Fort Gono after the governor's palace was the hospital. I ran into it wherever I went. I could walk 100 yards in the town without coming across one of its pavilions, smelling faintly of carbolic acid. From time to time I ventured down to the docks to watch my anemic young colleagues, whom the company Perdue recruited in France by emptying whole settlement houses, at work. They seemed possessed by a bellicose haste to unload freighter after freighter without stopping. Harbor fees are so dreadfully costly. They kept saying, sincerely distressed, as if it had been their own money. They belabored the black porters with a will. They were conscientious, you couldn't deny it, and they were also flabby, heartless sons of bitches. In other words, they were well chosen, as mindlessly enthusiastic as any employer could dream of. Sons that would have delighted my mother, worshipping their bosses, if only she could have had one all to herself, a son she could have been proud of in the eyes of the world, a real legitimate son. Those half-baked little specimens had come to tropical Africa to offer their flesh, their blood, their lives, their youth to their bosses, martyrs for 22 francs a day minus deductions, and they were happy, yes, happy down to their last red corpuscle, for which 10 million mosquitoes we lay lying in wait. The colonies make these little clerks fat or make them thin. Either way they hold them fast. There are only two ways to die under the sun, the fat way and the thin way. There's no other. You may have a preference, but it's your constitution that decides whether you get fat or whether the bones jab at your skin. The director up there on the red cliff, cavorting diabolically with his negress under the tin roof with the 10,000 kilos of sunshine on it would be no better off when his time was up. He was the skinny kind. Sure, he was putting up a fight. It looked as if he could beat the climate. Looked. In reality he was crumbling even faster than the others. The story was that he'd thought up a beautiful scheme that would make him a portentee in 2 years. But he'd never have time to carry it out, even if he applied himself to defrauding the company day and night. 22 directors before him had tried to make a fortune, each with his own system, like at roulette. All this was well known to the stockholders, who were keeping an eye on him from up above, still higher up, from the Rue Montcy in Paris. The director made them laugh. How childish. The stockholders were the biggest bandits of all. They knew their director was syphilitic and much too horny for the tropics. They knew he downed enough quinine and bismuth to burst his eardrums and enough arsenic to make his gums drop out. In the company's bookkeeping the director's months were numbered like the months of a pig's life. 65. My little colleagues never exchanged ideas. Only said formulas, baked and relic like dry crusts of thought. Worry won't get us anywhere. They said. Never say die. The director's a jerk. Nigger skin is good for tanning. Etc. In the evening after work we'd meet for aperitifs with an assistant manager, a Monsieur Tangerant from La Rochelle. If Tangerant hobnobbed with the traders, it was only because they'd pay for his drinks. He was a pitiful case, stone broke. His position in the colonial hierarchy was the lowest possible, overseeing road construction in the middle of the jungle. His militiamen had clubs, and naturally the natives worked. But since no white man ever used the new roads that Tangerant built, and since the blacks preferred their own tracks through the jungle where it was harder to lay hands on them for tax purposes, and since Tangerant's government roads didn't actually go anywhere, they soon vanished under a dense growth of vegetation, from month to month if the truth be known. Believe it or not, that astonishing pioneer would say, last year I lost 122 kilometers of them. During my stay, I only heard Tangerant boast about one thing, the one achievement he was humbly vain about. He was the only European capable of catching cold in Bragamance with a thermometer at 110 in the shade. That one distinction consoled him for many sorrows. I've caught another rotten cold. He'd announce proudly over his operative. You don't see that happening to anyone else. And other members of our sickly group would cry out, good old Tangerant. What a man. This little satisfaction was better than nothing. Where vanity is at stake, anything is better than nothing. Another way the company's petty clerks amused themselves was putting on fever contests. It wasn't difficult. These matches could go on for days, and they whiled away the time. When evening came and, almost always, the fever with it, they'd take their temperatures. Hey, I've got 101. Hell, that's nothing. I can work up 103 anytime I feel like it. These readings were absolutely accurate and above board. By the light of hurricane maps they'd compare thermometers. The winner would tremble and gloat. I'm sweating so much I can piss, said the most emaciated of the lot, a skinny young fellow from the Pyrenees, a champion of febrility who had come to Bragamance, so he told me, to get away from a seminary where he hadn't enough freedom. But time was passing, and none of my companions could tell me exactly what species of freak the man I was replacing in Bicomimbo belonged to. He's funny. They told me, and that was all. When you start out in a job like that, said the little Pyrenean with the high fever, you've got to show what you're good for. It's all one way or the other. As far as the director's concerned, you'll either be solid gold or solid shit. And another thing. He'll judge you right away. I was very much afraid of being put down as solid shit or worse. These young slave drivers, my friends, took me to see another employee of the Perdue, who deserves special mention. He operated a store in the European Quarter. Moldering with fatigue, oily and decrepit, he dreaded the slightest ray of light because of his eyes, which 2 years of uninterrupted baking under a tin roof had dried out atrociously. It took him a good half hour every morning to open them, so he told me, and another half hour before he could see more or less clearly. Every ray of light was torture. A big mangy mole. Suffocation and suffering had become second nature with him, and so had thieving. If he'd suddenly woken up healthy and honest, it would really have thrown him off balance. Even today, at this distance, I'd call his hatred for the Director General one of the most violent passions it has ever been given me to observe. At the thought of the Director, a violent rage would make him forget the pain he was in, and on the slightest 66 pretext he'd rant and rave, all the while scratching himself from top to toe. He never stopped scratching, in ellipsis so to speak, from the lower end of his spinal column to the top of his neck. He dug furrows into his epidermis and dermis with his bloody fingernails, while continuing to wait on his numerous customers, most of them virtually naked blacks. With his free hand he would plunge busily into various repositories to the right and left of him in the dark shop. Without ever making a mistake, deft and admirably quick, he would take out exactly what the customer wanted: stinking leaf tobacco, damp matches, cans of sardines, a ladle full of molasses, super alcoholic beer in bony bottles, which he'd suddenly drop it overcome by the desire to scratch in the cavernous depths of his trousers. Then he would thrust in his whole arm, and it would emerge through the fly, which he always left partly open as a precaution. He referred to the ailment that was eating away his skin by its local name, Korokoro. This miserable Korokoro. When I think that the stinking Director hasn't caught it yet, it makes me itch 100 times worse. The Korokoro can't get a hold on him. He's too rotten already. That pimp isn't a man. He's a smell. Pure unadulterated shit. When he said that, we'd all burst out laughing, the black customers too, in emulation. He frightened us a little. But he had one friend, a wheezing, graying little fellow who drove a truck for the Purdue E. He used to bring us ice that he'd stolen here and there from ships tied up at the wharf. We'd drink his health at the bar, surrounded by the black customers, who looked on enviously. These customers were the more sophisticated blacks, who'd lost their fear of doing business with white men, a kind of elite so to speak. The other blacks, not so smart, preferred to keep their distance. Matter of instinct. But the most enterprising, the most contaminated of the blacks got taken on as clerks in the store. You could recognize the black clerks by the way they cursed and yelled at other blacks. My colleague with the Korokoro traded in crude rubber. It came in sticky balls that the natives would bring in from the bush in big sacks. While we were in the store, listening to him by the hour, a family of rubber gatherers came to the door and froze with timidity, the father in the lead, wrinkled, girt in a skimpy orange loincloth and holding his long machete. The savage was afraid to come in despite the encouragements of one of the native clerks. Come on in, nigger. Come look see. We know we it's savages. Won over by these kind words, they stepped into the sweltering shack, at the back of which our Korokoro man was ranting. Apparently the native had never seen a store or possibly even a white man before. One of the women, with a big basket of crude rubber balanced on her head, followed him with downcast eyes. Quickly the recruiting clerks grabbed her basket and put the contents on the scales. The savage didn't know what the scales were about or anything else. His wife was still afraid to raise her head. The rest of the family waited outside. The clerk told them to come in, too bad if they missed the show. That was the first time they had all trekked from the bush to the white man's town. It must have taken them a good long time to collect all that rubber. So naturally they were interested in the outcome. You hang little cups on the trunks of the trees, and the rubber oozes into them very, very slowly. Sometimes you don't get so much as a small glassful in 2 months. After the weighing, our scratcher dragged the bewildered native behind the counter, did a little reckoning with a pencil stub, and shoved a few coins into the man's hand. Then he said, "Beat it." That's it. All his little white friends were convulsed to see how cleverly he had handled the transaction. The black man stood there by the counter, looking lost in his skimpy orange underdrawers. 67. One of the black clerks yelled at him to wake him up. "You know savvy money? You savage?" This clerk knew his onions. He was used to these peremptory transactions. He had probably been trained. "You know speaky French?" He went on. "You missing link, eh? What you speak 'em anyway? Couscous? Mobilia? Jackass. Bushman. You he big jackass." The savage just stood there with his hand closed on his coins. He would have run away if he had dared, but he didn't dare. "What you buy with dough?" The scratcher put in. "I haven't seen such a jughead in a long time." He must have come a long way. Had he wait for it? "Gimme that dough." He grabbed the money, and in place of the coins gave the black man a bright green handkerchief that he had definitely spirited from some secret hiding place under the counter. When the black man hesitated to leave with the handkerchief, the scratcher went a step further. He certainly knew all the tricks of the conqueror's trade. Shaking the big square of muslin before the eyes of a wee black child, he said, "Ain't it pretty, you little turd? Did you ever see one like it, little sweetie, little stinkpot, little fart?" And 1, 2, 3 he tied it around the child's neck. Now the child was dressed. The whole family stared at the child, decked out in the green cotton object. There was nothing more they could do, because the handkerchief had come into the family. They could only accept it, take it, and go. They all backed slowly out. They crossed the threshold. When the father, who was last, turned around to say something, the sharpest of the clerks, who was wearing shoes, helped him leave with a swift kick in the ass. The entire little tribe stood silently on the other side of the avenue Fay Derb, under the magnolia tree, watching us finish our operatives. It looked as if they were trying to understand what had happened to them. The Korokoro man was treating us. He even played his phonograph for us. You could buy anything in his store. It made me think of the supply depots in the war. As I've told you, there were lots of blacks and small whites like myself working in the warehouses and plantations of the company Purdue du Petit Togo at the same time as me. The natives, by and large, had to be driven to work with clubs. They preserved that much dignity, whereas the whites, perfected by public education, worked of their own free will. Wielding a club is fatiguing in the long run. The white men's hearts and minds, on the other hand, have been crammed full of the hope of becoming rich and powerful, and that costs nothing, absolutely nothing. We've heard enough about Egypt and the Tatar tyrants. In the art of squeezing the last ounce of labor out of a two-legged animal, those primitive ancients were pretentious incompetents. Did they ever think of calling their slave monsieur or letting him vote now and then, or giving him his newspaper? And especially had they thought of sending him to war to work off his passions? After 20 centuries of Christianity, as I personally can bear witness, your modern man simply can't control himself when a regiment passes before his eyes. It puts too many ideas into his head. Accordingly, I decided to keep a close watch on myself from then on and learn to keep my mouth scrupulously shut, to conceal my longing to get away, in short, to prosper if possible and come what may, in the service of the company Perdriere. Not a moment to lose. Alongside our warehouses, on the muddy river banks, whole nests of crocodiles, insidious and unmoving, lurked in wait. Built of metal, they enjoyed the delirious heat, and so apparently did the blacks. At midday you couldn't help wondering if all this bustle of toiling masses, this hubbub of screeching, 68 overexcited blacks on the docks was possible. To learn the secret of numbering sacks before taking to the bush, I had to submit to gradual asphyxiation in the company's main warehouse along with the other clerks, between two scales wedged into the alkaline crowd of ragged, pustulous, singing black men. Each one of them drew a little cloud behind him and shook it in cadence. The dull thuds of the overseers' clubs descended on their magnificent backs without provoking the least complaint or protest. Dazed and passive, they suffered pain as unquestioningly as the torrid air of that dusty furnace. The director came by from time to time, always aggressive, to make sure I was mastering the techniques of numbering sacks and falsifying weights. With sweeping blows of his club he cleared his path to the scales through the press of natives. "Bartholomew," he said to me one morning when he was in high spirits. "You see these niggers all around us? Well, when I came to Little Togo almost 30 years ago, those loafers still lived by hunting, fishing, and intertribal massacres. I was a small trader then. Well, as true as I'm standing here, I'd seen them coming home to their village after a victory, loaded with more than 100 baskets of bleeding human flesh to stuff their bellies with. Hear that, Bartholomew? Bleeding. Their enemies. A feast. Today, no more victories. We've accomplished that much. No more tribes. No more flim-flam and foolishness. Today we've got a labor force and peanuts. Good hard work. No more hunting. No more guns. Peanuts and rubber. To pay taxes with. Taxes to get us more rubber and peanuts. This is life, Bartholomew. Peanuts. Peanuts and rubber. And say, well, I'll be damned. There's General Tombat. 48, true enough, he was coming our way, an old man crumbling under the enormous weight of the sun. The general wasn't exactly a soldier anymore, but he wasn't exactly a civilian either. Confidential agent of the Perdriere, he took care of liaison between the administration and the business community, an indispensable function although the two lived in a state of permanent competition and hostility. But the general was a shrewd maneuverer. For instance, he had disentangled a shady deal in enemy holdings, which had been judged inextricable in high places. At the beginning of the war, General Tombat's ear had been split, not very badly, just enough to get him honorably retired after Charleroi. 49, he had immediately offered his services to Greater France. But long after Verdun, 50, that epic battle was still on his mind. He was always shuffling a handful of telegrams. Our little Pollies will hold on. They are holding on. It was so hot in the warehouse and France was so far away that we could have done without General Tombat's predictions. But just to be polite, we all, and the director with us, declared in chorus, "They're marvelous." On these words Tombat left us. A few moments later the director opened up another violent path through the tightly packed torsos and vanished in his turn into the peppery dust. The director had eyes like glowing coals. He was consumed with a passion to hornswoggle the company. He frightened me a little, and I had difficulty in getting used to his presence. I found it hard to believe that in all the world there could be a human carcass capable of such maximum tension greed. He seldom said anything to us straight out, he spoke only in muffled hints, and he seemed to live and breathe for the sole purpose of conspiring, spying, and betraying. I was told that he stole, swindled, and peculated incomparably more than all the other officials put together, and they were no slouches, I assure you. But I can easily believe it. During my stay in Fort Gono, I had a little leisure in which to roam around. The only really desirable spot I came across in the whole town was the hospital. Whenever you get to a new place, certain ambitions turn up inside you. My ambition was to be sick, just plain sick. Every man to his taste. I walked around those promising hospital pavilions, so doleful, withdrawn, 69. And unmolested, and I never relinquished their antiseptic charm without regret. The lawns around them were brightened by furtive little birds and anxious multicolored lizards. An earthly paradise in its way. As for the blacks, one soon gets used to them, their sluggish good nature, their slow gestures, and the protuberant bellies of their women. Those blacks stink of their misery, their interminable vanities, and their repugnant resignation. Actually, they're just like our poor people, except they have more children, less dirty washing, and less red wine. When I'd finished inhaling and sniffing at the hospital, I followed the native crowd and stopped for a while outside the pagoda-like edifice near the fort that a restaurant owner had built for the entertainment of the sexy young jokers of the colony. The prosperous whites of Fort Gono went there at night and gambled doggedly, meanwhile drinking and yawning and belching with a will. For 200 francs you could lay the luscious patron. The young jokers had a lot of trouble with their trousers when they wanted to scratch, because their suspenders kept sliding off. At night big crowds poured out of the native huts and collected around the pagoda, never weary of seeing and hearing the whites jigging around the mechanical piano as off-key waltzes wheezed from its moth-eaten strings. When she heard the music, a blissful look came over the patron, meaning that she felt like dancing. After trying in vain for several days, I managed to have a few talks with her in private. Her periods, she confided, lasted no less than 3 weeks. Fault of the tropics. In addition, her customers wore her out. Not that they made love very often, but since drinks at the pagoda were on the expensive side, they tried to get their money's worth by pinching her ass something terrible before leaving. That was what wore her out mostly. As a competent businesswoman, the patron knew all the gossip of the colony, all the desperate love affairs that transpired between the fever-harried officers and the handful of civil servants' wives, they too menstruating interminably and languishing for days on end in the deep reclining chairs of their verandas. The streets, offices, and shops of Fort Gono were awash with mutilated desires. To do everything people did in Europe despite the abominable temperature and their own progressive, insurmountable decay seemed to be the prime obsession, satisfaction, and grimace of those maniacs. The fences could hardly contain the swollen, wildly aggressive vegetation of the gardens. The rampant foliage molded delirious lettuces around the houses, those chunks of dried out egg white, in which some jaundiced European was rotting away. All along the Avenue Fashoda, 51, the liveliest and most fashionable street in Fort Gono, there were as many overflowing salad bowls as government officials. Every night I went to my no doubt unfinished shack, where my skeleton of a bed had been put up by my depraved boy. He set traps for me. He was as sensual as a cat. He wanted to become part of my family. I, however, was haunted by other, far more pressing preoccupations, especially by my plan to take refuge for a while in the hospital, the only armistice within my reach in that torrid carnival. In peace as in war, I took no interest at all in feudal pastimes. Even the sincerely and eminently obscene offers that came to me through the boss's cook struck me as colorless. For the last time I made the rounds of my young friends at the Perdriere, trying to cull some information about that disloyal employee, the one I had orders to replace at all costs in the bush. Empty chit-chat. Nor did I learn anything substantial in the Cafe Fedor at the end of the Avenue Fashoda, a buzz at Pesevny. Twilight hour with hundreds of slanders, rumors, and calumnies. Nothing but impressions. Whole dustbins full of impressions were overturned in that half-light encrusted with multicolored lamps. Shaking the lace of the giant palm trees, the wind blew clouds of mosquitoes into the customers' saucers. The governor, thanks to his exalted rank, figured prominently in the discourse roundabout. His inexpiable crumminess was the mainstay of the operatic conversation in which the nauseated colonial liver seeks relief before dinner. At that hour all the cars in Fort Gono, 10 in all, drove back and forth past the cafe. They never seemed to go very far. The place Fedor had the characteristic atmosphere, the overdone deeper, the floral and verbal excess, of a subprefecture in southern France gone mad. The 10 cars left the place Fedor only to come back 5 minutes later, having once more completed the same circuit with their cargo of anemic Europeans, dressed in unbleached linen, fragile creatures as wobbly as melting sherbet. For weeks and years these colonials passed the same forms and faces until they were so sick of hating them that they didn't even look at one another. The officers now and then would take their families for a walk, paying close attention to military salutes and civilian greetings, the wives swaddled in their special sanitary napkins, the children, unbearably plump European maggots, wilted by the heat and constant diarrhea. To command you need more than a puppy. You also need troops. In the climate of Fort Gono the European cadres melted faster than butter. A battalion was like a lump of sugar in your coffee. The longer you looked the less you saw. Most of the white conscripts were permanently in the hospital, sleeping off their malaria, riddled with parasites made to order for every nook and cranny in the body, whole squads stretched out flat between cigarettes and flies, masturbating under moldy sheets, spinning endless yarns between fits of painstakingly provoked and coddled fever. Poor bastards, they were having a rough time, a pitiful crew in the soft half-light of the green shutters, re-enlisted men soon fallen from celebrity. Side by side the hospital was mixed of civilians, all hunted men in flight from the bosses and the bush. In the apathy of those long malarial siestas, the heat is such that the flies also rest. From bloodless, hairy arms on both sides of the beds dangle grimy books, all in tatters. Half the pages are missing because of the dysentery cases, who never have enough paper, and also because of the sourpuss nuns, who have their own way of censoring wicked books. The military crabs victimize the nuns as much as everybody else. When they want a good scratch, they lift up their habits behind the screen where this morning's stiff is still so hot that he hasn't yet managed to grow cold. Depressing as the hospital was, it was the only place in the whole colony where you could feel forgotten, safe from the people outside, the bosses. A vacation from slavery, that was the main thing, anyway the only happiness within my reach. I made inquiries about the requirements for admission, the habits and idiosyncrasies of the doctors. By that time the prospect of leaving for the bush filled me with despair and thoughts of revolt. Already I was planning to contract every available fever as soon as possible, to return to Fort Gono desperately ill and so emaciated, so repulsive that they'd not only have to take me, but also to ship me back to France. I already knew some wonderful tricks for getting sick, and I was learning special new ones for the colonies. I prepared to overcome 1,000 difficulties, for neither the directors of the company Perdriere nor the military authorities were easily discouraged from tracking their troll-racked, cadaverous prey and pouncing on them as they played cards between the pissy beds. They would find me resolved to rout with whatever disease proved necessary. Unfortunately you didn't usually stay in the hospital for long, unless you wrote finis there to your colonial career once and for all. Sometimes the toughest and smartest of the fever patients, those with the greatest strength of character, managed to slip aboard the transport bound for France. That was a happy miracle. Most of the hospital patients gave up, recognized that the regulations had defeated them, and went back to the bush to lose 71. What weight they had left. If the quinine relinquished them to their maggots while they were still in the hospital, the chaplain would simply close their eyes at about 6 in the evening, and 4 Senegalese would carry the bloodless husks to the plot of red clay beside the church in Fort Gono. That church, incidentally, was so hot under its tin roof that you never went there twice, more tropical than the tropics. To stand up in that church you have to pant like a dog. That's the way it goes. You can't deny it, men have a hard time doing all that's demanded of them, butterflies in their youth, maggots at the end. I tried here and there to get a little more information, a few facts to go by. Because what the director had told me about Bicomimbo seemed incredible. Apparently the place was an experimental trading post, an attempt to penetrate the bush, at least 10 days' journey from the coast, isolated in the midst of the natives and their jungle, which had been described to me as an enormous reservation, crawling with animals and diseases. I wondered if my young friends at the Purdue E, who oscillated between aggressiveness and extreme depression, weren't simply jealous of me. Their idiocy, which is all they could call their own, varied with the amount of liquor they had ingested, the letters they had received, and the amount of hope they had lost during the day. As a general rule, the more morbid they felt, the more they swaggered and strutted. If they'd been ghosts like Orlin at the front, their gall would have known no bounds. Our operatives went on for 3 whole hours. We always talked about the governor, the pivot of all our conversations. Then we talked about possible and impossible swindles, and lastly about sex, the 3 colors of the colonial flag. The civil servants present made no bones about accusing the military of wallowing in peculation and abuse of authority, but the military paid them back in kind. The traitors, for their part, regarded all these prebendaries as hypocritical imposters and bandits. A rumor that the governor was being recalled had been in circulation every morning for the past 10 years, yet the delightful telegram announcing his disgrace never arrived, and this in spite of the at least 2 anonymous letters mailed to the minister for the colonies each week, imputing 1,000 meticulously described atrocities to that local tyrant. The blacks are lucky with their onion skins. The white man, encased between his acid sweat and his tropical shirt, poisons himself. It's not safe to go near him. I'd learned my lesson on board the Admiral Branton. In only a few days I heard some sweet stories about my director. His past was as full of low dodges as a prison in a seaport town. His past had just about everything in it, including, I imagine, some magnificent miscarriages of justice. True, his looks were against him. His face had the terrifying look of an undeniable murderer, or rather, to be fair, the look of a reckless man in a terrible hurry to get ahead, which amounts to the same thing. If you passed by at siesta time, you might see, sprawled in the shade of their houses on the boulevard Fay d'Herbe, a few white women, the wives of officers or settlers, who were even more devastated by the climate than the men, frail creatures with pleasingly hesitant voices, infinitely indulgent smiles, their pallor coated with rouge, as though happy on their deathbeds. These transplanted middle-class women showed less courage and pride of bearing than the patron of the pagoda, who had no one but herself to lean on. The company Purdue E consumed quantities of small clerks like me. Every year it lost dozens of these subhumans in the jungle trading posts not far from the swamps. Pioneers. Every morning the army and business came to the office of the hospital, whimpering and begging for their men. Not a day went by but some captain came threatening and calling down God's thunders on the head physician to make him send those 3 malarial card-playing sergeants, and 2 syphilitic corporals back to their units on the double, because how could he put the company together without non-coms? If told that his 72 gold breaks were dead, he'd stop bothering the hospital management and go back to the pagoda for a few more drinks. Men, days, things had passed before you knew it in this hotbed of vegetation, heat, humidity, and mosquitoes. Everything passed, disgustingly, in little pieces, in phrases, particles of flesh and bone, in regrets and corpuscles. Demolished by the sun, they melted away in a torrent of light and colors, and taste and time went with them. Everything went. Nothing remained but shimmering dread. At last the freighter, which was to take me along the coast to the vicinity of my trading post, anchored within sight of Fort Gono. The Papaga was her name. A small ship, wood-burning and flat-bottomed, built for estuaries. I was the only white on board, and they assigned me a small space between the kitchen and the toilet. We moved so slowly that at first I thought we were being cautious in getting out of the roadstead. But we never went any faster. This Papaga was incredibly short on power. We edged along within sight of the coast, an endless gray line tufted with small trees in the dancing heat mists. What a trip. The Papaga plowed through the water as slowly and painfully as if she herself had sweated it all. She would undo one little wave after another as cautiously as if they'd been bandages. The pilot, it seemed to me from a distance, must have been a mulatto. I say seemed because I never summoned up the energy to go up on the bridge and see for myself. Until about 5 o'clock I stayed in the shaded gangway, wedged in among the blacks who were the only passengers. If you don't want the sun to burn your brains through your eyes, you have to blink like a rat. After 5 you can indulge in a look-around good life. That gray fringe, that tufted country at the water's edge, looked like flattened dress shields and didn't appeal to me at all. The air was unbreathable, even at night it was hot, sultry, and salty. Everything was so cloying it raised my bile, what with the smell of the engine and in the daytime the water that was too brown on one side and too blue on the other. This was even worse than the Admiral Branton, minus of course the murderous officers. At last we approached the port of my destination. Its name, I was to LD, was Toco. After coughing, spitting, and quaking on the surface of that oily dishwater for 3 times as long as it takes to eat 4 canned meals, the Papaga finally pulled up at the landing. 3 enormous thatched huts stood out from the shaggy banks. From a distance and at first glance the place was rather attractive. This, I was told, was the mouth of a big sandy river, which I was to mount by canoe on my way to the heart of the jungle. I was scheduled to spend only a few days here at Toco by the sea, just time enough to frame my last colonial resolutions. We headed for a flimsy dock, and before reaching it the Papaga scraped a sandbar with its fat belly. Well, I remember the dock. It was made of bamboo, a story in itself. They told me it had to be rebuilt every month, because of the tricky, nimble little mollusks that came by the thousands and ate it up. This endless rebuilding, in fact, was one of the heartbreaking occupations that weighed on Lieutenant Grappa, 52 commander of the Toco station and the surrounding territory. The Papaga called only once a month, but a month was all the mollusks needed to eat up her dock. As soon as I landed, Lieutenant Grappa took possession of my papers, checked them for authenticity, copied them into a Virgin register, and invited me in for an aperitif. I was the first traveler, he informed me, to come to Toco in 2 years. Nobody came to Toco. There was no reason to come to Toco. Sergeant Alcide was Lieutenant Grappa's second in command. In their eyes the Ladio and there was no love lost between them. I always have to watch that subordinate of mine, said Lieutenant Grappa at our first meeting, or he tends to get too familiar. Since any happenings they might have imagined in that wilderness would have been too implausible for what could happen in such a place. Sergeant Alcide prepared in advance a whole sheaf of nothing to report reports, which Grappa signed without delay, and the Papaga carried them away to the Governor 73. General. Among the lagoons roundabout and in the depths of the jungle, several moth-eaten tribes lived in misery and stagnation, decimated and befuddled by trypanosoma and chronic poverty. Even so, these tribes paid a small tax, collected of course with clubs. From among their younger set, a few militiamen were recruited to wield these same clubs. The militia consisted of 12 men. Lucky bastards. I know whereof I speak. I knew them well. Lieutenant Grappa equipped them in his own way and fed them regulation rice. One rifle for all 12, but each had his own little flag. No shoes. But, since all things are relative and comparative in this world, the native recruits thought Grappa was treating them splendidly. Every day, in fact, he turned away volunteers and enthusiasts, young men who had had their fill of the bush. The hunt in these parts didn't yield much, and at least one grandmother a week was eaten for want of gazelles. At 7 o'clock every morning, Alcide's militiamen reported for drill. Since I lived in one corner of his hut, where he had made room for me, I had a ringside seat for the fantasia. Never has any army in the world had more willing soldiers. In response to Alcide's commands, those primitives would wear themselves out pacing the sand in columns of 4, 8, and finally 12, imagining they had packs, shoes, and even bayonets, and better still, going through the motions of using them. Barely emerged from a nature so vigorous and so close at hand, they wore nothing but an apology for khaki shorts. They had to imagine all the rest, and did. At Alcide's peremptory command, these ingenious warriors deposited their imaginary packs on the ground and lunged into empty space to disembowel illusory enemies with illusory bayonets. Then, after simulating the unbuttoning of jackets, they would stack invisible rifles and in response to another sign, fling themselves with unfeigned passion into an abstraction of rifle drill. To see them disperse, gesticulating with studied precision, and lose themselves in intricate, epileptic, and insanely useless movements was deeply depressing. Especially when you remember that in Toko the raw, stifling heat, so perfectly concentrated in that sand pit between the conjugated polished mirrors of the sea and the river, would have made you swear by your bleeding buttocks that you were being forced to sit on a chunk of sun that had just fallen off. But these implacable conditions didn't stop Alcide from sounding off. Not at all. Passing over the heads of his incredible drill squad, his roars mounted to the tops of the venerable cedars at the edge of the jungle. And the thunder of his ten-shun reverberated still further still. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Grappa was administering justice. We'll have more to say about that. Or from a distance, from the shade of his hut, he'd be supervising the ephemeral construction of his ill-fated dock. He had ordered complete uniforms and equipment for his recruits, and every time the proprietor showed up, he went down to the dock with skeptical optimism to take delivery. For 2 years he'd been clamoring for those uniforms. It may have been especially humiliating for Grappa as a Corsican to see that his militiamen were still stark naked. In our hut, Alcide's a small, semi-clandestine trade was carried on in small objects and miscellaneous odds and ends. As a matter of fact, all the commerce of Toko passed through Alcide's hands, for he alone possessed a small stock of tobacco, both packaged and in the leaf, several liters of brandy, and a few boats of cotton goods. It was plain that the 12 militiamen felt a real liking for Alcide, though he chewed them out interminably and kicked their rear ends rather unjustly. But those nudist soldiers had discerned in Alcide the unquestionable signs of kinship, of fellow membership in the great family of the innately, incurably poor. Black or not, tobacco created a tie. It always does. I had brought a few newspapers with me from Europe. Alcide looked through them, trying to take an interest in the news, but though he tried 3 times to fix his attention on those ill-assorted columns, he couldn't get through them. You know, he confessed to me 74. After his vain effort, I don't really give a shit about the news anymore. I've been here for 3 years now. It shouldn't be thought that Alcide was trying to impress me by playing the hermit. Actually, the ruthlessness, the manifest indifference of the whole world where he was concerned, had driven him, in his capacity as a re-enlisted sergeant, to regard the whole world outside of Toko as a distant planet. Alcide was a good sort, obliging, generous and all. I realized that later, a little too late. He was crushed by his enormous resignation, that basic quality that makes it as easy to kill poor bastards in and out of the army as to let them live. Poor people never, or hardly ever, ask for an explanation of all they have to put up with. They hate one another, and content themselves with that. Around our hut, scattered over the lagoon of torrid pitiless sand, there were strange little flowers, fresh and short-lived, green, pink, or purple, the kind that in Europe you only see painted on certain pieces of porcelain, a kind of primitive no-nonsense morning glory. Close on their stems, they endured the long abominable days, then opened in the evening and trembled in the first balmy breezes. One day when Alcide saw me picking a little bunch of them, he warned me, pick them if you want to, but don't water the little bitches, it kills them. They're delicate, not at all like the sunflowers we used to grow for the army kids in Rambouillet. You could piss on them. They drink anything. If you ask me, flowers are like men. The bigger the dumber. That was an obvious dig at Lieutenant Grappa, whose body was bulky and ramshackle, his hands short, purple, and terrifying. The kind of hands that would never understand anything. And indeed, Grappa made no attempt to understand. I stayed in Toko for 2 weeks, during which I shared not only Alcide's existence and food, his bed fleas and sand fleas 2 species, but also his quinine and the inexorably tepid and diarrheic water of the nearby well. One day when Lieutenant Grappa was feeling convivial, he invited me to his house for coffee. Grappa was jealous. He never let anyone see his native concubine. Consequently, he picked a day when his negress was visiting her parents in their village. It was also the day when his court of justice convened, and he wanted to impress me. The motley mass of complainants and screeching witnesses had arrived early in the morning. In bright-colored loincloths they crowded around the hut. Defendants and mere public stood mixed helter-skelter, all smelling strongly of garlic, sandalwood, rancid butter, and saffron-scented sweat. Like Alcide's militiamen, all these people seemed intent first and foremost on frenzied illusory motion. In transports of imaginary argument, they spewed castanet language and shook their clenched fists. Deep in his creaking, groaning cane chair, Lieutenant Grappa smiled at all this assembled incoherence. He trusted for guidance in the post interpreter, who in a loud and barely intelligible mumbo-jumbo communicated unbelievable complaints. Take, for instance, the one-eyed sheep that a certain girl's parents refused to return despite the fact that their daughter, though married in due form, had never been delivered to her husband, because in the meantime the bride's brother had somehow seen fit to murder the bridegroom's sister, who had been guarding the sheep at the time. And many similar but even more complicated grievances. Around us 100 faces, impassioned by these questions of custom and interest, bared their teeth with little clicking or big gurgling sounds, black African words. The heat was nearing its height. I looked up past the edge of the roof to see if some disaster was approaching in the sky. Not even a storm. I'm going to straighten this whole thing out immediately. Grappa finally declared. The heat and interminable palavers had driven him to a decision. Where's the bride's father? Bring him here. 75. Here he is. Cried a dozen natives, pushing an elderly, decrepit-looking black man swathed with great dignity in a yellow Panyo-man style over the front. With one clenched fist the old man beat time to everything that was being said around him. He didn't look as if he'd come to make a complaint. More likely he hoped for a bit of entertainment long after he'd given up expecting any tangible results from his lawsuit. All right, said Grappa. 20 strokes. Let's get this over with. Give this old pimp 20 strokes. That'll teach him to pester me every Thursday for the last 2 months with his batty sheep story. The old man saw 4 husky militiamen coming toward him. At first he didn't understand what THA wanted with him, but then he began to roll his eyes, which were bloodshot like the eyes of a terrified old animal that has never been beaten before. He made no real attempt to resist, but neither did he know what position to take so the scourge of justice would inflict the least pain. The militiamen pulled him by the toga. 2 of them wanted him to kneel, but the other 2 told him to lie prone. In the end, they just laid him out on the ground any which way, lifted up his toga, and subjected his back and buttocks to a score of blows with a flexible rod that would have made a healthy meal bellow for a week. He wriggled and ripped, the fine sand spurted all around him mixed with blood, he spat sand as he howled, he made me think of an enormous pregnant basset being tortured. The public was silent while this was going on. All you could hear was the sound of the beating. When it was over, the old man, though half unconscious, tried to get up and cover himself with his Roman panty. His mouth and nose and most of all his back were bleeding profusely. Droning their comments and chit-chat in funeral tones, the crowd led him away. Lieutenant Grappa lit his cigar. In my presence, he affected an air of aloofness from these things. I don't believe he was more Neronian than anyone else, but he disliked being obliged to think. That infuriated him. What exasperated him when performing his judicial functions was the questions he was asked. The same day we witnessed another 2 memorable thrashings pursuant to further disconcerting reports of dowries taken back, poisonings, threatened promises, unfulfilled children of uncertain origin, etc. Oh. Grappa cried. If they only knew how completely cold their bickerings leave me, they'd stay in their junglery they belong instead of chewing my ear off with their cock and bull stories. Do I bother them with my troubles? But then he started on a different idea. You know, I'm almost beginning to think those apes are developing a taste for my justice. For 2 years I've been trying to get them disgusted with it, but every Thursday they come back for more. Believe it or not, young man, it's almost always the same ones who keep coming. A bunch of perverts if you ask me. Then the conversation turned to Toulouse, where he spent all his leaves and where he was planning to settle in 6 years when he retired. It was all right with me. We had pleasantly arrived at the Calvados stage when we were disturbed again by a native who'd been sentenced the week before but was late in having his sentence carried out. Now, 2 hours after everyone else, he'd come of his own free will to get his thrashing. He'd been on the trail for 2 days and 2 nights, and he had no intention of going back to his village with his business undone. But he was late, and in matters of penal punctuality Grappa was uncompromising. He asked for it. Why didn't he wait his turn last time? I sentenced the motherfucker to those 50 strokes last Thursday, not today. Still, the client protested, for he had a good excuse. He'd had to hurry back to his village to bury his mother. He had 3 or 4 mothers all to himself. Excellent arguments. It will have to wait till the next session. But our client would barely have time for the trip to his village and back before the following Thursday. He went on protesting. He wouldn't budge. It took several violent kicks in the ass to get that masochist out of 76. The camp. They gave him some pleasure, but not enough. In the end he went to ALCIDE, who took advantage of the situation to sell him a whole assortment of tobacco, in the leaf, in packages, and in the form of snuff. Well entertained by these various incidents, I took my leave of Grappa. It was time for his siesta, and he withdrew to the interior of his hut, where his native housekeeper, who had just come back from her village, was already reclining. That black woman had a magnificent pair of tits, and she had been well schooled by the sisters in Gabon. Not only did the young lady speak French with a lisp, she also knew how to administer quinine and jam and to dig sugars out of the soles of one's feet. She knew 100 ways of making herself agreeable to a white man without tiring him or by tiring him, whichever he preferred. Alcide was waiting for me. He was rather miffed. It was probably the invitation with which Grappa had honored me that decided him to confide in me. What he told me was pretty strong stuff. Unasked, he modeled Grappa's portrait in steaming cow flop. I replied that he had taken the words out of my mouth. Alcide's vulnerable point was that in defiance of army regulations, which strictly forbade it, he was trading with the natives in the jungle roundabout and with his 12 militiamen as well. He mercilessly sold those people tobacco on credit. When payday came around, there was no pay for the militiamen to collect. They had smoked it all up. They smoked up advances. This petty irregularity, what with the rarity of cash in the region, hampered the collection of taxes. Lieutenant Grappa was too cautious a man to provoke a scandal in Topa while he was in command, but he was definitely pissed off. Maybe he was jealous. Understandably enough, he felt that whatever negligible sums of money the natives called their own should remain available to the tax collector. Each man to his taste and humble ambitions. At first this system of credit against their pay had seemed rather strange and even outrageous to the rifleman, whose sole purpose in working was to smoke outside's tobacco, but he had got them used to it by kicking them in the ass. By that time, they'd given up trying to collect their pay. They calmly smoked it up in advance, among the bright-colored flowers outside's hut, between two sins of imaginary drill. In short, there was room in Topo, small as it was, for two systems of civilization, Grappas, which you might call Roman and which consisted of flogging your subjects for the sole purpose of extracting tribute, of which, if Alcide was to be believed, Grappa retained a disgraceful percentage for his own strictly personal use, and the more elaborate Alcide system bearing witness to a higher stage of civilization, in which every soldier becomes a customer. This military-commercial complex is much more modern and hypocritical. It is, indeed, the basis of our own system. Lieutenant Grappa was no great shakes at geography. For his knowledge of the vast territories committed to his charge, he relied on the few rudimentary maps that he had at the post. He was none too eager to know more about those territories. After all, we know what trees and the jungle are. We can see them very nicely from a distance. Tucked away in the fronds and hollows of that immense steam bath, a few thinly disseminated tribes stagnated amid their fleas and flies, stultified by their totems and unflaggingly gorging themselves with putrid manioc. Utterly native, frankly cannibalistic, maddened by poverty, and ravaged by 1,000 plagues. No earthly reason to go near them. Nothing to justify troublesome administrative incursions, which could yield no results whatsoever. When Grappa had finished meting out justice, he preferred to turn toward the sea and contemplate the horizon from which he had come one day and across which he would sail one day if all went well. Familiar and all in all agreeable as the place had become to me, the time came when I had to think of leaving Topo for the post that was to be my dwelling place and occupation after several days of fluvial 77. Navigation and sylvan peregrinations. Alcide and I were getting on fine together. We tried to fish for swordfish, a variety of shark that infested the waters in front of our hut. He was just as clumsy as I was. We never caught anything. The only furnishings in his hut were his full DNG bed, mine, and a few crates, some empty, some full. I had the impression that what with his little business he must be putting quite a lot of money aside. Where do you keep it? I asked him several times. Where do you hide your filthy lucre? Just to get his goat. Planning a big spree when you get back? I was only teasing him. 20 times at least, as we dug into the inevitable canned tomatoes, I'd entertain him with amazing episodes of the heroic joyride from cat house to cat house that would celebrate his return to Bordeaux. He never said anything. He'd only laugh, as though my little stories amused him. Apart from the drill and the court sessions, nothing happened in Topo, nothing whatever, so naturally, for want of other subjects, I'd take up the same old joke as often as possible. Once toward the end of my stay, I thought of writing to Monsieur Puta to touch him for some money. Alcide promised to mail my letter the next time the Propadia called. Alcide kept his writing materials in a small biscuit tin, just like the one Grandlago had, exactly the same. All re-enlisted sergeants seemed to have them. When he saw me start opening the box, Alcide made a movement to stop me. I was surprised and embarrassed. I had no idea why he wouldn't let me open it, but I put it down on the table. Oh, all right, open it. He said finally. Hell, it doesn't matter. The photograph of a little girl was pasted to the inside of the lid. Just the head, a sweet little face with long curls, the way they wore them in those days. I took out pen and paper and quickly closed the lid. I was embarrassed at my indiscretion, but I also wondered why it had upset him so. First I figured that the child must be his and he hadn't wanted to talk about her. I asked no questions, but then I heard him behind my back, trying to tell me something in a strange bumbling voice I'd never heard. I felt very uncomfortable. I knew I ought to help him tell me his story, but I didn't know how to go about it. I knew it would be a painful story to listen to, and I wasn't looking forward to it. It's nothing. I finally heard him say. It's my brother's daughter. They're both dead. Her parents? Yes, her parents. Then who's bringing her up? Your mother? I asked him that to show I was taking an interest. My mother's dead too. Who then? Well, me. He grinned and blushed crimson, as if he'd done something absolutely indecent. Then he hastened to rectify. All right, I'll explain. I'm having her brought up in Bordeaux by the sisters. But don't get me wrong, they're no sisters of charity. High-class sisters. She's my responsibility and you needn't worry. She'll want for nothing. Her name is Jeanette. Sweet little girl. Like her mother. She writes to me, she's making good progress, but you know, those schools are expensive. Especially now that she's 10. I want her to have piano lessons at the same time. What do you think of the piano? Well, in my opinion the piano is the right thing for girls. Don't you agree? And what about English? English can come in handy. Do you know English? As Alcide confessed his failing of being generous enough, I began to look at him more closely, with his little cosmetic mustache, his eccentric eyebrows, and his burned black skin. The delicacy of the man. And how he must have scrimped and saved on his meager wages. His pitiful allowances and tiny clandestine business for months and years in this infernal Topo. I didn't know what to say, I had no experience, but his heart was so much superior to mine that I went red in the face. Next to Alcide I was an impotent 78. Slob, boorish and vain. No two ways. Plain as day. I didn't dare speak to him anymore. Suddenly I felt unworthy to say a word to him. I, who only yesterday had kept him at a distance and even looked down on him a little. I haven't been lucky, he went on, unaware that he was embarrassing me with his confidences. Imagine, 2 years ago she had infantile paralysis. You know what infantile paralysis is? He went on to explain that the child's left leg was atrophied and that a specialist in Bordeaux was treating her with electricity. You think she'll get it back? He asked me. I assured him that she would recover completely with time and electricity. He spoke very circumspectly of his dead mother and of the child's infirmity. He was afraid, even at a distance, of harming her. Have you been to see her since her illness? No, I've been here the whole time. Will you go and see her soon? I don't think I'll be able to go for another 3 years. You see, I do a little business here. That's a big help to her. If I went on leave now, my place here would be taken before I got back. Especially with a bastard. So Alcide had asked to do a double hitch, to stay in Topo for 6 consecutive years instead of 3, for the sake of his little niece, of whom he had nothing but a few letters and that little photograph. What bothers me, he said after we'd gone to bed, is that she hasn't anybody for the holidays. That's hard on the little girl. Obviously Alcide was perfectly at ease, at home so to speak, in the higher regions, on terms of familiarity with the angels. You wouldn't have known it to look at him. With hardly a thought of what he was doing, he had consented to years of torture, to the crushing of his life in this toward monotony for the sake of a little girl to whom he was vaguely related. Motivated by nothing but his good heart, he had set no conditions and asked nothing in return. To that little girl far away he was giving enough tenderness to make the whole world over, and he never showed it. Suddenly he fell asleep in the candlelight. After a while I got up to look at his face. He slept like everybody else. He looked quite ordinary. There ought to be some mark by which to distinguish good people from bad. There are 2 ways of getting into the jungle. One is to cut a tunnel through it, the way rats do in a bale of hay. That's the stifling way. I jibbed at that. Or you can endure the misery of sitting huddled in a hollow tree trunk, while they paddle you up the winding river from Cox to Snag, waiting for the endless days to pass and laying yourself open without defense to the deadly glare. And finally, dazed by the yapping of the black men, you reach your destination in some sort of condition. At first your paddlers always need time to catch the cadence. Arguments. A paddle strikes the water, 2 or 3 rhythmic howls, the jungle sends back an answer, eddies, she's gliding, 2 paddles, 3, still groping for the rhythm, waves, inarticulate burblings, a backward glance at the sea, flattening out as it recedes, and up ahead the long smooth expanse into which you're toiling. And for a while yet, far away on his dock, almost swallowed up by the sea mists, Alcide under his enormous bell-shaped pith helmet, a chunk of head, the face a small cheese, and below it the rest of him, floating in his tunic, lost in a strange white-trousered memory. 79. That's all I have left of the place, of Topo. Have they managed to defend that scorching hamlet against the insidious side of the yellowish-brown river? Are its flea-bitten huts still standing? Are new Grappas and unknown Alcides still training new recruits in imaginary combat? Is the same plain-dealing brand of justice still being meted out? Is the drinking water still so rancid? So tepid? So bad that whenever you try to drink it, it leaves you disgusted for days on end? Is there still no refrigeration? And what of those acoustic battles between the flies and the everlasting hum of the quinine? Sulfate? Fluoride? In your ears? But most of all, are there still black people sweltering and pustulating in that cauldron? Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe none of all that is there anymore. Maybe a tornado broke loose one night. Maybe the little Congo, just in passing, gave Topo one good lick with its muddy tongue and it was all over. Maybe the whole place is dead and gone, the very name wiped off the maps, and nobody left to remember Alcide. Maybe his little niece has forgotten him too. Maybe Lieutenant Grappa never saw his Toulouse again. Maybe the jungle, which has always, year after year when the rainy season sets in, had designs on the dune, has recaptured the whole settlement, crushed it beneath the shade of its giant mahogany trees, even those unexpected little sandflowers that Alcide didn't want me to water. Maybe it's all gone. I'll long remember those 10 days going up the river. Huddled in the bottom of the canoe, watching out for muddy whirlpools, picking furtive passages between enormous drifting branches, nimbly avoided. A labor for convicts on the lam. After every sundown we'd camp on a rocky promontory. Finally one morning we left that filthy native canoe and slipped into the forest by a hidden path that twined through the moist green gloom, lit only here and there by a ray of sunlight falling from the roof of the vast cathedral of leaves. Monstrous felled trees forced us to make frequent detours. Whole metro trains could have maneuvered with ease in the hollows left by their roots. Suddenly the full light was on us again. We had come to a clearing and had to climb, an additional effort. The rise we had come to overlook the endless forest, rolling over red, yellow, and green peaks, modeling and smoothing hill and dale, as monstrously spacious as the sea and the sky. I was given to understand by signs that the man whose habitation we were looking for lived just a little further on in another valley. And there he was waiting for us. He had built a sort of hut between 2 big boulders, sheltered, as he informed me, from the eastern tornadoes, which were the worst, the most furious. That, I was willing to admit, was an advantage, but the hut itself definitely belonged to the lowest, most ramshackle category, an almost theoretical edifice, coming apart at every seam. I had foreseen something of the sort, but this surpassed all my expectations. The man must have thought I looked downcast, because he addressed me rather brusquely, to shake me out of my thoughts. Come off it, you'll be better off here than in the trenches. Here at least you can worry along. The food is rotten, I can't deny it, and there's nothing to drink but pure mud, but you can sleep as much as you like. There's no big guns here and no bullets. All in all, it's a bargain. He talked something like the Director General, but he had pale eyes like Alcide's. He must have been close to 30, with a beard. I hadn't taken a good look at him on arriving, because on arriving I'd been thrown off by the dilapidation of the setup he was supposed to bequeath me and which might possibly be my home for years. But observing him later on, I found a distinctly adventurous face with sharply accentuated angles, one of those rebellious faces that plunge into life head-on instead of rolling with the waves, with a big round nose, and cheeks like coal barges, plashing against destiny with the soft babbling sound. That was an unhappy man. It's true, I said. There's nothing worse than war. 80. I thought we'd said enough for the moment. I had no desire to say any more. It was he who went on, especially now that they make them so long. Well, anyway, friend, you'll see that it's no joke here. There's nothing to do. It's a sort of vacation. Except who'd want to spend a vacation in a place like this? Well, maybe it's a matter of temperament. I wouldn't know. How about the water? I asked. The water I saw in the cup I had poured myself had me worried. It was yellowish. I drank some. It was sickening and as warm as in Topo. A 3-day sediment of mud. Is this the water? The water torture was starting all over again. Yes, that's all there is, except rainwater. But when it starts raining, the shack won't last long. You see the condition it's in? I saw. The food, he went on, is all canned. That's what I've been eating for a whole year. It hasn't killed me. Convenient in a way, but it doesn't stick to the ribs. The natives eat putrid manioc. That's their business. They like it. For the last 3 months it's been running through me. Diarrhea. Maybe it's fever too. I've got both. Around 5 o'clock I'm more lucid. That's how I know I've got fever, because it's hard to feel hotter than you do already in this climate. Actually, it's probably the chills that tell you you've got a fever. And not being quite so bored, maybe that's another sign, but that's a matter of temperament too. Maybe a few drinks would cheer us up, but I don't go for drink. It doesn't agree with me. He seemed to think very highly of what he called temperament. Then while he was at it, he gave me a little more of his delightful information. By day it's the heat, at night it's the noise that's hard to bear. It's unbelievable the animals go chasing round and round, to fuck or to kill each other. How do I know? Either way, you never heard such a hullabaloo. The loudest are the hyenas. They come up close to the shack. You'll hear them. You won't have any doubts. It's nothing like the quinine music. Sometimes you can mistake birds or big flies for quinine. It's conceivable. But hyenas, the enormous way they laugh. They're smelling your flesh. That's what makes them laugh. They're in a hurry to see you pass on. You can even see their eyes shining, so I'm told. They feed on dead bodies. I've never looked into their eyes. I'm sorry in a way. Sounds delightful, I said. But he hadn't finished with the nightlife. Then there's the village, he went on. There aren't 100 niggers in it, but they make enough rumpus for 10,000. You'll tell me what you think of it. And man, if it's tom-toms you're after, you come to the right place. If they're not beating them because the moon is out, they're beating them because the moon has gone by. There's always some reason. The sons of bitches seem to be in cahoots with the animals to drive us crazy. So help me, I'd shoot the whole lot of them if I weren't so tired. As it is, I put cotton in my ears. That's even better. As long as I had Vaseline in my medicine chest, I greased the cotton with it. Now I use banana oil. Banana oil does the trick. That way they can gargle with thunderstorms if it makes them happy. It's no skin off my ass with my ears full of grease cotton. I don't hear a damn thing. These niggers are sick, they're perverts. You'll see. All day long they squat on the ground. You wouldn't think them capable of moving as far as the nearest tree to piss against, but the minute it's dark, surprise. Vice. Nerves. Hysteria. Chunks of the night gone hysterical. That's niggers for you, take it from me. Degenerate scum. Do they often come and buy from you? Buy? You're out of your mind. The trick is to rob them before they rob you. That's business. At night of course they do as they please. With grease cotton in both ears. They'd be fools to stand on ceremony. Besides, as you see, my shack has no door. So naturally they help themselves. For them 81. It's the good life. But what about your inventory? I asked, utterly dismayed at what he had told me. The Director General told me. He made himself very clear. To draw up a Metaculo US inventory the moment I got here. I have the honor, he replied with perfect calm, of telling you that the director can kiss my ass. But won't you have to see him on your way through Fort Gono? I will never see either Fort Gono or the director again. It's a big forest, my young friend. But where will you go? If anyone asks you, tell them you don't know. But since you seem eager to learn, let me give you some very good advice before it's too late. Don't worry about the company any more than the company worries about you. If you can run as fast as the company screws its employees, I can tell you right now that you're due to win the Grand Prix. So be thankful that I'm leaving you a little cash and ask no more. As for TV stock, if it's true that the director told you to take charge of it, tell him there isn't any left, and that's that. If he won't believe you, who cares? They take us all for thieves anyway. So it won't make any difference to public opinion if for once we get a little something out of it. And besides, don't worry, the director knows more about financial monkey shines than anybody, so why contradict him? That's my opinion. What's yours? Everybody knows that for a man to come here he has to be prepared to kill his father and mother. Am I right? I wasn't so sure all he'd been telling me was true, but either way this predecessor of mine struck me as an out-and-out bandit. I wasn't at all easy in my mind. Another mess I've fallen into. I said to myself with increasing conviction. I stopped talking with that thug. In one corner, stowed every which way, I found the merchandise he was leaving me, a few scraps of cotton goods. But loincloths and shoes by the dozen, some boxes of pepper, several lamps, a douche can, a staggering quantity of Cancasselet law bordelaise, and lastly a picture postcard of the place Glitchy. Next to the ridgepole you'll find the rubber and ivory I've bought from the niggers. I worked hard at first. And oh yes, here are 300 francs. That's what's coming to you. Coming to me for what? I had no idea, but I didn't bother to ask him. You may still be able to manage a bit of barter, he said. Because, you know, you'll have no use for money out here, only when you want to clear out. He started laughing. Not wanting to cross him at the moment, I did likewise. I chimed in as if everything were hunky-dory. In spite of the extreme destitution in which he'd been living for many months, he had surrounded himself with an elaborate domestic staff, consisting mostly of young boys, who fell all over themselves in their eagerness to bring him the household's one and only spoon or the matchless cup, or to extract with consummate skill the classical and inevitable burrowing sugars from the soles of his feet. In return, he would often oblige them with a kindly hand between their thighs. The only work I ever saw him do was scratching himself, but that, like the shopkeeper at Fort Gono, he did with the marvelous agility that can be observed only in the colonies. The chairs and tables he bequeathed me showed me what ingenuity can do with crushed soap boxes. That sinister individual also taught me how it is possible, for want of anything better to do, to propel those ungainly, caparisoned caterpillars which, quivering and foaming at the mouth, kept assailing our forced cabin, far into the distance with a short swift kick. God help you if you are clumsy enough to crush one. 82. You'll be punished with an entire week of intense stench, which rises slowly from that unforgettable mash. He had read somewhere that those horrible monsters were the oldest animals in the world, dating, so he claimed, back to the second geological period. When we've come as far as they have, my boy, won't we stink too? His exact words. The sunsets in that African hell proved to be fabulous. They never missed. As tragic every time as a monumental murder of the sun. But the marvel was too great for one man alone. For a whole hour the sky paraded in great delirious spurts of scarlet from end to end. After that the green of the trees exploded and rose up in quivering trails to meet the first stars. Then the whole horizon turned gray again and then red, but this time a tired red that didn't last long. That was the end. All the colors fell back down on the forest in tatters, like streamers after the 100th performance. It happened every day at exactly 6 o'clock. Then the night set in with all its monsters and its thousands and thousands of croaking toads. The forest is only waiting for their signal to start trembling, hissing, and roaring from its depths. An enormous, love-maddened, unlighted railway station, full to bursting. Whole trees bristling with living noisemakers, mutilated erections, horror. After a while we couldn't hear each other talk in the hut. I had to hoot across the table like a hoot owl for my companion to understand me. I was getting my money's worth. And remember, I didn't like the country. What's your name? I asked him. Did you say Robinson? He had just been telling me that the natives in those parts suffered horribly from every conceivable disease and that the poor bastards were in no condition to engage in any kind of trade. While we were talking about the natives, so many flies and insects, so large and in such great numbers, dashed against the lamp in such dense swells that we finally had to put it out. Before dousing the lamp, I caught a glimpse of Robinson's face, veiled by a curtain of insects. That made me why his features impressed themselves more sharply on my memory, whereas before that they hadn't reminded me of anything in particular. He went on talking to me in the darkness, while I retraced the steps of my past with the sound of his voice as a term with which to open the doors of the years and months and finally of my days, wondering where I could have run into this man. But I found nothing. No answer. You can lose your way groping among the shadows of the past. It's frightening how many people and things there are in a man's past that have stopped moving. The living people we've lost in the crypts of time sleep so soundly side by side with the dead that the same darkness envelops them all. As we grow older, we no longer know whom to awaken, the living or the dead. I was trying to identify this Robinson when gales of hideously exaggerated laughter, not far away in the night, made me jump. Then they fell silent. It must have been the hyenas he'd told me about. And then there was nothing but the villagers and their tom-toms, those crazy drums made of hollow wood, termites of the wind. The name Robinson gnawed at me more and more insistently. In the darkness we talked about Europe and the meals you can order if you've got the money, not to mention the DRNKS. So deliciously cool. Not a word about the next day, when I was to be left alone, for years perhaps, with all those cans of Castellet. Would war have been better? No, worse. Definitely worse. He thought so too. He'd been in the war himself. And nevertheless he was getting out of here. He was fed up with the forest, and that was that. I tried to bring him back to the war. But he wouldn't oblige. Finally, as we were getting ready for bed, each in his corner of that shambles of leaves and partitions, he came right out with it. He preferred the risk of being hailed into court for theft to living on Castellet as he'd 83. Been doing for almost a year. Then I saw the lie of the land. Haven't you any cotton for your ears? He asked me. If not, you'd better make some with a nap of a blanket and a drop of banana oil. You can make very nice little plugs that way. I for my part refused to put up with the bellowing of those baboons. Actually that concert had everything in it but baboons, but he clung to his inept generic term. It suddenly occurred to me that this business with the cotton must be a cloak for some fiendish trick. I was seized with fear that he'd murder me there on my folding bed and make off with what was left in the money box. The idea paralyzed me. But what could I do? Call for help? Call who? The village cannibals? I thought of myself as missing. Even in Paris a man without money, without debts, without hope of an inheritance, hardly exists. He's missing to all intents and purposes. So what could I expect here? Who'd bother to come to Baiko Mimbo and even honor my memory by spitting in the water? Nobody, of course. Hours of intermittent terror. He didn't snore. All those sounds, those calls from the forest made it hard for me to hear him breathe. No need of cotton. I kept puzzling, and finally the name Robinson revealed a body, a posture, a voice I had known. And just as I was giving in to sleep, the whole man stood before my bed. I held him fast, not him of course, but the memory of this Robinson, the man at Noyers-sur-Lice in Flanders, who'd been with me on the fringes of that night when we went looking for a hole through which to escape from the war, and then the same man later in Paris. It all came back to me. Years passed in a few moments. I'd been unhappy, sick in the head. Now that I knew, now that I'd placed him, I couldn't help it. I was thoroughly scared. Had he recognized me? In any case he could count on my silence and complicity. Robinson. Robinson. I cried out cheerfully, as if I had good news for him. Hey, old man. Hey, Robinson. No answer. With pounding heart I got up, expecting a mean jab in the gut. Nothing. Then, rather bravely, I groped my way to the other end of the shack, where I'd seen him go to bed. He was gone. Striking a match now and then, I waited for daybreak. The day came in a burst of light, and so did the black servants, laughing and offering me their enormous uselessness. At least they were cheerful, I'll admit that. From the first, they tried to teach me the art of not giving a damn. I did my best to explain with a series of carefully studied gestures how terribly Robinson's disappearance had me worried. No use. It was all the same to them. True, it's senseless to worry about anything that isn't right in front of your nose. What bothered me most about all this was the money box. But when someone walks off with a money box, you seldom see him again. I therefore decided that Robinson was most unlikely to come back and murder me, which was that much gained. So the whole landscape was mine. I'd have all the time I needed, I thought, to study the surface and the depths of this leafy immensity, this ocean of red, of mottled yellow, of flamboyant hams and head cheeses, magnificent no doubt for people who love nature. I definitely didn't. The poetry of the tropics turned my stomach. The thought of all those vistas repeated on me like tuna fish. Say what you like, it will never be anything but a country for mosquitoes and panthers. And not for me. I preferred to go back to my shack and fix it up in anticipation of the tornado that could not be long in coming. But I was soon obliged to abandon my attempts at reinforcement. The standard parts of the structure were amenable to further disintegration but defied repair. The vermin-infested thatch was coming apart. You couldn't have made a decent urinal out of my home. After I had described a few listless circles in the bush, the sun forced me to go back in and silently collapse. The same old sun. At the noon hour everything falls silent. Everything is afraid of burning up. And it wouldn't take much. Grass, animals, and people are heated through. Meridian apoplexy. 84. My one and only chicken, bequeathed to me by Robinson, dreaded the noon hour the same as I did. He'd go back in with me. For 3 weeks the chicken lived with me like that, following me like a dog, collecting constantly, seeing snakes wherever he went. One day of extreme boredom, I ate him. He had no taste at all, his flesh had been bleached by the sun like an awning. Maybe he was what made me so sick. Be that as it may, the morning after that meal I couldn't get up. Around noon, completely groggy, I dragged myself to the medicine chest. There was nothing in it but some iodine and a map of the Nord-Sud Metro. 53. I hadn't seen a single customer in the store, only a few villagers who came to look-see, interminably gesticulating and chewing cola, ridden with sex and malaria. They gathered in a circle around me and seemed to be discussing my ugly mug. I was 100% sick. I felt as if I had no further use for my legs. They just hung over the edge of my bed like unimportant and rather ridiculous objects. All the runners brought me from the director in Fort Gono was letters stinking with insults and idiocy, and threatening what's more. Businessmen all think of themselves as big or little professional wizards, but in practice they usually turn out to be hopeless incompetents. My mother, writing from France, admonished me to take care of my health, as she had during the war. My head could be all set for the guillotine, and still my mother would scold me for forgetting my muffler. She never missed an opportunity to try and convince me that the world is a kindly place and that she'd done a good job in conceiving me. This alleged providence was the great subterfuge of maternal thoughtlessness. It was easy for me, I have to admit, to leave all my bosses and mother's hogwash unanswered, and the fact is I never did answer their letters. Clever of me, but it didn't improve my situation. Robinson had made off with almost everything that fragile edifice had contained, but who believed me if I said so? Write letters? What for? To whom? At about 5 every afternoon I shook with a violent fever, my bed jiggled and rattled as if I'd been vigorously jerking off. A bunch of blacks from the village had come to wait on me and taken possession of the hut. I hadn't sent for them, but to send them away would have been too much of an effort. They squabbled over the remains of the stock, rummaged through the kegs of tobacco, tried on the last of the loincloths, felt the material, and took them off, adding, if that was possible, to the general disorder of my establishment. The rubber was all over the ground, mingling its juice with the bush melons and those sickly sweet papayas that taste like pissy pears. I ate so many of them in place of beans that now, 15 years later, the memory of them still turns my stomach. I tried to gauge the degree of hopelessness to which I had fallen. I couldn't. Everybody steals. Robinson had said to me 3 times before disappearing. The director was of the same opinion. In my fever those words ran through me like shooting pains. You've got to figure the angles. He'd said that too. I tried to get up. I couldn't make it. He'd been right about the water we had to drink. It was concentrated muck. Little black boys brought me bananas, big ones, little ones, red ones, and more papayas, but I was so sick of all that and everything else. I'd have vomited up the whole globe. As soon as I felt a tiny bit better and not quite so dazed, I was seized again with a horrible fear, the fear that the company would call me to account. What would I say to those devils? How would I get them to believe me? They'd have me arrested for sure. And who would try me? A bunch of special judges, something like a court-martial, armed with terrible laws they had gotten from God knows where, who never tell their real intentions and who for the sheer fun of it make you drag your bleeding steps up a steep path overlooking hell, the path that leads poor bastards to their death. The law is a big Luna Park of suffering. When a poor man lets himself get caught in it, you'll hear him screaming for centuries on end. I preferred to lie there in a stupor, trembling and foaming at the mouth with a 104 degrees fever, than to be lucid and forced to think of what would happen to me in Fort Gono. I even stopped taking my quinine because I figured the fever would keep life away from me. You get drunk on what you've got. While I lay there sweltering, I ran out of matches. They'd been in short supply. Robinson hadn't left me a thing, only cassoulet la bordelaise. But plenty of that, I assure you. I threw up whole tins of it. and even to alive at 85. That result, you had to eat them. The shortage of matches provided me with one little amusement, watching my cook light his fire with 2 pieces of flint and some dry grass. It was while I was watching him that the idea came to me. With plenty of fever added, my idea became wonderfully vivid. Though clumsy by nature, I was able after applying myself for a month to light a fire with 2 sharp stones like a savage. In short, I was learning how to make do under primitive conditions. Fire is the first thing. Then there's hunting, but I wasn't interested in that. My flame was all I needed, and I practiced conscientiously. Day after day I had nothing else to do. I never got nearly as good at the sport of propelling those secondary caterpillars. I didn't quite get the knack. I squashed a lot of them, and then I lost interest. I gave them the run of the house like old friends. There were 2 big storms, the second went on for 3 days and, RSE, for 3 nights. At last I had drinking water in the bucket, tepid to be sure, but even so. In the deluge the scraps of goods in my little stock began to run and intermingle, a disgusting mess. Some of the natives obligingly brought me lianas from the forest to anchor my shack to the ground, but in vain. At the slightest wind, the leafy walls would flap wildly against the roof like wounded wings. There was nothing I could do about it. Never a dull moment. Blacks big and small decided to join me in my downfall. They got more and more familiar. And they were so very happy. What fun. They came and went as they pleased in my so-called home. Freedom. As a sign of perfect understanding we exchanged signs. If I hadn't had fever, I might have started learning their language. There wasn't time enough. I made very good progress in fire making, but I hadn't yet mastered their best manner. I wasn't very quick about it. Showers of sparks still flew into my eyes, which gave my black friends a good laugh. When I wasn't moldering with fever on my folding bed or working my primitive tinderbox, I thought of the company's accounts. It's funny how hard it is to throw off one's dread of irregular accounts. I'd undoubtedly inherited that from my mother. She'd contaminated me with her "he who steals a pin will steal a pound" and end up murdering his mother. We all find it hard to throw off those ideas. We pick them up in childhood, and they come back to terrify us later on, in every crisis. Our only hope of getting rid of them is the force of circumstances. Luckily the force of circumstances is enormous. Meanwhile the store and I were sinking. One of these days we'd be swallowed up by the mud, which got thicker and more viscous with every downpour. The rainy season. What looked like a boulder yesterday was oozy molasses today. Tepid water fell in cascades from dangling branches and followed one everywhere. It invaded the hut and spread round about as in an old abandoned riverbed. The rain made a porridge of my merchandise, my hopes, and my accounts, and so did my fever, which was also very moist. The rain was so compact that when it hit you it stops your mouth like a lukewarm gag. But the flood didn't stop the animals from getting together. The nightingales started making as much noise as jackals. Anarchy all over the ark, and I doddering Noah. This, I thought, had been going on long enough. How my mother's adages weren't about honesty. As I remembered opportunely, she used to say when burning old bandages, nothing purifies like fire. A mother leaves you something for every turn of fate. You just have to take your pick. The time had come. My pieces of flint were not very well chosen, not sharp enough, most of the sparks struck my hands. In the end, however, some of my merchandise took fire in spite of the dampness, a parcel of sopping wet socks. It happened after sundown. The flames rose impetuously. Wildly jabbering, the villagers gathered around the blaze. The crude rubber that Robinson had bought was sizzling in the middle, and the smell reminded me invincibly of the famous telephone company fire on the Quai de Grenelle that I had gone to see with my Uncle Charles, who sings sentimental ballads so well. That was the year before the big exposition, when I was very young. Nothing brings memories to the surface like smells and flames. My 86. Shack smelled exactly that way. Though drenched, it burned very thoroughly to the ground, merchandise and all. No more counts. The owls and leopards, toads and parrots must have been flabbergasted. It takes something to impress that crowd. Like war with us. Now the forest could come back and cover the wreckage with its thundering leaves. I hadn't saved anything but my personal belongings, my folding bed, the 300 francs, and that yearly, sad to say, a few cans of cassolet for the road. When the fire had been burning for an hour, hardly anything was left of the shack. A few tongues of flame in the rain and a few jabbering black men poking about in the ashes with the tips of their spears amid gusts of the smell that clings to all catastrophes, emanates from all the defeats of this world, the smell of smoking gunpowder. Now was the time to make quick tracks. Back to Fort Gono, retrace my steps? Try to explain my conduct and the circumstances of the present disaster? I hesitated. Not for long. Nothing can be explained. The world only knows how to do one thing, to roll over and kill you, as a sleeper kills his fleas. That would be a stupid way to die, I said to myself, to let myself be crushed like everybody else. To put your trust in men is to get yourself killed a little. In spite of the condition I was in, I decided to head straight into the bush in the direction taken by that infernal Robinson. Often on my way I heard the beasts of the jungle with their plaints and calls and tremolos, but I hardly ever saw them. I don't count the little wild pig I almost stepped on one day not far from my shelter. Hearing those torrents of calls and screams and roars, you had the impression that they were close by, hundreds and thousands of them. And yet, when you got to the place where the hubbub came from, there was nobody there, except for those big blue guinea fowl, all trussed up in their plumage as if they were going to a wedding and so clumsy when they jumped hopping from branch to branch that you thought they must have had an accident. Lower down, in the musky undergrowth, big heavy butterflies, bordered like death notices, quivered with the effort of opening their wings, and lower still it was us, sloshing through the yellow mud. We had trouble getting ahead, especially because the blacks were carrying me in a litter made of sacks sewn end to end. They could easily have tossed me in the drink while we were crossing a stream. Why didn't they? I found out later. Or they could have eaten me, since that was one of their customs. Now and then I'd question them with my thick tongue, and every time they answered, yes, yes. Always glad to oblige. Good fellows. Whenever my diarrhea let me go for a while, the fever took hold. You wouldn't believe how sick I was. I couldn't see things clearly anymore, or rather, everything was beginning to look green. After nightfall, all the animals of creation surrounded our camp. We'd make a fire. But here and there, even so, a cry would pierce the great black awning that stifled us. Despite its horror of men and fire, a wounded, dying animal would manage to complain to us, seeing we were right there. After the 4th day I stopped even trying to distinguish reality from the absurd fever images that went chasing one another through my head, along with fragments of people and endless tatters of resolutions and disappointments. Even so, I tell myself today when I think about it that the bearded white man we met one morning on the stony promontory near the meeting of two rivers must have been real. A cataract nearby was making a hellish din. He was a sergeant, something like Alcide, except this one was Spanish. Worrying along from trail to trail, we'd ended up in the colony of Rio del Rio, an ancient possession of the Crown of Castile. That poor Spanish soldier also had a shack. I seem to remember that he laughed when I told him about my misadventures and what I had done with my shack. His, I have to admit, looked a little better, but not much. His special cross was the red ants. On their annual migration, those little bitches had elected to pass Strait 87 through his shack, and they'd been at it for going on 2 months. They took up practically all the space. You could hardly turn around, and if you got in their way, they pinched you hard. He was overjoyed when I gave him some of my cassoulet, because he'd been living on tomatoes for the last 3 years. I couldn't better that. All by himself, he told me, he had downed more than 3,000 cans. Tired of preparing the tomatoes in different ways, he had taken to sucking the cans like eggs, through 2 little holes in the lid. When the red ants discovered that a new variety of canned goods had arrived, they mounted guard around the cassoulet. It wouldn't have been advisable to leave a freshly opened can standing. They'd have summoned the whole nation of red ants to the shack. There are no bigger communists anywhere. And they'd have eaten up the Spaniard too. My host informed me that the capital of Rio del Rio was called Santa Peta, 54, a seaport famous all along the coast for its transoceanic galleys. It so happened that the track we were on ended there, we would just have to go straight ahead for 3 days and 3 nights. I was good and sick of my delirium, so I asked the Spaniard if he knew of some good native medicine that would straighten me out. My head was acting up something terrible. But he wouldn't hear of any such mumbo-jumbo. For a Spanish colonial he was strangely Africanophobic, so much so that when he went to the toilet he refused to use banana leaves and kept a whole sheaf of the Bolet de Cereals, cut up in little pieces for that express purpose. And he didn't read the paper. Same as Alcide. For 3 years he'd been living there alone with the ants, a few little kinks, and his old newspapers. What with his awful Spanish accent, which was so strong it was like having somebody else in the room, it was hard to get him stirred up about anything. When he chewed out his natives, it was like a tempest. For loudness of mouth, Alcide couldn't hold a candle to him. I took such a liking to that Spaniard that in the end I gave him all my cassoulet. Out of gratitude he made me a lovely passport on grainy paper stamped with the arms of Castile, with a signature so elaborate, so finicky, that it took him at least 10 minutes to get it right. He'd told the truth, you couldn't miss the road to Santa Peta, you only had to follow your nose. I don't remember the trip, but of one thing I'm sure, that as soon as we got there they handed me over to a priest who was so gaga that having him beside me gave me a kind of comparative self-confidence. But not for long. The town of Santa Peta was plunked down on the side of a rock, directly facing the sea. It was hard to believe how green the place was. A magnificent spectacle, no doubt, seen from the roadstead, splendid from a distance. On the spot, though, the ray was nothing to admire but the same overworked carcasses as in Fort Gono, everlastingly sweating and pustulating. In a lucid moment I dismissed the blacks of my little caravan. They crossed a long stretch of jungle and feared for their lives going back, so they said. In leaving me, they wept in advance at the thought of the journey, but one hadn't the strength to feel sorry for them. I had suffered and sweated too much. And I was still at it. By day and by night, to the best of my recollection, a lot of Jaber's hay were decidedly in plentiful supply routed around my bed, which had been set up for that very purpose in the presbytery, since entertainment was rare in Santa Peta. The priest filled me with tisanes, a long gilded crucifix dangled over his belly, and when he came near me a loud clinking of coins rose from the depths of his soutane. Conversation with those people was out of the question. It exhausted me completely just to mumble a word or two. I really thought it was all up with me, and I tried to take a last look at what could be seen of the world 88. Through the priest's window. I doubt if I could describe those gardens today without gross and outlandish mistakes. The sun was there, I can vouch for that, always the same, as if somebody had opened a big furnace in your face, and then behind it there was more sun and insane trees, whole avenues of them, those lettuces as big as oaks and those African dandelions, 3 or 4 of which would add up to a perfectly good chestnut tree in France. Throw in a toad or two, as hefty as spaniels, waddling furtively from one flower to the next. People, countries, and objects all end up as smells. I kept my eyes closed because I really couldn't open them anymore, then from night to night the sharp smell of Africa was blunted. It became harder for me to recapture that heavy mixture of decaying soil, human crotches, and ground saffron. Time, patches of the past, then more time, and then at a certain moment I felt a series of jolts and twists, and then the jolting became more regular, a swing, a rocking. I was still lying down, that was sure, but whatever I was lying on was moving. I let myself go, I vomited, then I woke up again and fell asleep again. I was on the sea. I felt so faint that I barely had the strength to catch the new smell of ropes and tar. It was cool in the heaving niche where I was lying directly under a wide open portal. They'd left me alone. Evidently my journey was continuing. But what journey? I heard steps on the deck, a wooden deck right over my nose, and voices, and the waves lashing and melting against the ship's side. Life seldom comes back to your deathbed, wherever you may be, except in the form of a low-down trick. The one those people in Santa Peta had played on me filled the bill. Taking advantage of my befuddled state, they'd sold me to the captain of a galley. A fine galley, to be sure, high of hull, well fitted with oars, crowned with beautiful purple sails, gilded figurehead, superbly upholstered officers' quarters, and on the prow a magnificent cod-liver oil painting of the Infanta Gambetta 55, dressed for polo. The Infanta, I was told later on, was the ship's sponsor, offering it the protection of her name, her tits, and her royal dignity. It was flattering. After all, I reflected when I realized what had happened, in Santa Peta I was as sick as a dog, the whole world was spinning, and I'd certainly have died in that presbytery where the natives had left me. Return to Fort Gono? Those accounts would certainly have got me 15 years. Here at least I was moving, and that was ground for hope. Come to think of it, the captain of the Infanta Gambetta had taken a big chance in buying me, even dirt cheap, from that priest before weighing anchor. It was a risky investment, for that captain could have lost all his money. He was counting on the brisk sea air to revive me. He deserved the reward and obviously he was winning his bet, for I was already recovering. I could see he was as pleased as Punch. I still raved quite a lot, but with a certain logic. After I opened my eyes, he often came to see me in my cubbyhole. He was always wearing his plumed hat. That's how I saw him. It amused him to see me try to raise myself on my pallet in spite of my fever. "All right, Shitus," he'd say. "You'll soon be able to row with the rest of them." A kindly thought. He roared with laughter, giving me little strokes of his whip, but in a friendly kind of way, on the back of my neck, not on my rear end. He wanted me to laugh too, to share his pleasure at the business acumen he'd shown in acquiring me. The food on board struck me as quite acceptable. My speech was still muddled. Soon, as the captain had foreseen, I recovered enough strength to join the boys at the oars. Beyond where there were 10 oarsmen, I saw 100, multiple vision. The crossing wasn't fatiguing, because most of the time we were under sail. Our conditions between decks were no more nauseating than those of the usual third-class passengers on the Sunday excursion train, and not nearly as perilous as what I'd endured on the Admiral Brampton coming out. There was always plenty of breeze on this voyage from the east to the west of the Atlantic. The temperature dropped. Nobody 89 complained about that between decks. The only trouble was that the trip seemed to be taking a long time. For my part, I had seen enough seascapes and jungle vistas to last me an eternity. I'd have liked to ask the captain a few questions about the aim and purpose of this trip, but once I was definitely on the mend, he lost interest in me. Anyway, I was still dribbling too much for conversation. From then on I saw him only from a distance, like a real boss. I started looking for Robinson among the galley slaves, and several times in the silence of the night I called him in a loud voice. There was no answer except for a few insults and threats from the other galley slaves. Still, the more I thought about the details and circumstances of my adventure, the more likely it seemed to me that the same thing must have happened to him in Santa Peta. Except that Robinson must be rowing on some other galley. Those jungle niggers, I thought, must all have a hand in the racket. Why shouldn't they take their turn? They've got to live, haven't they? So naturally they sell the things and people they can eat right away. The natives' relative kindness to me could be attributed to the most sordid of motives. For weeks and weeks the Infanta Gambetta sailed over the rolling Atlantic from fit of fever to fit of seasickness, and then one evening all was calm around us. My delirium was gone. We were bobbing at anchor. Waking next day, we realized on opening the portholes that we had reached our destination. And what a sight it was. Talk of surprises. What we suddenly discovered through the fog was so amazing that at first we refused to believe it, but then, when we were face to face with it, galley slaves or not, we couldn't help laughing, seeing it right there in front of us. Just imagine, that city was standing absolutely erect. New York was a standing city. Of course we'd seen cities, fine ones too, and magnificent seaports. But in our part of the world cities lie along the seacoast or on rivers, they recline on the landscape, awaiting the traveler, while this American city had nothing languid about her, she stood there as stiff as a board, not seductive at all, terrifyingly stiff. We laughed like fools. You can't help laughing at a city built straight up and down like that. But we could only laugh from the neck up, because of the cold blowing in from the sea through a grey and pink mist, a brisk sharp wind that attacked our pants and the chinks in that wall, I mean the city streets, which engulfed the wind-borne clouds. Our galley spun its narrow wake just outside the docks, at the end of the ship-colored bay, as flash with schools of rowboats and avid, tooting tugs. When you're down at heel, it's never much fun landing anywhere, but for a galley slave it's a lot worse, especially in America, because those people don't like the galley slaves that come over from Europe at all. They're anarchists. That's what they say. The only people they really welcome are tourists, who bring them dough, because all the currencies of Europe are relatives of the dollar. I might have tried what others had succeeded in doing, swimming across the harbor and once on land start shouting, "Long live dollar! Long live dollar!" It's a gimmick. A lot of people have landed that way and made a fortune. It's not certain, but so they say. Even worse things happen in dreams. I had a different plan in my head, along with my fever. On board the galley I'd become an expert at counting fleas, not just catching them but adding and subtracting them, in short, compiling statistics, a subtle skill, which looks like nothing at all, but still it's a technique and I thought I'd make use of it. You can say what you like about the Americans, but when it comes to techniques, they're connoisseurs. They'd be crazy about my way of counting fleas. I was sure of that in advance. I was convinced that I couldn't fail. I was about to offer them my services when suddenly our galley was ordered to its quarantine station, a sheltered cove nearby, within hailing distance of a small village at the end of a quiet bay, 2 miles east of 90. New York. There we remained under observation for weeks and weeks, long enough to acquire a daily routine. Every evening after supper, for instance, our water squad would go ashore and make its way to the village. To attain my ends I'd have to go along. My shipmates knew what I had in mind, but the adventure didn't tempt them. "He's mad but harmless," they said. The food wasn't bad on board the Infanta Combita. They got clubbed now and then, but not too badly, and all in all it was bearable. An average sort of job. And it had one sublime advantage: you couldn't be fired from a galley, and the king had even promised them a small pension at the age of 62. That prospect made them happy. It gave them something to dream about, and another thing, they played at voting on Sundays. It gave them a feeling of freedom. We were kept in quarantine for weeks. The men bellowed between decks. They fought and buggered one another by turns. But their main reasons for not wanting to escape with me was that they were absolutely down on this America that I was so smitten with. We all have our bugaboos, and theirs was America. They even tried to sour me on it. I told them I knew people there, my little Lola among others, who must have been loaded by then, and Robinson no doubt, who had surely carved himself a niche in the business world, but they clung to their aversion for the United States, their disgust, their hatred. You'll always have a screw loose, they said. One day I made as if to join their expedition to the village water tap, and then I told them I wasn't going back to the galley. Goodbye. They were a good bunch all in all, hard workers. They told me again that they didn't approve one bit of what I was doing, but they wished me good luck and plenty of fun all the same, in their own way. Go. They said. Go right ahead. But we're warning you, you haven't got the right ideas for a beggar. It's your fever that scrambles your brains. You'll come back from that America of yours in worse condition than we are. Your fancy ideas will be the end of you. You want to learn things? You know too much already for the likes of you. I tried to tell them I had friends who were expecting me. I spluttered and stammered. Friends? They said. Your friends couldn't care less. Your friends forgot you long ago. But I want to see Americans, I insisted. And besides, they've got women like nowhere else in the world. Wise guy. They said. Come on back with us. Believe us, it's not worth it. You'll make yourself sicker than you are. We'll tell you what Americans are like. They're either millionaires or skunks. There's nothing in between. The shade you're in, you certainly won't be seeing any millionaires. But don't worry, you'll get your fill of skunks, you can be sure of that. And it won't be long, oh no. That's the way they spoke to me. A bunch of jerks, cocksuckers, subhumans, they made me sick. Beat it, the whole lot of you. I told them. You're green with envy, that's all. We'll see if the Americans skin me alive. But one thing is sure, you've all got lady fingers between your legs, and limp ones at that. I told them off, and after that I felt fine. Night was coming on, and the galley was blowing the whistle for them. They all started rowing in cadence, all but one, me. I waited till I couldn't hear them anymore, then I counted up to 100 and ran to the village as fast as I could. That village was a pretty little place, well lit, wooden houses just waiting to be used, lined up to the right and left of a chapel, all perfectly silent. Unfortunately I was shivering with malaria and fear. Here and there I came across a sailor from the garrison. Host people seemed to be taking it pretty easy, and even a few children, and then a young girl with delightful muscles. That was America. I had arrived. It's a pleasure to see that sort of thing after so many parched adventures. It's as life-giving as fruit. I'd stumbled on the one useless village in the whole country. A small garrison of sailors and their families, 91. Kept its installations high readiness for the conceivable day when a raging plague, imported by a boat like ours, would threaten the metropolis. Those installations would be used for killing off as many foreigners as possible, so as to keep the city population from catching anything. They even had a cemetery ready, with flowers all over. They were waiting. For 60 years they'd been waiting. Waiting was all they did. Finding an empty shack, I slipped in and fell asleep instantly. In the morning the streets were full of sailors in short pants, sturdy, well-built fellows, wielding brooms and sloshing water around my refuge and on all the streets and squares of that theoretical village. I tried to look unconcerned, but I was so hungry that in spite of my fears I headed for a place where there was a smell of cooking. That's where I was spotted and cornered between two squads of sailors, determined to identify me. Their first idea was to chuck me in the water. Taken straight to the head quarantine officer, I was in a bad way. Though constant adversity had led me to develop a certain crust, I still felt too steeped in fever to risk any of my brilliant improvisations. My mind was wandering, and my heart wasn't in it. The best policy was to lose consciousness. Which I did. In the office where I later came to, some ladies in light-colored dresses had replaced the men around me. They put me through a vague and benevolent interrogation, which would have been plenty for me. But benevolence never lasts in this world, and the next day the men started talking prison to me again. I took the opportunity to bring up fleas, just in passing, so to speak. How I could catch them. And count them. My specialty. As well as classify these parasites and compile flawless statistics. I saw that my approach interested my guards. I had captured their attention. They were listening. But as for believing me, that was a different kettle of fish. Finally, the commanding officer of the station turned up. He was called the Surgeon General, which would be a good name for a fish. He spoke roughly, but with more authority than the others. "What's this you're telling us, boy?" he said. "You say you can count fleas? Really now?" He thought that would shut me up, but not at all. 1, 2, 3 I reeled off the little spiel I had prepared. I believe in the enumeration of fleas. It's a civilizing factor, because enumeration is the basis of the most invaluable statistical data. A progressive country must know the number of its fleas, broken down according to sex, age group, year and season. Come, young man. Enough of your hogwash. The Surgeon General broke in. "You're not the first. Other young scams from Europe have been here before you, telling us the same kind of fairy tales, but in the end they turned out to be anarchists like the rest of them, only worse. They didn't even believe in anarchy anymore. Enough of your boasting. Tomorrow we'll try you out on the immigrants over there on Ellis Island, in the shower room. Major Mischief, my assistant, will tell me if you've been lying. For 2 months now Major Mischief has been clamoring for an expert flea counter. We'll assign you to him for a try. Dismissed. And if you've lied to us, we'll chuck you in the drink. Dismissed. And watch your step. I withdrew from the presence of that American authority as I had withdrawn from so many authorities, by presenting first my pecker and then, by a deft about-face, my rear end, accompanying the whole with a military salute. This statistics racket, it seemed to me, was as good a way as any other of getting me to New York. The very next day, Mischief, the major in question, told me in a few words what my work would be. He was a fat, jaundiced-looking man, as nearsighted as it's possible to be, with enormous smoked glasses. He must have recognized me the way wild animals recognize their victims, by the general outline, because with those glasses he was wearing he couldn't possibly have distinguished any features. On the job we got along fine. I even think that by the end of my stay Mischief had taken quite a liking to me. In the first place, not seeing a person is an excellent reason for taking a liking to him, and besides he was 92. Delighted at my brilliant flea catching technique. Nobody else in the whole station could hold a candle to me when it came to catching and boxing the most restive, greatest, and impatient of fleas. I was able to classify them by sex before they had even been removed from the immigrant. I don't mind telling you, my work was amazing. In the end Mischief trusted my skill implicitly. By late afternoon the nails of my thumb and forefinger were bruised from crushing fleas, but my day's work wasn't over. I still had to line up the columns of my daily statistical table, so and so many Polish, Yugoslavian, Spanish fleas, Crimean crabs, Peruvian chiggers. Every furtive, biting thing that travels on human derelicts ended under my fingernails. As you see, my work was both monumental and meticulous. Our calculations were completed in New York in a special office equipped with electrical flea counting machines. Every day the little quarantine tug crossed the whole harbor, carrying our figures to be processed or checked. Days and days passed, my health picked up, but, as my fever and delirium abated in those comfortable surroundings, my craving for adventure and daring exploits revived and became imperious. At 98.6 everything is boring. Yet I could have stayed there, with not a thing to worry about, well fed at the station mess. Best of all, it seems worth adding, Major Mischief's daughter, a stunning young lady of 15, used to turn up in extremely short skirts after 5 o'clock and play tennis directly under the window of our office. I've seldom seen finer legs, still slightly on the mannish side perhaps, yet on their way to becoming more delicate, a splendid specimen of burgeoning flesh. A challenge to happiness, a promise to make a man shout for joy. Some of the young ensigns of the detachment followed her everywhere. Those young scouts had no need to justify themselves by doing useful work like me. I didn't miss the slightest detail of their caperings around my little idol. Just watching them, I found myself blanching several times a day. After a while, I began to think that maybe at night I could pass for a sailor myself. I was still fondling that hope when, one Saturday in the 23rd week of my stay, the situation ripened. The man in charge of shuffling the statistics back and forth, an Armenian, was suddenly promoted to the post of executive flea counter in Alaska, where he'd be dealing with the prospectors' dogs. A fine promotion if ever there was one, and true enough, the man was delighted. The Alaskan dog teams are invaluable. Since they are always needed, they are well cared for. Whereas nobody gives a damn about immigrants, of whom there are always too many. That left no one to take our figures to New York, and in a twinkling I was assigned to the task. Before I shoved off, Mischief, my boss, shook hands with me and urged me to be good and behave myself in town. That was the last bit of advice that estimable man ever gave me, and just as he had never seen me up to that time, he never saw me again. As soon as we went ashore, the rain came down in buckets, penetrated my thin jacket, and soaked the statistics, which gradually melted away in my hand. Nevertheless, I made a big wad with some of them and let it stick out of my pocket to make me look more or less like a businessman when I hit town. Thereupon, trembling with fear and emotion, I hurried off in quest of new adventures. Raising my eyes to the ramparts, I felt a kind of reverse vertigo, because there were really too many windows and so much alike whichever way you looked that it turned my stomach. Flimsily clad, chilled to the bone, I made for the darkest crevice I could find in that giant body, hoping that the people would hardly notice me in their midst. My embarrassment was quite superfluous. I had nothing to fear. In the street I had chosen, really the narrowest of all, no wider than a good-sized brook in our part of the world and extraordinarily dirty, damp and dark at the bottom, there were so many other people, big and little, thin and fat, that they carried me along with them like a shadow. They were going to town like 93. Me, on their way to work no doubt. Poor people like everywhere else. As if I knew where I was going, I put on an air of choosing and changed my direction, taking a different street on my right, one that was better lit. Broadway it was called. I read the name on the sign. High up, far above the uppermost stories, there was still a bit of daylight, with seagulls and patches of sky. We moved in the lower light, a sick sort of jungle light, so gray that the street seemed to be full of grimy cotton waste. That street was like a dismal gash, endless, with us at the bottom of it, filling it from side to side, advancing from sorrow to sorrow, toward an end that is never in sight, the end of all the streets in the world. There were no cars or carriages, only people and more people. This was the priceless district, I was told later, the Gold District, Manhattan. You can enter it only on foot, like a church. It's the banking heart and center of the present-day world. Yet some of those people spit on the sidewalk as they pass. You've got to have your nerve with you. It's a district filled with gold, a miracle, and through the doors you can actually hear the miracle, the sound of dollars being crumpled, for the dollar is always too light, a genuine Holy Ghost, more precious than blood. I found time to go and see them, I even went in and spoke to the employees who guard the cash. They're sad and underpaid. When the faithful enter their bank, don't go thinking they can help themselves as they please. Far from it. In speaking to Dollar, they mumble words through a little grill. That's their confessional. Not much sound, dim light, a tiny wicket between high arches, that's all. They don't swallow the host, they put it on their hearts. I couldn't stay there long admiring them. I had to follow the crowd in the street, between those walls of smooth shadow. Suddenly our street widened, like a crevasse opening out into a bright clearing. Up ahead of us we saw a great pool of sea green light, wedged between hordes of monstrous buildings. And in the middle of the clearing stood a rather countrified-looking house, surrounded by woebegone lawns. I asked several people in the crowd what this edifice was, but most of them pretended not to hear me. They couldn't spare the time. But one young fellow right next to me was kind enough to tell me it was City Hall, adding that it was an ancient monument dating back to colonial times, ever so historical. So they'd left it there. The fringes of this oasis formed a kind of park with benches, where you could sit comfortably enough and look at the building. When I got there was hardly anything else to see. I waited more than an hour in the same place, and then toward noon, from the half-light, from the shuffling, discontinuous, dismal crowd, there erupted a sudden avalanche of absolutely and undeniably beautiful women. What a discovery. What an America. What ecstasy. I thought of Lola. Her promises had not deceived me. It was true. I had come to the heart of my pilgrimage. And if my appetite hadn't kept calling itself to my attention, that would have struck me as one of those moments of supernatural aesthetic revelation. If I'd been a little more comfortable and confident, the incessant beauties I was discovering might have ravished me from my base human condition. In short, all I needed was a sandwich to make me believe in miracles. But how I needed that sandwich. And yet, what supple grace. What incredible delicacy of form and feature. What inspired harmonies. What perilous nuances. Triumphant where the danger is greatest. Every conceivable promise of face and figure 94. Fulfilled. Those blondes. Those brunettes. Those Titian redheads. And more kept coming. Maybe, I thought, this is Greece starting all over again. Looks like I got here just in time. What made those apparitions all the more divine in my eyes was that they seemed totally unaware of my existence as I sat on a bench close by, slap-happy, drooling with erotico-mystical admiration and quinine, but also, I have to admit, with hunger. If it were possible for a man to jump out of his skin, I'd have done it then, once and for all. There was nothing to hold me back. Those unlikely midnets could have wafted me away, sublimated me. A gesture, a word would have sufficed, and in that moment I'd have been transported, all of me, into the world of dreams. But I suppose they had other fish to fry. I sat there for an hour, 2 hours, in that state of stupefaction. I had nothing more in the world to hope for. You know about innards? The trick they play on tramps in the country? They stuff an old wallet with putrid chicken innards. Well, take it from me, a man is just like that, except that he's fatter and hungrier and can move around, and inside there's a dream. I had to look at the practical side of things and not dip into my small supply of money right away. I didn't have much. I was even afraid to count it. I couldn't have anyway, because I was seeing double. I could only feel those thin, bashful banknotes through the material of my pocket, side by side with my phony statistics. Men were passing, too, mostly young ones with faces that seemed to be made of pink wood, with a dry, monotonous expression, and jowls so wide and coarse they were hard to get used to. Well, maybe that was the kind of jowls their women folk wanted. The sexes seemed to stay on different sides of the street. The women looked only at the shop windows, their whole attention was taken by the handbags, scarves, and little silk doodads, displayed very little at a time, but with precision and authority. You didn't see many old people in that crowd. Not many couples either. Nobody seemed to find it strange that I should sit on that bench for hours all by myself, watching the people pass. But all at once the policeman standing like an inkwell in the middle of the street seemed to suspect me of sinister intentions. I could tell. Wherever you may be, the moment you draw the attention of the authorities, the best thing you can do is disappear in a hurry. Don't try to explain. Sink into the earth. I said to myself. It so happened that just to one side of my bench there was a big hole in the sidewalk, something like the metro at home. That hole seemed propitious, so vast, with a stairway all of pink marble inside it. I'd seen quite a few people from the street disappear into it and come out again. It was in that underground vault that they answered the call of nature. I caught on right away. The hall where the business was done was likewise of marble. A kind of swimming pool, but drained of all its water, a fetid swimming pool, filled only with filtered, moribund light, which fell on the forms of unbuttoned men surrounded by their smells, red in the face from the effect of expelling their stinking feces with barbarous noises in front of everybody. Men among men, all free and easy, they laughed and joked and cheered one another on. It made me think of a football game. The first thing you did when you got there was to take off your jacket, as if in preparation for strenuous exercise. This was a right, and shirt sleeves were the uniform. In that state of undress, belching and worse, gesticulating like lunatics, they settled down in the fecal grotto. The new arrivals were assailed with 1,000 revolting jokes while descending the stairs from the street, but they all seemed delighted. The morose aloofness of the men on the street above was equaled only by the air of liberation and rejoicing that came over them at the prospect of emptying their bowels in tumultuous company. The splotched and spotted doors to the convenience hung loose, wrenched from their hinges. Some customers went from one cell to another for a little chat, those waiting for an empty seat smoked heavy cigars and 95. Slapped the backs of the obstinately toiling occupants, who sat there straining with their heads between their hands. Some groaned like wounded men or women in labor. The constipated were threatened with ingenious tortures. When a gush of water announced a vacancy, the clamor around the free compartment redoubled, and as often as not a coin would be tossed for its possession. No sooner we, newspapers, though as thick as pillows, were dismembered by the horde of rectal toilers. The smoke made it hard to distinguish faces, and the smells deterred me from going too close. To a foreigner the contrast was disconcerting. Such free and easy intimacy, such extraordinary intestinal familiarity, and up on the street such perfect restraint. It left me stunned. I returned to the light of day by the same stairway and went back to the same bench to rest. Sudden outburst of digestive vulgarity. Discovery of a joyous shitting communism. I ignored both these disconcerting aspects of the same adventure. I hadn't the strength for analysis or synthesis. My pressing desire was to sleep. A rare, delicious frenzy. So I joined the line of pedestrians entering one of the neighboring streets. We progressed by fits and starts because of the shop windows, which fragmented the crowd. At one point, the door of a hotel created a great eddy. People poured out onto the sidewalk through a big revolving door. I was caught up and poured the other way, into the big lobby inside. Instant amazement. You had to divine, to imagine the majesty of the edifice, the generous proportions, because the lights were so veiled that it took you some time to know what you were looking at. Lots of young women in the half-light, plunged in deep armchairs as in jewel cases. Around them attentive men, moving silently, with timid curiosity, to and fro, just offshore from the row of crossed legs and magnificent silk-encased thighs. Those miraculous beings seemed to be waiting for grave and costly events. Obviously they weren't giving me a thought. So, ever so furtively, I in my turn passed that long and palpable temptation. Since at least 100 of those divine leg owners were sitting in a single row of chairs, I reached the reception desk in so dreamy a condition, having absorbed a ration of beauty so much too strong for my constitution that I was reeling. At the desk, a pomade clerk violently offered me a room. I asked for the smallest in the hotel. I can't have had more than $50 at the time. Also, I was pretty well out of ideas and self-assurance. I hoped the room the clerk was giving me was really the smallest, because his hotel, the Laugh Calvin, 56 was advertised as the most luxurious and sumptuously furnished on the whole North American continent. Over my head, what an infinity of furnished rooms. And all around me, in those chairs, what inducements to multiple rape. What abysses. What perils. Is the poor man's aesthetic torment to have no end? Is it to be even more long-lasting than his hunger? But there was no time to succumb. Before I knew it, the clerk had thrust a heavy key into my hand. I was afraid to move. A sharp youngster, dressed like a juvenile brigadier general, stepped, imperious and commanding, out of the gloom. The smooth reception clerk rang his metallic bell 3 times, and the little boy started whistling. That was my send-off. Time to go. And away we went. As black and resolute as a subway train, we raced down a corridor. The youngster in the lead. A twist, a turn, another. We didn't dawdle. We veered a bit to the left. Here we go. The elevator. Stitch in my side. Is this it? No. Another corridor. Even darker. Ebony paneling, it looks like, all along the walls. No time to examine it. The kid's whistling. He's 96. Carrying my frail valise. I don't dare ask him questions. My job was to keep walking, that was clear to me. In the darkness here and there, as we passed, a red and green light flashed to command. Long lines of gold marked the doors. We had passed the 1800s long ago and then the 3000s, and still we were on our way, drawn by our invincible destiny. As though driven by instinct, the little bellhop in his braid and stripes pursued the nameless in the darkness. Nothing in this cavern seemed to take him unawares. His whistling modulated plaintively when we passed a black man and a black chambermaid. And that was all. Struggling to walk faster in those corridors, I lost what little self-assurance I had left when I escaped from quarantine. I was falling apart, just as I had seen my shack fall apart in the African wind in the floods of warm water. Here I was attacked by a torrent of unfamiliar sensations. There's a moment between 2 brands of humanity when you find yourself thrashing around in a vacuum. Suddenly, without warning, the youngster pivoted. We had arrived. I bumped into a chair. It was my room, a big box with ebony walls. The only light was a faint ring surrounding the bashful greenish lamp on the table. The manager of the Laugh Calvin Hotel begged the visitor to look upon him as a friend and assured him that he, the manager, would make a special point of keeping him, the visitor, cheerful throughout his stay in New York. Reading this notice, which was displayed where no one could possibly miss it, added if possible to my depression. Once I was left alone, it deepened. All America had followed me to my room, and was asking me enormous questions, reviving awful forebodings. Reclining anxiously on the bed, I tried to adjust to the darkness of my cubbyhole. At regular intervals the walls on the window side trembled. An elevated railway train was passing. It bounded between 2 streets like a cannonball filled with quivering flesh, jolting from section to section of this lunatic city. You could see it far away, its carcass trembling as it passed over a torrent of steel girders, which went on echoing from rampart to rampart long after the train had roared by at 70 miles an hour. Dinner time passed as I lay thus prostrate, and bedtime as well. What had horrified me most of all was that elevated railway. On the other side of the court, which was more like a well shaft, the wall began to light up, first 1, then 2 rooms, then dozens. I could see what was going on in some of them. Couples going to bed. These Americans seemed as worn out as our own people after their vertical hours. The women had very full, very pale eyes, at least the ones I was able to get a good look at. Before going to bed, most of the men shaved without taking the cigars out of their mouths. In bed they first took off their glasses, then put their false teeth in a glass of water, which they left in evidence. Same as in the street, the sexes didn't seem to talk to each other. They impressed me as fat, docile animals, used to being bored. In all, I only saw 2 couples engaging, with the light on, in the kind of thing I'd expected, and not at all violently. The other women ate chocolates in bed, while waiting for their husbands to finish shaving. And then they all put their lights out. There's something sad about people going to bed. You can see they don't give a damn whether they're getting what they want out of life or not. You can see they don't even try to understand what we're here for. They just don't care. Americans or not, they sleep no matter what. They're bloated mollusks. No sensibility, no trouble with their conscience. I'd seen too many puzzling things to be easy in my mind. I knew too much and not enough. I'd better go out, I said to myself. I'd better go out again. Maybe I'll meet Robinson. Naturally that was an idiotic idea, but I dreamed it up as an excuse for going out again, because no matter how much I tossed and turned on my narrow bed, I couldn't snatch the tiniest scrap of sleep. Even masturbation, at times like that, provides neither comfort nor entertainment. Then you're really in despair. 97. The worst part is wondering how you'll find the strength tomorrow to go on doing what you did today and have been doing for much too long, where you'll find the strength for all that stupid running around, those projects that come to nothing, those attempts to escape from crushing necessity, which always flounder and serve only to convince you one more time that destiny is implacable, that every night will find you down and out, crushed by the dread of more and more sordid and insecure tomorrows. And maybe it's treacherous old age coming on, threatening the worst. Not much music left inside us for life to dance to. Our youth has gone to the ends of the earth to die in the silence of the truth. And where, I ask you, can a man escape to, when he hasn't enough madness left inside him? The truth is an endless death agony. The truth is death. You have to choose, death or lies. I've never been able to kill myself. I'd better go out into the street, a partial suicide. Everyone has his little naps, his ways of getting sleep and food. I'd need to sleep if I wanted to recover the strength I'd need to go to work next day. Get back the zip it would take to find a job in the morning, and in the meantime force my way into the unknown realm of sleep. Don't go thinking it's easy to fall asleep when you've started doubting everything, mostly because of the awful fears people have given you. I dressed and somehow found my way to the elevator, but feeling kind of foggy. I still had to cross the lobby, to pass more rows of ravishing enigmas with legs so tempting, faces so delicate and severe. Goddesses, in short, hustling goddesses. We might have tried to make an arrangement. But I was afraid of being arrested. Complications. Nearly all a poor bastard's desires are punishable by jail. So there I was on the street again. It wasn't the same crowd as before. This one billowed over the sidewalks and showed a little more life, as if it had landed in a country less arid, the land of entertainment, of nightlife. The people searched in the direction of lights suspended far off in the darkness, writhing multicolored snakes. They flowed in from all the neighboring streets. A crowd like that, I said to myself, adds up to a lot of dollars in handkerchiefs alone or silk stockings. Or just in cigarettes for that matter. And to think that you can go out among all that money, and nobody'll give you
I'm going to start this right back up in the stream, just so my call is not too long. I'll start it.